The world is doomed. Those called the 10 strongest knights who protected the continent had already exhausted all their energy. And over this vast contaminated land, only death prevailed over all, except for him, the knight who was still alive. All of this was caused by the demon commander of gluttony, who admitted that this human was strong, but that it still wasn't enough to kill him. Even so, our warrior grabbed his hammer and struck the commander's arm with such force that he crushed it, smashing him from head to toe, because that monster was just noisy. And in this way, a little peace was finally achieved, though due to his injuries, he wouldn't last much longer either. Then he paused to think. Had he done everything wrong from the start? After all, mana training was knowledge exclusive to knights and nobles. Therefore, he had to overcome countless failures, climbing to the top even while being at rock bottom. What if, instead of what happened, he could have trained with the proper methods from the beginning? Could he have saved the continent and the entire world? But reflecting on the commander of gluttony, he thought that despite everything, he was really exceptional, even though he was only the 7th among all the Demon King's commanders. It was at that moment that he heard a voice calling him. The one calling was the Emperor of the Sword, Asgard von Valentia, saying that he would die soon. But before that, he wanted to ask a question. Why didn't Tiny flee the battle, since he lived in the slums and had nothing to protect? Tiny replied that fleeing a battle was shameful, for a man must always be confident. Upon hearing this, the old man burst into laughter, saying that Tiny should trust in the talent that made him one of the 10 strongest knights solely through his pride. And then he began to speak strange things as if leaving a message. He said that when he returned, Tiny should find him, but not immediately, because otherwise even he wouldn't believe it. The Emperor then revealed a family secret. His daughter's birth name was Leela, a tribute to the flower he and his wife liked. However, he admitted that in truth, he didn't actually like that flower so much. He asked that Tiny not forget this information, as it would be a code only he should know. And with that, the Emperor's consciousness faded. At the same time, Tiny woke up in a familiar room, thinking that everything had been just a dream. But in fact, he was reliving a terrible past where invaders took his sister, who died taking care of him. She had been beaten while trying to protect Tiny, who was hiding a ring. At that moment, Wolf's men arrived, angrily kicking the door. Tiny, with his frail body, could barely move, and his sister was brutally attacked. One of the men, while kicking her, remarked that corpses had value, as there were people who liked to play with them, and that brought in good money. Tiny, unable to move his arms, desperately wanted to protect his sister, at least this time. Then, with all his effort, a blue energy surged from his hand, and he managed to move. In one leap, he threw himself at one of the attackers, determined not to let them take his sister. The men began beating him, but Tiny resisted, and after several blows to the head, the bandits gave up and left. At that moment, Tiny realized that something had changed. This was the end of his nightmare, but this time, he had managed to act differently. The mana had awakened in him earlier than it should have. He realized that perhaps the Sword Emperor's words were right. This wasn't a dream. He had really returned to the past and could now change the future of the world. Taking advantage of the moment, he cursed the old man for not sending him even further back in time. However, at that instant, Tiny began coughing up blood, a consequence of his frail body trying to use mana. Even so, he knew that complaining was useless. If the Emperor had sent him to the past, this was his chance to ensure that his sister could rest in peace, something he hadn't been able to do in his previous life. With that in mind, Tiny decided to follow his path and avenge his sister's death. But before that, he needed to ensure she rested in peace. And even though they didn't share the same blood, what they had in common were their black eyes and hair, something rare throughout the continent. Because of this, many people avoided him, but his sister, always kind, gave him the name Tiny and treated him with love. That's why, this time, he was able to bury his sister in peace. Meanwhile, one of the women, Emma, a friend of his sister's, thought that Tiny had changed a bit. Not long ago, she had found him eating soup in front of his sister's body, his wounds already healed. When he finished eating, he simply picked her up in his arms and thanked Emma for the soup, promising to return the favor one day. After that, his sister's funeral began, and Tiny remembered the words she always said: "Be confident and keep your head held high." For that reason, he would have no regrets in this life. 1 month later, it was finally time for revenge. He arrived before the wrongdoers and asked where Wolf was. One of the henchmen tried to slap him, but Tiny caught his hand with a single motion and twisted the man's arm. Another came at him, grabbing him by the shirt, but couldn't do anything. Tiny, with ease, delivered a powerful kick to the man, for his mana-infused body was already at an advanced stage, something he had not been able to achieve in his previous life, the perfect fusion between the physical body and mana. As a result, his body had become much stronger. However, this powerful technique came with a side effect. You need to eat like a boar, or better yet, like Luffy. Emma even complained that Tiny had eaten her entire 10-day supply. She soon realized that after reconstructing his body, something had changed. Now that his mana had awakened, Tiny could fix the weaknesses from when his body was frail. Then he grabbed another thug by the leg, swung him into the air, and threw him far away, thanking them for having broken his body before. The man flew so far that he destroyed the entrance to the place. Now Tiny was determined to finish off everyone there. The other criminals mocked him, asking what a kid would do without a weapon. Tiny then pulled at one of the fallen men's legs, saying he had just found one. He started using the man's body as a weapon, whipping one against the other, defeating everyone on the lower level. Next, Tiny called the Raider brothers, who were upstairs, to come down and fight him. Before jumping down, one of them remarked that Tiny was a mana user and that a body like that should be worth a fortune. Then they leaped toward him. While messing with the broken body of one of the men, Tiny remembered his situation from the past when an old man was shocked to see him use a person as a weapon, commenting that he had no class. For that reason, this same old man taught him hand-to-hand combat. When the thugs arrived, Tiny easily dodged and punched the first one in the face. The second, who came to play, took a shin kick. Tiny jumped on him, threw him to the ground, and finished him off with a kick, like those combos from Dragon Ball. Meanwhile, the invaders' leader, Wolf, asked who was there. Tiny recalled that in his past life, he had discovered that Wolf was a pimp belonging to the Beastmen tribe. Even among them, the silver werewolf he transformed into was even more special, as it indicated the direct manifestation of the Beastmen royal family's bloodline. In the past life, killing him had been a huge challenge, but this time, Tiny arrived calmly, asking if Wolf was already shitting himself in fear. Enraged, Wolf began to transform, determined to finish the boy. When he finally transformed, Tiny noticed something was off. He didn't have the silver fur, so Tiny asked what kind of mutt was standing before him. Even so, Wolf charged at him, but Tiny easily dodged, finding him slow compared to what he had faced before. Seizing the opportunity, Tiny grabbed Wolf's jaw and, using mana, broke it with a snap. He recalled when a Beastman friend had told him that this was how to deal with their kind. Wolf kept attacking, but Tiny dodged everything with ease. To him, Wolf was nothing more than a barking dog that didn't bite, and that's when the beating session began. His friend had said that when it came to Beastmen, you just had to keep hitting them until they got tired, as they could regenerate from almost anything. So Tiny decided to enjoy himself beating the little wolf. Tiny delivered a kick so strong that it forced the guy to fully de-transform, sending him flying into a wall. Now he wasn't just going to break his spine. After all the massacre, Tiny stood there thinking that perhaps this would bring some comfort to his sister's soul, as if it were up to him, Wolf's head would already be rolling on the ground. However, now that he was all beaten up, begging for Lady Irina's forgiveness. Meanwhile, Tiny simply asked what Beastman like Wolf was doing there. Amidst the chaos, Tiny ended up finding a strange stone on the ground. When he picked it up, he immediately sensed demonic ki, as there was a white wolf chained inside the stone. Seeing this, Tiny recalled a long time ago in the Elven Forest when an elf spoke about spiritual creatures. She explained that these creatures are reborn after accumulating mana for at least 100 years. What she described as the quintessence of a spirit was exactly what Tiny was holding, a spirit stone. He wondered why Wolf had one of these stones, especially in such a strange state. Even so, Tiny punched the chains, freeing the white wolf as he watched its memories. This spirit had been surrounded by a group of strangers using demonic ki, trapping it inside the stone. The boy receiving the stone was Wolf himself. These scumbags had been creating beastmen by having people absorb spirit stones, and that's how that boy had transformed into Wolf. This time, since Tiny had arrived early, Wolf hadn't been able to absorb the stone. However, the white wolf, furious, tried to bite Wolf. Tiny stopped it, saying that this scum deserved something far worse than death. The wolf seemed to understand, and Tiny remembered what that woman had said. It was possible for humans to tame a spirit, provided they had a pure soul and enough mana. That's why usually only children were able to do it. Tiny became pensive. After all, even though he was young, his soul was far from pure. But since it was working, he had no complaints. He was able to communicate with the wolf through the mana flowing inside the spirit stone. Thus, Tiny decided to form a contract with the wolf. Unlike magic, it wasn't necessary to focus on raising the spirit's level, as most of these beasts grew stronger as their tamer's strength increased. That's why the elf arena was among the top 10 knights in the world. Before accepting the contract, the wolf asked Tiny for a favor, to avenge his capture by the cult worshippers who did this to him. In this way, Tiny obtained his first spirit, naming it Moonwolf. Looking at Wolf collapse on the floor, Tiny concluded that it was all the work of those worshippers who rejected God and worshipped demons. With that, he kicked Wolf, telling him to wake up. When nothing happened, Moonwolf went to do his job. Tiny then asked where the guy who gave Wolf that spirit stone was. Terrified, Wolf said the organization would kill him. But before he could reveal anything, his head exploded due to a spell that prevented him from saying a word. With that, Tiny focused on what was most important. He took Wolf's body and threw it against the wall, where he knew the scoundrel's treasure was hidden. The item he needed was the Valentia family ring. Some time ago, a blonde-haired girl had asked for his name and given him a ring, telling him that whenever he needed help, he could show the ring to find her. That same ring had been stolen by those wrongdoers. The person who had given it to Tiny was Cloon Valentia, the youngest daughter of the Sword Emperor, known for her kindness and called the Saint of Valentia. This had happened because in the Valentia family culture, children who came of age had to place flowers in each temple and make their names known. That's how Clove had met Tiny on the streets and given him the ring. In his past life, Tiny took too long to seek revenge, and thus it took him longer to recover the ring. Now, with the ring in hand, he saw a great opportunity to find the Sword Emperor. Suddenly, Tiny heard a voice from below. He went down, knowing that the time had come. The shiny, bald knight had arrived. He couldn't believe that a mere child had caused all that destruction. This was Lamb, the commander of the castle guards, who was already thinking of using the situation as an excuse to increase the bribe he received in exchange for protection. But before Lamb could do anything, Tiny descended the stairs, saying he was just dealing with some trash. And since there was a knight around, it was obvious he had been getting good money from Wolf. The bald guy immediately flexed his veins, even where he had no hair and charged furiously at Tiny. However, Tiny simply struck him with his hand, throwing the bald man far away, as given the knight's level, if Tiny had given his all, he could have easily defeated him. Right after, Tiny delivered a knee strike, and even though he was strong, the bald man managed to block the blow. Now that he had shown a bit of his power, Tiny knew he needed to act smartly, as the bald knight didn't yet need to be treated as an enemy. Just as the bald man prepared to draw his sword, Moonwolf appeared in his giant form, causing the knight to break into a cold sweat. With the situation calmer, Tiny proposed a deal. Instead of Wolf paying the bribe, Tiny would make the payment himself. The bald man, impressed, replied, "Oh ho, you're clever, kid," and asked if Tiny would pay the 5 gold coins Wolf used to pay. Tiny, however, knew that the bald man received no more than 1 gold coin and offered to pay him 1.5. If the knight didn't accept the offer, Tiny was ready to end the negotiations and start a fight. Of course, the bald man backed down and agreed, stating that the last day of the month would be the due date. As he left, the men who had called Lamb questioned him, "Mr. Lamb, are you going to betray us?" To which he replied, "Money speaks for me, friend." At that moment, Tiny tossed a coin to Lamb and said that since the owner had changed, he should set a time to greet the new lord of the estate. Even though Lamb had left the scene, it was clear that there would be no more paydays for him. As for the 3 defeated thugs, Tiny gave them a mission: gather all the residents of the place. If anyone tried to escape, Moonwolf would have a good meal. And so the 3 big men ran off. If everything went according to plan, taking care of that place wouldn't take more than a week. An hour later, the 3 had brought everyone together. As soon as she arrived, Emma ran, thinking someone had beaten Tiny again. In reality, the blood on his hands was Wolf's, who was already lying dead nearby. The crowd panicked, thinking they wouldn't escape punishment. Everyone knew that the estate lord was behind Wolf. Then, with firmness, Tiny declared, "Challenging the nobility is a grave sin, and that's why the estate lord is going down too." Cut to the guards, commenting that they hadn't seen Sir Lamb in days. In fact, he was on probation, as there had been an incident involving crazed lunatics claiming they were chased by a giant wolf. In that episode, their leader was so disfigured that they couldn't even recognize him. Moreover, all the money had disappeared. Even so, the guards didn't understand what Lamb had to do with it. The problem, however, was that Lamb's negotiation with the new boss hadn't gone well. All the shops and businesses in the city were closed, and the estate lord was furious, calling the leader to resolve the situation. Tiny, remembering his past life, knew that even after examining the account books, nothing suspicious had been noticed at the time. At the lord's request, he handed over the book and half of the fortune. But now things would be different, as Tiny had understood that there were nobles who crushed other nobles. And it was precisely because of that account book that the estate lord was in trouble. With that, Tiny declared to the people, "Now you're free. If you want to get revenge or vent, this is your last chance to take a few hits on the guy." The women couldn't resist and all went to kick the headless leader. Additionally, he allowed everyone to take as much money as they wanted from Wolf's treasure to flee. Before they left, Tiny made it clear, if you dare commit crimes for money or reveal what happened here, our friend Wolf will tear you apart piece by piece. He then asked Emma to leave the estate and go to Diane with the others, as Tiny still had another place to go. And so Tiny thanked everyone, declaring that from that day on, the red light district of Invader was closed. Meanwhile, the guards discussed the arrival of the new leader, whose name was Tiny. When he appeared, they were perplexed and asked, "What's a child doing here?" Tiny then summoned the big wolf, causing the guards to fall back in fear. After all, with his child-sized body, things like this would keep happening. Further ahead, the Grand Master of the Knight's Order, Cran, introduced himself. However, Tiny, in his defiant manner, remarked that it seemed to be their custom to leave a guest waiting for so long. The knight, offended, was already preparing to draw his sword, telling Tiny to know his place. But it was Cran who needed to learn his place, as he tried to appear superior, though he was insignificant because Tiny was a guest of the lord of the estate. Cran, furious, started to speak more, but Tiny interrupted, saying that the real bad smell in the room came from him. As the knight advanced with his sword, the butler appeared, informing them that the lord was waiting. So the almost bald Cran began to guide Tiny inside the castle. Once there, Tiny was astonished and commented that it was a pleasure to meet the lord. The man before him was Timon von Filias, a baron. Tiny was surprised because in the future, he remembered Timon as someone 3 or 4 times larger. However, he knew that the account book would bring down the baron quickly. Tiny then expressed his desire to become the lord's weapon, putting the knight leader, Cran, as his competitor. The people present were even more shocked to learn that Tiny was only 13 years old. The lord stood up and commented, "So the boy who stole my wallet wants to become my weapon." But Tiny replied, saying that he believed he was doing the lord a favor. Meanwhile, the defiant Cran asked for permission to execute Tiny right there. However, Tiny mentioned the crackdown on drugs that the Duke of Valentia was carrying out in his territory, along with the fact that the Princess of Valentia had recently visited the state. He suggested that Cran think twice before everything blew up. Cran tried to belittle Tiny's words, but the lord interrupted him, saying that if what the boy said was true, he deserved a reward. The lord also heard rumors that Tiny controlled the spirit of the wolf, which he supposedly stole from a spirit stone. Finding this suspicious, the lord asked for an explanation. Tiny then glanced around with the help of the Moonwolf and revealed that Cran was using a magic circle belonging to a dark mage. If Cran could use 2 of these circles, it meant he had offered hundreds of bodies or live sacrifices. This explained why there was so much talk about buying corpses for a high price. Without waiting for more answers, answers from Tiny, Cran drew his sword to attack him. However, Tiny's spirit had already transformed into the powerful Mega Moonwolf. The Lord, observing the situation, decided to change the terms of the test and asked Cran about the boy's power level. According to Cran, Tiny was close to stage 2, and unless he was descended from a prestigious family, he would be considered a prodigy. His mana pattern was perfectly stable. Tiny then improvised, saying that he had learned all of this in a vision, but he knew he needed a better excuse to convince the Lord and the knights, so he claimed that he had learned everything from his deceased parents before coming to Felia's. And if anyone wanted to confirm this story, it would be impossible, as Felia's accepted all kinds of refugees, making it difficult to uncover information about his true identity. In the end, the Lord decided to trust his word, as he would judge the truth later. Meanwhile, Tiny was invited to stay at the Lord's residence, since things had been going wrong since he killed Wolf, and the Lord needed an excuse to cover up the events. The question left in the air was, an excuse for whom? Perhaps for the same organization Wolf was part of. If Tiny wasn't careful, he could end up in trouble. Accepting the proposal, Tiny asked if the Lord had any special visitors. The Lord agreed, saying that Tiny should be very polite to this person, but it would still take a while for them to arrive. There would be 3 days until the duchy reviewed the books, 3 more days until the punishment unit was formed, and 10 days until that unit arrived in Felia's. In total, that would be about 16 days. If the guest arrives after that, everything will be resolved. Tiny then asks the Lord when the guest will arrive, as he needs to learn etiquette before the visit. The Lord replies that the guest arrives in a week. Tiny panics, knowing there won't be enough time to prepare. Faced with this situation, there are only 2 options. The first would be to flee, as Tiny's allies are far away from there. However, if he fled, the Lord would probably put him on the wanted list, complicating his future meeting with the Sword Emperor. Furthermore, the idea of running away from something bothers him, because even without the necessary strength, he always finds a way to overcome his opponents. The second option is riskier. This guest seems to be someone from the high nobility. With the house empty, the fact that an important visitor is about to arrive makes everything more suspicious. The person supporting the Lord must be someone who cannot be shown to the public. If something major were to happen in Felia's, the visit could be postponed. For this reason, Tiny concludes that he needs to become stronger to defeat both the Grandmaster and the Lord, but he decides to leave that for later, as he is hungry. In the dining hall, the cook is startled to see Tiny lining up bowls and eating non-stop. His body improves every time he eats, making any medicinal herbs unnecessary. The boy just eats, and eats. At that moment, a man appears and asks if Tiny learned his manners from a dog. Tiny retorts, "That's right, if you're insulting me, bastard, you better respect me now." The man responds, "Respect someone who wants to hit a little boy? That's tough, huh?" The man gets angry, curses Tiny, and breaks the table. Another man with a scruffy beard tries to calm him down, saying that Tiny is just a child, but the vagrant next to him encourages the fight. Despite this confusion, Tiny taunts the man to come at him because he wants to show the Grandmaster just how strong he really is. Tiny starts to suspect that this might have been staged by the Lord. They go outside to fight, with the crowd gathering around. The bearded man charges, and Tiny, wasting no time, kicks his legs, making him fall. The man tries to punch Tiny, but he easily dodges and delivers another kick to his leg. The man, confused, doesn't understand how a level 1 child can be so strong. Even with his legs injured, he tries to attack again with a hammer strike. However, Tiny slides under the man's legs, jumps, and grabs his neck, turning the fight into a clack-clack game. Tiny wins the battle, leaving everyone around in shock. A knight had been defeated by a child. In Tiny's mind, he won without the help of the wolf to prove his potential. At that moment, he almost faints as he spent too much mana by using all his strength. If this had happened in his past life, he would have been in trouble, since although his body recovered quickly, his mana regeneration was very slow. Now in this life, he has complete harmony between body and mana, allowing him to train as much as he wants and become even stronger than he was in his previous life. Later, the Lord comments that the information Tiny provided about the duchy's movements was accurate. He offers Tiny a veal steak, stating that the boy has a promising future. The only downside, according to the Lord, is that there aren't any good enough masters to train a genius like him. Tiny, however, responds that he has heard that the greatest knights in history grew up on their own, and what led them to follow that path was the presence of a great lord to guide their steps. The Lord is impressed by this answer, noting that both in the Empire and in neighboring kingdoms, features like Tiny's ear shape, black hair, and eyes are extremely rare. He now understands why he never imagined that a foreigner could be so valuable. Tiny, for his part, doesn't understand much of the conversation, and according to him, someone will explain the details later. However, Tiny believes that his current strength is only possible because of the power of the magic circle, but he knows that one can never predict when the demon will strike again. In his past life, Tiny was abandoned and lost the magic circle. He continues to reflect on this as someone informs him that a certain person is eager to meet him. After this conversation, Tiny goes to the training field, full of thoughts, but he knows he needs to focus on one thing. The Lord is in the second circle, and the Grandmaster is in the second stage. Therefore, Tiny needs to reach that level within 6 days. 3 days pass, and his small body is already much stronger, with movements far better than before. Perhaps the problem in his past life was his monstrous size. He realized that he only wanted to be big and strong, which caused his body connected to mana to respond to this unconsciously, breaking the harmony between body and mana by growing too much. But this time, he realizes he doesn't need to be that big. At that moment, 2 men arrive to train, but upon seeing Tiny, they quickly flee. Shortly after, the captain appears, ordering him to follow, as the Lord is given instructions to present him with a weapon. Tiny thinks it's the perfect opportunity and follows the captain to the armory, where he finds various armor and swords. However, there are no axes, his preferred weapon. He asks if he can have something like the captain's sword. The captain, full of pride, says that the Gria's sword was crafted by a renowned artisan. Tiny, taunting, responds that the sword suits him much better since it should be in the hands of someone talented. The captain bursts with anger and asks if Tiny wants to die. The clever boy challenges, if you're unhappy, how about a fight? The captain doesn't hesitate and furiously charges at Tiny. Outside, people hear Tiny yelling, "I'm sorry, Captain. I'll be more careful." He leaves the armory all bruised, carrying a strange, wrapped sword. Everyone assumes that Captain Kron hit a child, fueling rumors that he dislikes the boy, which seems to be true. Back in his room, the maids ask Tiny what happened. With a sly grin, he says the captain told them they were going to get a weapon, and that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, the Lord asks his subordinates if the sacrifice is secure, worried that Tiny is messing up the invaders' plans. He needs to resolve this quickly because in a few days, Tiny's lineage will be confirmed. If he is not from that family, he will have to pay a terrible price. However, the Lord doesn't believe this will happen, as Tiny is highly talented and possesses knowledge that could only come from a prestigious family. Additionally, he has black hair and eyes, which the Lord sees as a confirmation of his lineage. That night, as Tiny was preparing to sleep, an alarm spell from his circle was triggered. Looking ahead, he sees Tiny appearing and slicing it in half, claiming it was punishment from the heavens. The next day, the maids are frightened by the presence of a strange dark magic energy. The knights, incredulous, comment that such a thing wouldn't be possible, but the priest who was there has already reported the energy to the parish. Glenn, one of the knights, mentions that an imperial investigation will be sent. The reason the captain's body remained in such a state even after death was that he was a dark mage whose body decays instantly upon dying. Glenn notices that the sword Tiny is carrying is the same one the captain used. Everyone is surprised because the captain hasn't appeared since the previous day. The guards start investigating and question all the servants, who confirm the same story. The captain beat up the boy. Glenn calls for Tiny. When he arrives, he tells the exact same version that everyone else had given. Glenn then questions him about the fact that they investigated the armory and found nothing, making the captain's disappearance even stranger. Tiny, acting as usual, says he really didn't see anything and that his testimony is the same as the others. Seizing the opportunity, Tiny asks what will happen to him, as the Lord had said his future was secure. Glenn simply tells him to return the next day. Tiny, on the other hand, can't recall any night like that, as he remembers having defeated all of them. The next day, Tiny receives a mercenary plate and a substantial amount of money. Glenn explained that only commoners with merchant or mercenary status could enter other provinces. According to him, staying in a decaying place like that would only waste Tiny's talents, so he advised him to go far away and strengthen himself. At that moment, Tiny understood why he hadn't seen Glenn in his past life. He had probably left before everything happened. Grateful for everything, Tiny thinks that now that the Dark Mage is dead, the Imperial family will have to act. Since the duchy didn't come to them, Tiny will have to seek them out personally. Before leaving, Glenn bids farewell, asking Tiny not to forget him, though Tiny didn't even know his name. Glenn introduces himself as Glenn Liberty, but asks to be called simply Glenn. Tiny departs, thinking he left an unsolved problem in that knight's hands. Now that he has the mercenary plate, he decides to go to the guild to get a horse. However, the wolf immediately appears, ready for Tiny to ride. The wolf takes on a smaller form, as spirits tend to materialize at the size they had in life, but can adjust to the sorcerer's proportions. When he mounts the wolf, Tiny feels his soul and senses merging with the animal. With everything ready, they set off, with new adventures awaiting beyond the forest. Tiny decides to head to Karun quickly, as it's where the first catastrophe will occur. In his past life, many catastrophes arose one after another, weakening humanity's power. It all began with the disappearance of Karun's relic, and Tiny needs to prevent that from happening. The relics of humanity were granted by the goddess, known as the 7 Sacred Relics. The problem is that these relics will be stolen, but this time Tiny will not allow that to happen. He plans to join the army in battle, as the first catastrophe will occur in the Sea Kingdom of Karun. Before that, however, he decides to visit the Duke's house. Meanwhile, in the city at night, a strange figure arrives, putting everyone to sleep and using magic to question Glenn about what he knew regarding the Lord's death. Glenn shares what he knows, and the man puts him back to sleep. When Glenn awakens, one of the guards reports that the Lord's body has disappeared, complicating the investigation even further. The hooded man finds the body of the sword's owner and concludes that the culprit of the incident must be that boy who defeated the wolf and vanished. He swears vengeance against Tiny for disrupting the organization's plans. At the western gate of Valencia, Tiny's plan seems to be going well, except for the fact that they still don't have enough money to buy decent equipment. At that moment, a skinny man and a fat one show up, demanding that Tiny hand over all his money. Seeing this, Tiny asks them the same question, realizing he has found his problem solvers. He remembers a rule from his past life: if a large shadow appears in an alley, it's best to hide without breathing. Tiny always caught these alley guys and shook them down mercilessly. He quickly defeats the two thieves and takes their money. Soon after, more people arrive, claiming to be from the Rufus family. Tiny, however, has never heard of them and considers them too weak. One of the men tries to attack him but gets slapped in the face. The skinny man receives a solid kick to the head, showing that this group was no match for him. Plus, Tiny walks away with a good amount of money. After that, Tiny goes to an equipment shop and buys a leather armor and a club to strike his opponents in the head. As he leaves the store, he sees a crowd talking about an important person being in the city. Curious, he asks the vendor what's going on. The vendor reveals that the Princess of Valencia is patrolling the city. Upon hearing this, Tiny starts reflecting, remembering that if his sister taught him about affection, Chloe was the first person to give him hope. Even though the story between them didn't end on the best terms, it was thanks to the hope she gave him that he was able to keep going. These two people ended up changing his life. Tiny recalls that when he met the woman in his past life, she burst into laughter because the name Tiny didn't suit the giant man he had become. But in this life, he will meet her much sooner and secure a meeting with the Sword Emperor. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the eldest son of Count Lucent was showing the city to Chloe, discussing trade and everything else. However, Chloe interrupts, saying she wants to see the poorer parts of the city. The young man, not understanding why, agrees to take her. Chloe's interest in these areas was influenced by the education she received from her father, who told her to observe the poorest people and seek ways to improve their lives. According to him, only by doing so could the country become a better place. Chloe has a desire to change people's perception of reality, but when her fiancé is announced at the coming-of-age ceremony, she will no longer be free for the rest of her life. She even thinks about seeking refuge in a temple, but her father would be deeply saddened by that. At that moment, a child appears in front of her and the crowd wonders who that boy is. The child raises a ring and says the princess gave it to him, stating that she asked him to return the ring someday. Chloe recognizes the ring as hers but remembers that she had given it to a poor child. The guards immediately place a sword at the boy's throat, while he insists that it may be hard to believe, but he is the same child from before. He is the only one with dark hair in Felia's, or perhaps the only one in the entire duchy. Chloe is startled as the boy seems so weak and small just a short time ago. The child then uses his mana to summon the lunar wolf in its smaller form. Chloe is delighted by the wolf's cuteness, as only very pure children can summon such a spirit. She also compliments the name he gave the wolf, commenting that she wouldn't have imagined he had grown so much in just 2 months. The boy introduces himself as Tiny and explains that his growth accelerated because he awakened his mana. However, the red-haired girl is suspicious, finding the situation odd. The blonde suggests it would be better to interrogate him after a quarantine, but Tiny says he won't ask for trust. He recalls what the princess told him that day and expresses his desire to meet Lord Asgard von Valencia. The crowd again points swords at him, asking how he dares. Tiny responds that there's no way he could harm the Sword Saint, as there are only 7 superhumans across the entire continent, and one of them is the Sword Emperor, who can wield the power of destruction. Everyone is impressed, praising his excellency's prestige. However, Tiny expresses his wish to personally explain to the Duke what happened in Felia's. Sometime later, Chloe was interrogating her knight to find out if she was hiding anything beyond what Tiny had said. The knight reveals that there was a black mage in the Empire, and that it seems there's someone even greater behind it. Since Tiny experienced all of this, his testimony could be an important clue, so it's better to take him to her father soon. Meanwhile, Chloe asks how long the redhead is going to keep holding the wolf. She even tries to get the redhead to pet it, but the girl blushes from the animal's cuteness. Chloe then asks where Tiny is. In truth, the young Edmund had taken Tiny because he wanted to say something. At that moment, the wolf had already disappeared. Meanwhile, Tiny asks the young man what he knows about the black mage. In reality, it was just a trap to get Tiny to follow him, as now he was going to teach Tiny good manners with a slap session. However, on the first slap the young man tried to deliver, Tiny grabbed his hand with one of his own and didn't let go. Tiny only let go after scratching his ear and asked if, by bringing him there, he had prepared something interesting. So Tiny followed the young man. Meanwhile, the red-haired knight rode out on horseback looking for them because, according to the princess, the spirit disappears when the master is getting too far away. Outside the castle, they arrived at a place where the Rufus family lives. The man there was asking if Tiny had come for the product. However, Tiny wasn't interested in any of that. What he wanted was for the strong men to educate that commoner. One man tried to say something and got slapped in the face for questioning orders. When the other men stepped forward to face Tiny, they realized he was the same boy from earlier. They were terrified and told the boss that this was the boy who had defeated them. The boss grabbed a club and rushed at Tiny, but Tiny pushed him back with a single blow, asking if that was all they had. He was ready to take down everyone there. However, before he could do anything, the men were already passed out from fear. The two remaining ones didn't want to fight at all. Sometime later, the redhead arrived and saw that everyone had been defeated, while Tiny sat atop a chest reading. He handed the chest to her, which contained a book of bribes, as those men had been involved in human trafficking. With that, the stupid blonde wouldn't be able to fool anyone anymore. After that incident, the foolish blonde was expelled from the duchy, and finally, Tiny was ready to meet the Sword Saint. In truth, the young Edmund had taken Tiny because he wanted to say something. In the carriage, Tiny asks if she doesn't distrust him, and in fact, she's already heard of the dark-haired boy from Philias. They say he destroyed the underworld organization and freed all the victims, and he's just done it again. That's incredible, but she still scolds him because he needs to warn her before doing these things. 3 days later, the knights stop and ask the princess why an elf requested to accompany them. She immediately says that she is an envoy of the World Tree Arena, and she came to greet the travelers because she wishes to join them at this moment. The girls are delighted by the elf, while Tiny notices that she is a fifth circle sorceress. These elves are descendants of fairies, famous for their beauty. Elvenheim, the kingdom of the elves, is located at the far west of the map, so it was always very difficult to see elves in the Aslan Empire. Even so, most people are friendly toward them, as elves are born with elemental abilities and are known for being pure, kind, and gentle. However, since this elf is a fifth circle black mage, it's odd. She explains to the princess that she is passing through the duchy on her way to the kingdom of Werevist. The elf formally introduces herself to the group, showing respect and stating that her goal is to travel the world listening to stories. She asks if the princess is the owner of the spirit, but the real owner is the boy right behind, our Tiny, who is suspicious, as he never thought someone like her would be of high rank in the organization. Switching to acting mode, he says, "Wow, it's my first time seeing an elf," while the other girl asks if he's gone crazy, grabbing her leg. Fortunately, this lady doesn't know about the Moonwolf's abilities, as only the owner can know that. While they were talking, the elf demonstrated magic, and Tiny began analyzing the situation. They have 12 level 3 specialists and a level 4 warrior. Thinking about it, the stages of a mage's circles and a mana user can be seen as equivalent. To defeat someone of a higher level, at least 5 people of 1 level below would be necessary. In other words, if he, who is level 2, wants to beat someone from the 5th circle, he would need at least 100 copies of himself, since with just one attack from her, he'd be done for. Fortunately, they have a secret card and just need to wait for the right opportunity. When the little wolf jumped on the elf, she suggested holding him for a bit. At the first "come here, darling," the wolf transformed into its monstrous form, and Tiny started attacking with his hammer, while the redhead came in with her sword because that elf is a black mage. A few minutes earlier, Tiny had warned the princess, using the Moonwolf, that this was a dark elf, and that if they didn't launch a surprise attack, they'd be in danger. That's why the wolf jumped on the redhead to deliver the message. Now back to the action, Tiny hammering from one side and the redhead with her sword. When the elf dodged, she ascended into the air with her magic while the knights advanced. Tiny tried a left swing, but it didn't work as she used magic against the group, wondering how these bastards figured her out. Tiny, with his wit, responds mentally. Of course we'd know, her stench can be smelled from miles away. Because of that, a giant spell exploded in Tiny's direction, but he managed to use some kind of shield, so the damage wasn't too severe, although still dangerous. The redhead advanced while Tiny mounted the wolf and kept hammering at the elf's shield. Now the two attacked together to finally break that black elf's shield, and since it dealt a lot of damage, Tiny came down, slamming her into the ground. At that point, the two of them came again while she cast magic at all the knights, aiming at the princess. The redhead managed to defend. Tiny then used his iron armor and came from above, as now it was full force. This caused a massive explosion, and finally it broke the elf's shield. The redhead advanced again, but the elf cast more magic. Even wounded, she still had all that power. With his iron body, Tiny started hammering the woman, who caused a mega explosion, almost as if the asphalt were burning. From above, she began summoning a strange power, and Tiny realized that she was the last follower of the demon, sacrificing her own body to increase her powers. She then used the offering of flames on the knights, burning them all. Everyone was at their limit, and they needed a greater force to finish off that wretched woman. And so it was Chloe's turn to act. Chloe came in with power of light, Shane. For in this world there is divine power granted through penance and blessings. Those who achieve priesthood through penance upon being baptized learn about divine power and receive anti-demon powers. However, there are people who are born with this power, like a saint or a warrior, who are said to be sent by God, beings who are rarely born. Chloe is one of those rare beings, a cleric, someone who wasn't born into priesthood. The knights were astonished as she had hidden her divine power even from them. According to Tiny, Chloe is the most powerful cleric he has ever seen, and now her power would be enough to wipe out the damned elf. When the elf fell to the ground, Tiny was quick to hammer her head, but when it came time to finish her off and seal her in the coffin, Chloe ran over saying that she couldn't die as she needed to be interrogated. Chloe still needed to know the reason behind all of this. Even so, it seemed that the last hammer strike was the last thing the elf saw. Chloe thought of healing her with her divine power while her guards commented on how incredible the princess was. And with that, Chloe's secret was revealed. Chloe asked Tiny if he already knew all of that, since he was the only one who didn't seem surprised. Tiny, a bit awkwardly, explained that he knew but still couldn't reveal the reason. One day, she would certainly find out. To his surprise, Chloe replied with a simple, "Alright, but next time tell me." Tiny then revealed that the black mage was after him because of the trouble he had gotten himself into. For Chloe, it was fine because it was the duty of nobles to eliminate all threats. If she had died, it would have been her own fault for not having enough power. This showed that Chloe was still the same as she was in her past life. She gave him a few pats as he was worried about something silly. Meanwhile, our red-headed lady arrived, commenting that Tiny really hated being called a child. She came over, pulling his cheeks, teasing him because a child really doesn't like being called cute. Then the princess mentioned that she needed to report everything to her father as soon as possible. They continued their journey to Tybin, the main gate. Tiny knew that the princess's father took very good care of her, but he thought that this was a bit much as all the knights of the Blue Wing were there to escort her. These knights are, at the very least, specialists, and they are the most powerful group in the Empire. They all kneeled as they presented themselves to the princess, and she commented that they had done an excellent job. Baron stood up, saying he was happy for the princess's safety, as her excellency had been very worried. The princess, however, was certain she had informed them that she was 100% safe, and that there was no need for such a fuss. According to Garin, if there hadn't been an emergency, the Lord would have come personally. The truth is, about a month and a half ago, the Tempest family's relic disappeared, a relic that is always with her father. When Tiny heard that, he immediately asked if the relic was an artifact. Not even Chloe knew, as it's a secret that can only be passed down to the head of the family. Faced with this, Tiny believed he knew the reason behind the relic's disappearance and asked to see his excellency, saying that he would reveal what he knew. Shortly after, Garin asked who that boy was. According to the others, he was incredible, and they said he was the one who had captured a black mage. Moreover, he's almost at the level of an expert. Garin was astonished as not even the 7 great knights had reached that level at such a young age, so he concluded that Tiny was either a genius or, more likely, a monster. Reflecting on this, the big man finally remembered that Tiny was the boy who had brought the letter from Philias. On the way, Chloe was admiring the landscape. Tiny asked if she liked those lilac flowers, and she told him that her father and her late mother had also loved them very much, and that's why she had been given her name. Our redhead also commented that the love between the Duke and the lady was quite famous. While they talked about this, Tiny recalled his mother's last words. In truth, he didn't like that flower, but she had asked him not to forget that detail. Surely, he wanted to keep that a secret. Either way, he knew he needed to find the Sword Emperor to establish his training and figure out a way to become stronger. After all, if he didn't at least reach the level of a commander, he wouldn't be able to help with anything. In this life, Tiny was determined to destroy everyone who stood in his way. Finally, they arrived in Valentino, where the mansion of the Duke of Valencia is located, one of the largest in the Empire. Upon arriving, the guards were all joyful, while the princess asked if this was Tiny's first time there. At that moment, a bearded man appeared, shouting, "Chloe, my daughter, are you alright?" And she, embarrassed, replied, stop it. Everyone's watching. This is so embarrassing." After being scolded by his daughter, the man thanked the knights and announced that a banquet was awaiting them. Then he asked who the boy was, and Chloe answered that she had already mentioned him, saying that Tiny was the boy who would talk about the Black Mage. Tiny stepped forward, saying he knew where the Tempest artifact was. The crowd was surprised, murmuring, "Oh boy, he spilled the beans." At that moment, the swordsman called the boy cheeky and exerted pressure on him, but Tiny resisted, despite the pressure from the man's soul. Even so, the Emperor remarked that Tiny still had a lot to learn before reaching his former level. He also mentioned that among the 7 knights, Estina had the highest proficiency, and Jurek could have reached that level. With that, the Emperor dissipated the tension and asked if Tiny was alright to speak about the artifact at that moment. Chloe, for her part, commented that Tiny was just a child and might not know what he was doing. But either way, the Emperor said he needed to have a conversation with him. In the room, the Emperor asked if Tiny knew anything about the disappearance of the Tempest artifact. Tiny confirmed and in his thoughts reflected that Tempest is one of the few ancient words he knew, meaning time or opportunity. If the artifact disappeared a month ago, perhaps his power was to turn back time. Tell me more, boy, the Emperor said, curious. So Tiny began explaining that everything started with a catastrophe that would only occur in 20 years. He detailed the entire story of how he managed to return to the past, explaining everything. The Sword Emperor commented that the story was well crafted, and that Tiny even knew the names of the World Tree's guardians, the first hammer of the dwarves, and the orc warrior. According to Tiny, they had been his companions for a year, although it was hard to believe even that those two were always at odds. The Emperor then concluded that Depis means time or opportunity, and that only one person can be sent to the past after sacrificing the life of a very powerful human. He also warned that descendants must use this with great caution. These were the words passed down along with the family relic, but honestly, he hadn't thought they were true. However, the circumstances seemed real, even if it was difficult to trust his own judgment. He had relied on someone else's talents and brought brought someone back to the past. If he had been the one to go back, he would have used his experiences to organize humanity's power and face the Demon King's army. That's why he was astonished that it wasn't him, but Tiny who had returned. Only Tiny in the future knew why. Before he died, he spoke of saving talents. It was then that Tiny realized the man was losing it. The swordsman came to the conclusion that he didn't know exactly when he would return. The only thing he knew was that one must return to the moment when their soul was most disturbed. Seeing this, Tiny must have returned to the moment he found his determination, which is why he went back to the day his sister died. Now the swordsman had two more things to check: if his future self had told Tiny to find him, and if he had prepared some form of confirmation. And yes, that was the case, as his daughter's given name was Lilith, chosen because it was his wife's favorite flower. However, the truth was that he didn't really like that flower. He began to laugh because this was something he would have said as a password, and now it finally made sense to him, as only this explained the disappearance of the relic. Perhaps because they were in the past, but that old man still had a sense of humor. Even so, he needed to check something else and sent for Night Warrior. He believed in Tiny's regression, but trusting him was another matter. So to prove his abilities, which had been recognized by his future self, he decided to test him. It seems a bit unfair, doesn't it? First, the old man tells him to find him, and now Tiny has to prove his abilities. That's double the work. Then the swordsman asked if Tiny had ever thought about what the future would be like. Tiny started circling around the question, asking if he wanted to know about the future of the duchy. But, in fact, what the man really wanted to know about was the omen of a disaster. He also warned Tiny to never tell people about the future, as humans evolve through their mistakes and failures. The swordsman took pride in having taught his children the right path. With that, Tiny felt relieved, as he only knew a little about the princess. In the past, Tiny had faced many difficulties and couldn't get close to the aristocracy. The man's eyes widened and he exclaimed, "What?" He had no idea what might happen in the future. The only thing he knew was that the nobility would become a mess. As the man became agitated, Tiny asked what else he wanted to know. Since Tiny was an ally from the future, the least the man needed to know was what the heck had happened, because, seriously, what a mess. So it was better for him to remember things correctly before getting beaten to death. That night, Tiny found himself in trouble with the old man because he couldn't remember much of anything. What he knew, aside from what he had personally experienced, were just rumors or stories told by his comrades. The old man, irritated, asked if there was any useful information at all, at least. In the end, the only worthwhile thing was about the warrior and the saint who appeared according to the oracle. The warrior's name was Crombell, and he was 20 years old. So the old man said, then I'll train him. The problem was, if Crombell was from 20 years in the future, right now in the past, Crombell hadn't even been born yet. The man became desperate, thinking of blaming his future self. So he asked the butler to bring Drexler instead of Royer, because there was someone present who deserved punishment. Drexler was the vice captain of the Blue Wing Knights, level 5 of the upper rank. The old man stated that the boy needed to be tested to see if he was worthy of his trust. Drexler was shocked because he would have to fight a child. Immediately, thoughts started running through his head. Oh no, I'm going to get fired. How will I support my household without money? The old man scolded him, telling him not to get lost in useless thoughts, as this was a very important matter. When Drexler looked at Tiny, he saw that the boy was probably around 10 years old and already at level 2. Even so, the old man ordered the vice captain to introduce him to the artisan who made the hammer. He quickly gave several tips to improve things. Then the old man hurried, saying that if Tiny didn't perform well, there would be no deal, and he asked Drexler to hold nothing back and fight with full force. In the end, it was decided that if Tiny landed at least one hit, the promise would be fulfilled. They began preparing, and the old man stopped to think that Tiny had a unique way of handling his mana. If it were him, he could also become a specialist far beyond the limit. But still, it was that child who returned, and there must be a reason for that. The battle began. Tiny summoned the Moonwolf and charged forward. The captain came in with his hammer, but Tiny dodged and managed to land a hit on his shoulder armor. Drexler found it amusing and leaped up, smashing everything around, while Tiny evaded using the wolf, deciding to compete in speed. Drexler then launched a big attack on the ground, destroying the pillars from which Tiny had been jumping, almost hitting him in the face. Tiny concluded that Drexler specialized in defense, which allowed him to predict all his movements. Even so, he dodged everything, literally. Drexler was impressed, but still said it wasn't enough. The old man shouted at Drexler to stop stalling. Drexler then used his soul weapon, leaving even the old man speechless, and ordered him to stop. But Tiny advanced, and there was a huge explosion when their attacks collided. Shortly after, Tiny was sent flying, and both men were concerned about what had happened. The only thing Tiny said was, "I won," since at the height of the attack, he had thrown his mini hammer toward the vice captain, cutting his face. Still, it was crazy, as Tiny could have died. But he didn't die, and he won because ever since his past life, that's how he acted. Otherwise, life becomes nothing but a dead end. After all, this is just a game where we need to win at any cost, and that's how he's lived up to now. The Duke agreed, thinking that in Tiny's previous life, he must have believed it was worth trying something reckless. And as promised, the old Duke would keep his word and give Tiny what he needed. The moment Tiny thanked him, he collapsed to the ground and took a nap. When he woke up, he was in a room, and the Duke called him, saying they had a lot to talk about. In a hallway, Chloe appeared, calling the Duke and asking where he was taking the boy who had just woken up, asking if he was going to hurt him again. The Duke responded that Tiny had hurt himself himself, asking how he could harm his daughter's benefactor. Sure, Clo replied. Tiny was confused by this benefactor talk, thinking it was the opposite, and apologized to Clo, saying he was greedy and ended up getting hurt. Clo, happy, said that Tiny should act more like a child. Meanwhile, her father looked at him suspiciously and warned Tiny that he was watching him. Embarrassed, Tiny commented that he didn't deserve to be called the princess's benefactor, as that never originally happened. Hearing this, Clo asked what they were talking about, but the Duke quickly replied that it was nothing, telling her to focus on her coming-of-age ceremony. In the Duke's room, he mentioned that he forgot to inform Tiny of something important. The fact that Tiny had returned to the past must be kept a secret. Only a few people could know. This must not reach the ears of the priests because the flow of time and space is the axis of destiny organized by the Creator, a power that not even the goddess can touch. A mere human defying this would be blasphemy. This was the reason the Duke's family kept the existence of Tempus a secret. Tiny was confused, thinking the goddess wouldn't be the Creator, but the Duke explained that this had been erased from the scriptures long ago. He reiterated that only the 10 knights he had mentioned should know, keeping the priests out of it. Now, Tiny felt relieved because he knew he would become much stronger than before. He asked what abilities he would use in the future, but what he really wanted to know was about the promise the Duke had made. Or is he getting senile and forgetting? He thought. Without missing a beat, the Duke smacked Tiny on the head, saying that Tiny first needed to learn some manners. Then he started dragging him along, asking if he had ever heard of a force called gravity. Zum zum zum, don't fall asleep, lazy boy. The Duke explained that his family's vision was divided into 4 fundamental parts: mana techniques and sword techniques that combine defense and attack, a method to acquire attributes in 3 steps, and a method to gain aura characteristics in 7 stages. Because of this, it made sense that Tiny's courage was so strong. And since Tiny uses an offensive weapon, he doesn't need sword training, although learning that monstrous defense technique would be very beneficial. The Duke went on to say that he would teach Tiny how to acquire attributes, and Tiny quickly responded, but it won't be defense, right? Changing the scene, the hooded figures discussed that Elaine was dead and the culprit was a child they believed to be a descendant of the Morse family. Their mission was to gather information on this boy, but they reminded themselves that, for now, Jerem's task was more important. Back to Tiny, he discovered that to acquire attributes, he must possess attributes. According to him, his body already had convenient attributes, but after the fight, the Duke checked and saw that even with a child's strength, Tiny was heavier than most knights. Thinking back in his previous life, the Duke probably wore heavy armor. The heavier the body, the heavier the armor. In other words, the more energy absorbed, the slower the movements would be. The reason for this, according to some warlocks, is something called gravity. If Tiny could master this attribute, the heavier his body became, the faster and stronger he would become. The Duke continued explaining that there is an attractive force between objects, which is mass. The heavier the object, the greater the attraction. What are you talking about, Grandpa? Tiny interrupted. Listen here, you brat. The continents have a great force that pulls them together. Tiny, confused, retorted, attract what with that? Are you sure you're eating well? Because if that were true, the world should be lying flat on the ground. The Duke, already irritated, replied, do you know why things fall from high places? It's always been like that, right? Tiny said, still not understanding. The Duke sighed, this is complicated, but if you don't get it, that's fine. Now let's learn what gravity is in practice. With that, he grabbed Tiny and took him to the top of a building. Now tell me why someone who climbs so high could fall. Gravity, Tiny answered. And there he went, tumbling down the wooden structure, learning firsthand what gravity is. In the middle of the fall, he called his Moonwolf, who luckily saved him, well, sort of. The Duke appeared shortly after, asking if Tiny had understood the force of gravity. Still a bit lost, Tiny listened as the Duke said, I think we need a little more practice. After much torture, Tiny woke up to find Clo healing him, asking if he had become a specialist yet. Tiny, surprised, realized that the training had worked. Even the princess couldn't believe her father put the boy through such ridiculous training, where he had to keep falling and climbing over and over until he became a specialist. Tiny then asked if it was okay for her to be there instead of practicing for her coming-of-age ceremony. She replied that all she needed to do was practice etiquette. Tiny, trying to be encouraging, told her she would do well, only to get a light smack from Clo, who asserted that on that day, she would be the star of the party. She added that it was fine for her to be there because, after all, Tiny was part of the family too and could start calling her sister from now on. She then asked if Tiny could keep a secret. Cut to the next scene. We now see Drexler, who had heard that Tiny had become a specialist and was itching for a rematch, this time without weapons. It's not typical for knights to lose their patience with a child, but Drexler was ready for a fight. The battle began. Drexler unleashed his aura, prepared for combat, and Tiny, without hesitation, jumped forward, hammering Drexler's shield. The knight, shocked, thought, impossible. Is this the same boy from last week? Before he could react, Tiny kicked him, sending him flying backward. Drexler halted his fall and charged again, his hammer colliding with Tiny's fist in a powerful clash that pushed them both back. Drexler, astonished, noticed his hand was trembling. This kid is strong. Tiny then started attacking from all angles. In a final move, he jumped over Drexler, leaving him confused. The audience was also amazed at how easily Tiny handled such a heavy club. Drexler, furious, charged again, and Tiny decided to confront his strength directly, getting thrown aside. However, this was part of his plan. He prepared himself and once more jumped over, using the Tiny Combat Style Method, Level 1. He activated the Lightning Slam, destroying the entire arena and leaving the Vice Captain on the ground, while everyone wondered, is this the power of a specialist? Tiny was there, thanking everyone for their help, while the other, Relax, said, I was going easy on you. You know that, right? Tiny also mentioned that he wasn't even using all his strength because he was also an elementalist. That's when the captain burst out laughing, saying that Tiny had passed and welcomed him to the Blue Wing. However, Tiny surprised everyone by stating that he did not want to join the Templar Knights. The captain was shocked. What? Then why did you run the family vision? Later, with the Duke, he explained that he had forgotten to inform the Blue Wing that if Tiny intended to travel across the continent, it would be better not to belong to any family. Anyway, the Duke commented that Tiny had exceeded expectations, especially after being thrown 1,001 times from the building. Now they were almost ready to face the first catastrophe. What was missing was to create an artifact, a warhammer for Tiny. An artifact infused with almost permanent magical power is a very valuable item, but it would require at least several years worth of salary to buy something like that. Surprisingly, the Duke already had a hammer that had been crafted for several months, originally intended as a gift for the Vice Captain. So they went to the best forge in Valentia, Rendell's hammer. There, Tiny asked them to resize the hammer to his size. The blacksmith, irritated, said he preferred to cancel the contract and pay the penalty because a job like this is no child's play. Seeing this, Tiny remembered someone saying that dwarves want weapons to find their true owners, even if they end up at loss. Thus, he realized he needed to prove that he deserved the hammer. When the dwarf took another look at Tiny, he noticed that he was already a specialist even at such a young age and was left speechless. Dwarves have a characteristic in their right eye that detects truth and lies based on the waves of words. Seeing this, the dwarf decided to make an exception. Inside the forge, the dwarf began to show the hammer but warned that it was still not ready, as he needed to work on the protection magic. Tiny commented that a warhammer artifact was not something common or popular, and anyone would be foolish to refuse the spell. The blacksmith then revealed that he had only one more warhammer, a black steel hammer covered in weight amplification runes which ended up becoming too heavy, and he abandoned the project. Surprisingly, Tiny loved the design and asked what else the blacksmith had. The blacksmith showed off the beauty, warning that there was no point in being greedy as the hammer weighed over 100 kilograms. Tiny, upon lifting it, exclaimed, "Erg, it really is heavy," and began smashing it down, destroying the ground and everything around. He was enchanted with the hammer and commented that even though it was a bit small, it reminded him of Nocturne, which he used in his past life. Tiny then asked if the blacksmith could help him make a dagger so he could use it once he grew up. Of course, the blacksmith agreed to help. He also wanted to know the name of the hammer. The name of this beauty is Stamp, revealed the blacksmith. Later, with the Duke, Tiny told him about the hammer he chose, saying that it would take 2 weeks to make the adjustments. He was still a long way from becoming invincible. The Duke, curious, asked, "Where did you learn this invincible stuff?" In fact, he had learned some Eastern languages because of his appearance, with black hair. Seeing this, the Duke burst out laughing, telling him to speak more like that because sometimes Tiny seemed a bit foolish to me. Since it would take 2 weeks for the hammer to be ready, Tiny would head to Chloe's coming-of-age ceremony. At this ceremony, the Duke planned to make that big announcement, a connection with the imperial family. That's when Tiny asked if he really intended to do that, even knowing that the prince would die on the day of the wedding. Tiny revealed that in the summer of the following year, all direct members of the imperial family of Aslan would die in the second catastrophe. As a result, the empire, which was considered the strongest nation, would suffer from internal conflicts, and the power of the nation would become fragmented. The princess would become a widow and the only survivor of the entire imperial family. In the end, she would receive the title of Imperial Princess of Misfortune. Now that the Duke knew this, he was determined to ensure that such a tragedy would not occur. According to Tiny, that was all he knew. There were rumors that the second prince was to blame, but in the end, he also died. Even the Duke couldn't figure out what happens in the afterlife. The Duke commented that his daughter, Chloe, was brilliant, a person with a personality that shone brighter than her appearance. Later, the whole world would see this. Even with his help, it was Chloe who managed to rebuild the ruined empire. However, she was not happy. For this reason, for the sake of his daughter and the world, the Duke would choose a path that could avoid as many tragedies as possible. He would save Chloe in his own way, but by saying this in front of her father, Tiny ended up getting a bump on the head. A few days later, the white-haired knight commented that they were receiving many guests. One of them was the commander of the Blue Wing Knights, Genus. He informed them that they had received a guest from Roctor, the third son, known as a parasite. The Duchy of Roctor was a powerhouse of the empire, a family that had been competing with Valentia for generations. The Duke ordered them to inform, "This is Valentia, not Roctor." He then asked Genus if he happened to have any illness. Since Genus did not, the Duke told him not to take everything on himself and asked if he had ever considered getting married. Genus replied that he absolutely did not want that, thinking the Duke was acting strangely that day. In reality, the Duke was asking these questions because Tiny did not know Genus's name, who was a very powerful knight. Somehow, Tiny thought that he might not be in his future. However, a mana user at level 6, like Genus, wouldn't die in some common battle, so probably his death would be caused by the second catastrophe. While Tiny was lost in thought, Chloe arrived accompanied by the red-haired girl. Tiny asked why she was there since many guests were arriving. Chloe said that when she was with Tiny, she heard interesting stories and could still see the little wolf wolf, so she quickly began to pick up the fluffy little wolf. At that moment, a guy appeared, commenting that the Angel of Valencia was indeed very beautiful. This was Tybron von Rochter. Upon hearing this name, Chloe and the red-haired girl were surprised. What? A Rochter? Tybron Bold asked if Chloe knew that he would become her lifelong partner. He invited her to have some wine, but the red-haired girl, who was in charge of the knights, ordered him to step back as the princess was not permitted to interact with the guests. Tybron, irritated, said, "A female knight wants to interrupt me," and called over his own big knight to impose respect on the women. However, they forgot that Tiny was there. The same actor, confused, asked his sister who those people were. When Tybron's knight was ordered to get rid of Tiny, he received a smack in the face because he was already being a nuisance. The knight then advanced, but Tiny responded with another slap, knocking him down. The knights observing from above were surprised by the scene, asking, "Who the hell is this kid?" At that moment, the big creature flew face first into the ground while the people up top kept asking, "Who is that kid?" According to the blonde guy with the thick eyebrows, that's a legendary genius. The Duke of Valencia ended up with a tremendous monster. He thought he needed to find that boy someday until he asked the man if the Rochers were really trying to get close to the imperial family. In his view, the Rochers were trying to destroy the relationship between the imperial family and Valencia. But down below, they had to deal with those idiots. The guy said that His Majesty didn't need to worry because the children of Valencia cared very much for the youngest, and they were all coming of age. After a while, Tiny went to meet the old man who was saying that Thibron had been expelled from the family. Thanks to that, Tiny didn't need to apologize for attacking a noble, and there he was just unhem and ham eating some good cookies. Meanwhile, the Duke, furious, stood up, telling him to get a grip because at this rate, he was trying to go to prison before the Demon King's army attacked. Tiny commented that the Duke was acting strange, and the Duke himself knew it and wanted to smash that idea at Thibron. Tiny left while the old man was going crazy inside since he was going to wipe out that good-for-nothing. Outside, 2 copies of the buff old man appeared, but younger, because they dared to mess with his sister. The guys were so thirsty that they didn't even look ahead. One of them bumped into Tiny and was thrown far away just from the impact. The other was scared to see all that power around Tiny and asked if that kid was Tiny, the same one who fought against Drexler. Since it was indeed him, the rumors must be true. But it was a shame they couldn't talk now because they had some things to settle there. So they ran off saying they wouldn't let the good-for-nothing leave Valencia alive. Tiny saw that the name Aaron from one of them sounded familiar, but who was the other guy with him? There was only one young master in the future. Perhaps what happened to the other was the same as with the guy with white hair, and that's why he started cursing the imperial family since they always considered the Aislinn lineage to be the noblest. Only they were allowed to be invited to the banquet. Even the guests from Valencia had a limited number, without even imagining what the consequences would be. However, behind Tiny, those men arrived, saying it was good to check the surroundings. Tiny turned and asked, "Who is he?" Since he realized that this is a fallacy phase created by magic, he introduced himself as Baron Redley von Narsa, a guest at the princess's ceremony. He commented on the rumors and said it was a pleasure to meet Tiny, asking if he was really from Valencia. But in fact, the Duke was just looking after Tiny for a while. "Ah, the Duke has a good eye, doesn't he?" said the Baron. Then Tiny replied, "This is Valencia, so be careful what you say about the Duke." At that moment, the man burst out laughing and said he deserved that. He said that since they were advising each other, they could even consider themselves friends. He then invited Tiny to dinner and celebrate that friendship. Meanwhile, Tiny thought about whether he should knock him out, but remembering the Duke's nagging, he decided to hold back. However, the Baron kept saying that Tiny was close to the princess and that he wanted to meet her. That's when Tiny, not even letting the man finish, raised his hand, realizing the mistake he had made as the guy flew to the other side. At that instant, the man escorting the Baron drew his sword and charged at Tiny. He came in with such rage that his teeth turned black, competing in strength with Tiny. In the middle of the clash, Tiny realized that he was controlling the space with mana, which indicated that he was already at the level of a challenger. Furious, the man shouted that he would rip Tiny's hand off, but at that moment, the little wolf appeared from behind. The man got distracted while defending himself, and Tiny took the opportunity to throw a punch right in his face, but it was all for nothing, as the man didn't even move and threw Tiny away, preparing his sword for the attack. Tiny defended himself with the help of the wolf, but was thrown back, where Egghead was coming in strong. However, at the moment of the final confrontation, the man in the back told the other to stop, saying that the mistake was his and not Tiny's. After a while, the man with white hair said it was an honor to meet Tiny. He apologized for what happened earlier when Tiny hit the other guy with his hand. He said that this time he would let it go, but Tiny needed to know that Valencia wasn't such a kind place. Moreover, he commented that people with magical disguises were allowed to do that, and added that he also had high expectations for Tiny. Curious, Tiny asked who that was in disguise. While the man said it was confidential, Tiny questioned whether it was someone linked to the imperial family, since challengers were quite rare on the continent. Tiny ended up thinking that the guy must be some sort of inspector from the imperial family. A week later, at the coming-of-age ceremony, Whitehead was thinking that he would make this the most beautiful day for Chloe. Meanwhile, Tiny was standing by, just munching away and asking what that dish was called. He kept eating until the man got irritated, telling him to stop chewing immediately or he would get beaten up. Tiny asked what was wrong. At that moment, the same man who had received a few slaps appeared, asking for a moment to talk. Tiny then apologized, saying he had had been very rude that time. But contrary to how it seems, he said he admired Tiny's attitude at that moment. In the back, someone commented that now the star of the day enters, Princess Clo von Valentia, accompanied by her father and brothers. Just by looking and waving her little hand, everyone was impressed. Even if this guy's scoundrel said she was very beautiful, while Tiny thought about whether to slap her or not. In her mind, after today, everything will change. Seeing that cute face, Tiny uses his powers as an elementalist to put on a show with his little wolf, making our Clo happy. The people, however, were wondering what that creature was doing there. Seeing the situation, Tiny summoned the giant form of the lunar wolf, and everyone was impressed because it was a spirit. Even the crazy guy complimented him, saying it was amazing and thanked Tiny for the distraction. After that, the Duke began his speech, presenting a necklace to the princess because the highlight of the ceremony was to introduce the princess's fiancé. At that moment, the Duke used a presentation magic, projecting a video of the prince introducing himself as Van Azran. He declared that he was very happy to have the Angel of Valentia as his companion. Seeing this, the audience at the ceremony was left speechless. Then the Baron stood up and said it was his turn. Tiny tried to stop him, asking where he was going, but the Baron just laughed and told him to read Narsa backward. Upon doing that, Tiny realized it spells Azran, the same name as the prince. At that moment, the Baron removed the magic that concealed his face. Tiny was surprised because he realized he had slapped the prince's hair, and now he was in trouble. Would it be better to let him die at the wedding? But our Pale One said that His Highness had already forgiven Tiny. After all, it was the prince himself who sought this engagement to defy the Emperor's wishes, who preferred the Roctor family. Then the Duke sent a message to Tiny, saying everything was ready. Later, Tiny was in a room with the Duke, who thanked him for the presentation with the spirit. However, the Duke mentioned that it was a bit hard to believe that Humanitas, the sacred relic of Karam, had disappeared and that Orthus, the capital, had been destroyed by the attack of the great demon Kraken. Now they needed to prevent such catastrophes from occurring. As for the stamp, it was also ready. The next day, Tiny went to pick up his beauty and was eager to test it. The bearded man encouraged him, and soon Tiny headed to the forest, striking blows against the people, realizing that it was better than he had expected. Then, the little wolf called him to run under the moonlight, and running that way, they would reach Port Anaxon in a week. Meanwhile, in the organization, a hooded figure said that the Moorish child left the duchy riding on his spirit and was moving 4 times faster than normal, heading toward the nearest port of Karun. The crazy guy in the meeting, irritated with the situation, decided he would take care of it himself. Then, further ahead, Tiny found himself facing a gang of lunatics blocking the way. He asked, "Who are these idiots?" The men, offended, said he was done for, as he was just an elementalist facing 5 of them. The men charged, saying the Black Knights would teach him a lesson. One of them shot an arrow, but Tiny deflected it with one hand, which scared them. Even so, they continued advancing, thinking that being outnumbered would ensure their victory. Tiny, happy, raised his hammer and broke the first opponent's ribs. Alarmed, the others wondered if that was really the level of the specialist. Mockingly, Tiny said, "The knights are really amazing." Realizing they were at a disadvantage, the men began to flee, claiming they weren't paid for this. Tiny jumped off the wolf and struck the ground with such force that the earth swallowed his enemies, burying them. Impressed with the power of the stamp, Tiny wondered how those idiots knew where he was going. At that moment, a tree fell in his direction, and he realized that a 2-headed troll was behind him. Tiny was confused as he hadn't expected a high-class monster in that place. Meanwhile, Tiny explained that the classification of monsters is determined according to their capabilities. A Class 5 monster, for example, is equivalent to a 5th Circle mage. So why the hell is a Class 5 monster here, he thought. Riding his wolf, Tiny dodged the attacks while a hooded figure in the distance controlled the troll, ordering it to crush Tiny right there. Finally, Tiny understood what was happening and commanded the lunar wolf to catch the scoundrel. The troll charged with an axe, chopping everything around, but Tiny barely managed to escape. The berserker seemed uncontrollable, knocking down trees as it attacked. Tiny thought, monsters of this classification have strength-enhancing abilities and regeneration, but the berserker mode has a limitation. I need to hold on until an opening appears. As the troll spewed fire from its mouth, Tiny realized they were using a lot of mana. However, he ended up tripping, and the monster took the opportunity to attack with the axe. In reflex, Tiny hooked the troll with his hammer, throwing it away. Without wasting time, Tiny jumped up and brought down the hammer with all of his strength on the monster, thinking, this hammer is really awesome. The blow shattered the troll's arm, but it began to regenerate quickly and charge at Tiny again. Meanwhile, the wizard, who was about a kilometer away, observed the battle and said, Tiny won't hold out much longer. However, Tiny continued dodging the attacks, until finally they reached a dead end. The troll charged with the axe, but at that exact moment, the berserker mode ended. Tiny realized that the final gap had appeared. The lunar wolf jumped and bit the wizard while Tiny prepared to finish off the troll once and for all. And then Tiny brought down the lightning hammer, defeating the monster for good. Now he was ready to play with the cursed wizard. The guy, desperate, began to speak, revealing that the organization's headquarters was in the lawless city of the Alliance and the boss was the mayor there. However, since he spoke so easily, Tiny suspected that it might not be true. The wizard continued saying that Tiny's wolf was his spirit animal and had an explosion spell. Therefore, he couldn't let a 5th Circle tamer escape so easily. Tiny shot back, saying he knew they were trying to steal a relic of Karun, and that's why he wanted to know who had given the wizard the mission. Tiny made it clear that if the wizard didn't tell him, he would make his head explode, as the chance of that happening was now in Tiny's hands. After a fireworks show, Tiny finally arrived at the port city of Anaxon, remembering that the Duke had said he would wait for him at the city bar. Upon arriving there, Tiny was surprised, as the reinforcement the Duke had mentioned was none other than himself, the Emperor of the Sword. But soon after, the Duke's expression changed when a red-haired man said that the bar didn't sell alcohol to children. Tiny tried to look closer, but it didn't seem to be magical makeup, and he couldn't sense any mana. Suddenly, the drunks in the back of the bar started laughing, commenting that this wasn't a place for children. Then Tiny summoned his big wolf to bring order to the lunatics. At that moment, the red-haired man realized that Tiny was the specialist with black hair and decided to accompany him to a private room. Inside, Tiny saw the Duke's identification and discovered that he was part of the secret organization of Valentia, the Black Wing, an organization known for being excellent in both combat and information gathering. The red-haired man introduced himself as Jay, the commander of the Black Wings. Confused, Tiny asked why, being the leader, Jay didn't seem to have the slightest power to be at least a blader, as Tiny couldn't sense a drop of mana in him. Jay explained that he hadn't awakened his mana yet. At that moment, while running his hand over his head, Tiny discovered that the disguised man was the Duke himself. Tiny realized he hadn't gone crazy seeing him earlier, but now it was time to work. The Duke revealed that Gale Anderson, the Tsunami Mage who was supposed to receive a letter of recommendation, was missing. Tiny was stunned because a Tsunami Mage was the title given to a 7th Circle Mage, an extremely powerful person. According to the Duke, they had lost contact with Gale during his voyage, and it had already been 2 weeks since his disappearance. Then the Duke explained the backup plan and the new identity that Tiny would have to assume. Before leaving, Tiny asked Jay if he knew the name Hustle, since he was the follower of the cult responsible for the incident in Karun. Before having his head blown off, Hustle had revealed this information. At that moment, someone knocked on the door, saying that they were there. Then, all sinister, Tiny began to say that the big fish had arrived. But outside, the so-called big fish he was talking about was just a group of customers he was serving alone, while the rest of the waiters scratched their butts. 2 days later, we were standing in front of a ship, with a man announcing that the Flaxen was about to set sail. Tiny arrived and asked if the ship was going to Karun, while the man asked to see identification. When Tiny took out the thing, it had an effect because it was a noble metal. However, in reality, it was the symbol of a fallen family. Some time ago, there was a noble family called Moors. They were accused of being demon followers and disappeared 40 years ago. The dark hair and eyes were the mark of their descendants, but since the family was not large, they could not rise again. Now Tiny is a descendant of one of the Moors who followed and had a child with an elf. Inside the ship, Tiny began to feel a strange magic. Something was wrong, as it wasn't just one demon, but several spread among the people on board. When the first one came at Tiny with a small knife, he simply twisted the guy's arm, who felt the pain down to his soul. The crew was astonished, asking what the boy was doing, but Tiny just tossed the little knife up using his foot, and midway through the ascent, he kicked it at the crazy guy. When the man went down, a strange energy began to pour out of him, with a very foul smell. According to the people there, this is what happens when a demon follower is killed. Then one of the crew members came to thank Tiny, but commented that what he did was kind of lame. However, in a tight mana situation, let's see what is lame. Right? Tiny just twisted the arm of the guy on the ground and threw another one along with it. Then he took the bodies of the others and used them as weapons, just like he did in his past life. The regular crew members of the ship started to run, screaming that there was a murderer on board, but in reality, all those Tiny was defeating were followers. He was actually saving the skin of those who were fleeing. The ship's captain arrived, asking what the hell was going on, and upon seeing this situation, he began to apologize as the confusion was caused by followers. Tiny then replied, "Oh, you are a great captain, and a fantastic actor." And without further ado, he smashed the captain's face, who was cut from the same cloth as the other demons. After all this chaos, a Baldy was reporting what had happened to King Emmond. The king realized that given how things were, the followers must have already sacrificed countless people. These sacrifices served to strengthen their power while also sending power to the demon they served. For this reason, the king referred to them as the worms of humanity. The king concluded by saying that they had been hiding for 30 years and he had let his guard down. But thanks to the elementalists, a great disaster was averted. Tiny asked if the king could see the spirit that could track the followers. At that moment, Tiny summoned the lunar wolf, and the king was impressed with this form because this way he could believe it was true. The king ordered the guards to leave as he wanted to speak privately with the boy. When everyone left, the king said that now they didn't need to worry anymore. He then asked if the fact that Tiny was a descendant of elves was a lie, as he wanted to know his true purpose. The king explained that after living a long time, one learns some things, as elves do not have dark hair. He also reassured Tiny, saying that this information would only be known to members of his family. Tiny apologized and revealed that he was hunting the followers because he was trying to prevent them from stealing stealing relics and causing more havoc in Karun. The king responded that Karun is a neutral country but still belongs to the Union of Kingdoms. He also mentioned that it is difficult to trust the Empire, which opposes the Union, and that Tiny probably hid his identity for that reason, even though he had good intentions. The king then affirmed that he could trust Tiny's words because he is a spiritualist with a pure soul. Since spiritualists and elementalists deal with the essence of mana and spirits, they are natural enemies of the cult and therefore are labeled as good people. However, Tiny remembered a spiritualist from his past life who was a complete bum. Then the king asked if he could ask a favor. He wanted to send Tiny to be a guard of the sanctuary. Since Tiny agreed, the king credited him for defeating the followers. But since the ceremony was urgent, he appointed Tiny as a knight, the protector of the sacred relics. Before leaving, Tiny said he still had something to discuss. He mentioned a man named Hustle who was involved in this case and wanted to know if the king knew anything. From the king's expression, it seemed he had some information on the matter. The king even asked if Tiny was sure about this. Tiny replied that it was a fifth circle mage who said this before going kaboom. Hearing this, the king asked Tiny to leave, saying he still needed to think a bit about the matter. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the sea, we see a mage kneeling, cursing a bum because the person keeping him imprisoned is Hustle. The next day, Tiny introduced himself to the knights. Everyone already knew that he had dealt with the worshippers. One knight made such a bizarre introduction of Tiny that no one understood anything, mentioning stories of knights who still hadn't left their diapers and things like that. Tiny even remembered asking the king if everything was alright and if there would be no opposition. The king had said not to worry as the Karun army had guarded the relic for hundreds of years. However, guarding a relic that serves only as a symbol seems like a tedious task, meaning it is a job for a bunch of failed individuals without a future. And even if there is external resistance, here within the unit, the story is different. So he called over the Baldy who was next to him. Annoyed, he said that in that unit, there's a hierarchy. However, in this hierarchy, who ends up scaring everyone is the big wolf, but Tiny knows nothing about that. If it's about burning a worshipper, he will surely do it. Besides, the others are also ready to take responsibility. Just by seeing Tiny like that, the unit went silent, complete with salutes. At that moment, someone arrived asking if Tiny was the elementalists who defeated the worshippers. This someone was the sanctuary guard, Captain Truman. Tiny responded, saying that it was an honor to meet him while taking a closer look and realizing that the old man was just a specialist. Truman then said he had heard about why Tiny volunteered and asked if he was interested in divine artifacts. Tiny, already preparing to pull out his club, thought that the old man was part of the worshippers. However, since he was genuinely interested, he ended up being taken to the library because he had spoken with the right person. As Truman explained everything, Tiny realized that there were people who said that divine artifacts were nothing but symbols, whose purpose was to repel evil creatures, functioning within a 1-kilometer radius. Not to mention that they hardly managed to block demonic energy above level 1. However, the more you study, the more you realize they are something beyond that. Truman then recommended several books for Tiny to learn about the relics. Reflecting, Tiny thought he almost hammered the wrong nail, as he initially believed Truman was a worshipper. After listening to the old man speak for a long time, Truman invited Tiny to follow him, saying he would see a divine artifact in person. Inside the castle, Truman asked Tiny if he knew why the sanctuary guards were considered useless. Tiny responded, asking if it was because they were guarding a worthless object, but Truman said the reason was even simpler. He then showed the divine artifact Humanitas. There are some legends about it that say the unworthy cannot touch it. Truman suggested that Tiny touch the artifact. At that moment, everything began to shine as the artifact was a mass of light that did not harm anything at all, and its power rejected everything that was not of this world. Meanwhile, Tiny began to hear something, and his body became enveloped in that energy. He asked the old man if the barrier was also an artifact. Truman, almost having a panic attack, was surprised because Tiny was communicating with the artifact. After that, Truman commented that the boy had a talent for surprising people. Even though he had been there for years, he had never seen anything like it. Tiny noticed that although Truman was not strong, he was a good person who loved his job, very different from the other members of the unit. However, up ahead, the knight Greg Simbo appeared. Truman asked what he was doing there, but Greg, completely rude, replied that he did not come for Truman, but rather for the so-called holy half-elf. He charged in all crazy, saying he would unmask Tiny. As Tiny expected something like that, he dodged, grabbed the knight's arm, and wham! The knight face planted on the ground. Even after taking a hit like that, the guy continued cursing Tiny. So Tiny replied, "Oh, is that how it is? Let's play a bit more." And there went the knight's spine, breaking all over the place. The old man was astonished by such strength, while the madman up top thought this was interesting. Soon after, another knight introduced himself. It was Robert from the Order of Imperial Knights, and he came to confront Tiny, wanting to know if Tiny was really strong. But slap in the face and goodbye. Then came Tan and Edgar, and each of them was shaken up in the arena. Then a blonde boy appeared, the commander of the Order of Knights. He fought with an axe but was thrown far away, with Tiny saying, "At least you are someone useful." After the fight, Tiny did the commander a favor and asked if he knew a guy named Hustle. In the end, none of the knights he asked knew anyone named Hustle. Just then, another person arrived, saying that it was impressive. Just by looking at the crazy guy, Tiny realized that he might be a beginner challenger. This was Leon von Peterson, the Grand Master of the Imperial Knights. He came to invite Tiny for a duel, saying he wanted to end the boredom and share some information about Hustle. Tiny, thinking about this, got all excited because only an idiot would refuse such a proposal. As soon as the duel began, Tiny came in full force, hammering away. After a contest of strength, he went to the ground and tried to trip Leon. But it didn't work because the commander had the stone attribute. The commander from above commented that the kid was really fun. With that, Tiny backed off, surprised by the defensive skill of the challenger class. Lion then said he would go back on his promise to take it easy and charge at Tiny, competing in strength. The two crossed weapons and Tiny advanced, thinking that his opponent's skill was very good and he himself needed to pick up a tip from that guy. Leon, defending everything, said that Tiny was not just a genius but a monster in combat. He managed to hit Tiny in the arm, but the commander stomped the ground, messing up Tiny's balance and sending him flying. This battle is already good, said Lion. Since it was a fun fight, Lion decided to give Tiny the information he promised. He spoke about a man named Lippman who belonged to the Order of Knights but only took orders from the king. Even though they wandered through various places, Lippman might know this Hustle guy. Just then, a guard came running because the king was urgently calling for Tiny. In the hall, the king announced, "This is the man you were looking for, a specialist from the eastern route, Sir Lippman." It was the same guy Lion had mentioned to Tiny just 2 seconds ago. Lippman then greeted Tiny, asking if he was looking for him. Tiny, trying to disguise his surprise, replied that he wanted to visit the east one day, but the king interrupted and said not to leave immediately, as he must keep his promise. Tiny took a look at Lippman and his mana seemed clean. However, the wolf became restless, so Tiny looked again and noticed something different, like a beast in human form. He remembered what the redhead had said, that Hustle seemed like the name of an orc or giant, and believed there must be some connection. The king then ordered Lippman to help Tiny eradicate the worshippers. Lippman mentioned that he had Sir Gale's mission, but the king authorized him to cancel it, stating that eliminating the threats was the priority. With no options left, Lippman reluctantly accepted the order. When night fell, Tiny went to talk to the king. He mentioned that Lippman didn't seem to be a follower, but it was still important to keep an eye on him for a while. The reason Tiny hadn't mentioned this earlier was because of the mana oath they had taken, an oath that created a discharge of lightning. Knowing this, Tiny asked why the king was suspicious, as Lippman seemed loyal for decades. The king explained that the blood of Karun, upon reaching a certain age, begins to have a strange foresight, a dream in which the relic disappears and demons destroy the capital. While he had that dream, Tiny appeared out of nowhere, saying that the relic could disappear. At that moment, Tiny felt something strange. Lippman had left the palace. Tiny ran after him along with his lunar wolf, trying to understand why. If it's what he's thinking, he just needs to gather the evidence. At the docks, where the vagabonds were loading boxes onto the ship, Lippman arrived. Everyone greeted him as Lord Hustle. They had expected him to arrive the next day, but there was a setback. The king had sent a boy after him. Hustle told the guys to shut up and get ready to leave. But at that moment, their boat exploded with Tiny on top, asking what those worshippers were up to. He then jumped down, attacking everyone. Hustle commented that Tiny could be a follower of God and should already be exhausted after all that movement. He ordered his men to attack, believing that Tiny was out of mana. Seeing this, Hustle himself charged at Tiny. Tiny dodged, throwing Hustle's sword arm away, but Hustle drew another sword that was strapped to his waist. He defended with just the strength of his hand while shouting for the lunar wolf to attack Hustle from behind. It worked because he made a deep cut in Hustle's waist. The guy, furious, said he would shatter Tiny and came at our wolf with both swords. However, he managed to return close to Tiny because, to minimize mana consumption, he only recovered the wounded part, and for that reason, Hustle must finish him off today. The men charged at Tiny, but he hammered everyone down. Since it was time to fight the lunatic beastman, the scene then showed the castle before Tiny left. The king had commented that Lippman was a man full of stories because the wolf beasts inherited powers from terrestrial animals. But sometimes, mutants are born. However, the wolf beasts kill the child immediately. Once, the king encountered a mutant who somehow survived and hid his identity. Since he needed the ability, he swore by his mana to keep the identity a secret. Therefore, if that man is an enemy, never fight near the ocean because he himself controls the water, as this guy is a mutation of a killer whale. The guy came attacking with water on his sword, and Tiny dodged since his aura weapon was getting stronger with the water. But Tiny didn't give up and charged in with the wolf, competing in strength. As the battle dragged on, reinforcements must be arriving. Then Hustle jumped out of the water, transforming, saying he would postpone Tiny's death. The vagabond began to flee across the ocean. The wolf showed a skill to waft through the skies, but Tiny still couldn't do that, until they reached a cave, saying that the wizard tsunami was perfect this time, while the old bearded man cursed him. Then Hustle was throwing some punches while wondering what this monster was going to do. He knew that if they let him go, this precious one would send a telepathic message to his mother, and if they killed Mommy, she would know immediately. Then it would just be a matter of time until Karun was destroyed. So if he wanted to save his hometown, he needed to put in more effort. The guy said he was going to receive divine punishment, but Hustle, furious, replied that he had already received that, and this would only be a settling of scores. And as they left, the old man kept saying he wouldn't let that lunatic's wish come true. Returning to the palace, the report was confirmed. All the sailors were worshippers, and the cargo contained things used for magical rituals. The total value would be something like half of the kingdom's provisions for a year. The king was already regretting it because Hustle had said he would show how the mutants could also contribute to the world. In the end, he asked Tiny how they lost Hustle, and if he had any other method to find the followers. Tiny then suggested that if His Majesty could help with something, it would surely work. The next day, Hustle appeared to talk to a redhead. He then started recounting everything that happened about the worshippers, which was hard even for him to identify since he didn't possess any demonic energy. He was just someone working with the worshippers. He was surprised that Tiny charged in immediately, as he had long wanted to show the potential of the Black Wings. Then Tiny, smiling, asked if he still had another chance because His Majesty ordered him to collect all the remaining artifacts. So if he truly was part of the Black Wings, he must have at least one specialist in magic tracking. While Tiny was there, he asked, "Where's the wizard? Where's the wizard?" He said that, unfortunately, that would be very difficult as they had tried before, but those guys were so cautious that they got rid of all evidence. Therefore, our young Tiny's work was in vain. But still, that wasn't entirely true, as he had brought many of them, and this wasn't a quantity without reason, because ordering such a quantity could only mean they were going to a ceremony, and if Corone was to be burned at once, they would be picky about the magical items but with different ingredients. At least 3 and at most 10 ingredients are needed to make a single ritual. However, getting that quantity takes a good amount of time. If there's a store in Corone that sells all of this at once, they would clearly go to that place. Then the guy from the back came bringing food because the redhead wanted him to try the restaurant's most popular dish, roasted chicken with vegetables. Tiny wanted to peel it off to focus on the mission, but after the first bite, he had to eat it all as it was so delicious. And now they were going to start hunting these demons. 2 months later, a hooded figure was asking another if that place was safe. And based on the boss's history, he probably did this for money, and they should use their time wisely. Then, when they entered, who was the owner? A redhead in disguise. Then the hooded figure started asking for everything on this list. Seeing this happen, the 2 months of hard work were paying off, while the guys were whispering, questioning whether it would be safe, because the first elder told them to take care of this until a guy appeared saying it was a very interesting story. It was the elder of the Caboclos himself who came to give them a talking to for failing. He tried to say he checked the identity, but he was charred in front of everyone. The elder arrived saying he was a bit intrigued because the chronological order was a big coincidence. Then he used an unknown magic on the redhead. After a while, Tiny found him passed out in the shop asking what happened. In fact, he was lucky because the elder saw that he hadn't used any trace of mana. So his suspicions about him being an infiltrator were already gone, and he was handing over the money while saying he was paying enough for him to bring some things. If he dared to speak about what happened, he was screwed. And since he didn't have mana, that was a luck that only. Then Tiny, seeing that he left traces of the attack, thought about calling in a magic tracking specialist. But before that, the redhead would like to check one thing because this was more dangerous than he thought, since he had the same feeling as when he was trained by the Duke, the aura of a superhuman. And maybe this guy was on the same level as a 7th circle wizard. But no matter how dangerous that was, our Tiny was going to make it work. And with that, the redhead said he trusted him. Then a month later, Tiny monitored the movements of the worshippers. In a few days on a nearby island, they would hold a grand ritual, and so they were going to invade the scene along with the Black Wings. Since he transmitted this information to the royal family, the king would also send reinforcements. Then, our smiling grandpa appeared chatting with Tiny. Finally, a few days later, the predicted day for the operation arrived. A group of knights descended saying that the main members were absent, and therefore they couldn't miss the opportunity because that night they were going to steal the relic. But for everyone's bad luck, Tiny was waiting for them down below since by their behavior it was pretty obvious what was going to happen. He's only surprised because he didn't expect the Grandmaster Truman to be there, and he tells them to explain themselves. Then the rude crowd responds, saying he's just an outsider who knows nothing about the captain to be speaking like that. After all, the captain trained numerous royal knights. He was the one who reformed the kingdom's order of knights but ended up with the sole and miserable job of guarding a relic that's useless. Tiny asks if he was a member of the order. Back then, Truman says he realized his limits early on, as one of his companions was an unparalleled genius. After coming to terms with his situation, he sought merits through relentless training. And what did he gain after all that hard work? A barony without land and only a transfer notice. Totally unfair. The current king did nothing about it, and back then Sir Littman was the only one who extended a hand to him. Littman, who had also been neglected due to his origin, showed Truman a new life goal, a world that valued knowledge, not just individual strength, and that became their dream, to create a new kingdom. Tiny, in disbelief, asks how, seeing that this only makes Truman an accomplice to the worshippers. But as it's too late to turn back, Truman orders his men to attack. To be honest, that's better for Tiny. He immediately jumps in, roughing up the 4 of them because he's ready for this. Seeing this, Truman grows furious as all his men lie defeated on the ground. Truman then grabs something from a bag and hurls it at Tiny, who bats it away. But from within, the slime begins to ooze out and transforms. First, an arm stretches out, then seconds later, an enormous creature emerges, roaring. Truman, meanwhile, is in shock because he thought it was a divine artifact. The creature grabs him and starts squeezing from above. Watching this, Tiny jumps in, landing a solid stamp on the creature's arm to pry it off. Truman asks why, but Tiny demands to know where he got that. that. Truman says he actually received it from Lippman, the very one who got him into this mess and told him to use it in a risky situation. But while Tiny is talking, the beast is attempting to absorb itself into the sacred barrier. So Tiny tells Truman to stay put because they still have a lot to discuss. Tiny then charges forward, landing a punch that sends the creature's stomach flying. He hammers again, but the creature tries to rush towards the artifact. Then, on a small island, they spot the worshippers as it seems the ritual is also being carried out on other islands. The red-haired knight says it's a large-scale concealment spell. Unsure of its purpose, he scatters some powder over the magic circle. Since they're using a concealment spell, their true goal must be Karun. That's why Tiny is in danger. Back to Tiny, he sprints at top speed, knocking the creature down at the last minute. He then lands a crushing blow on its head. But even so, the beast still gets up, screaming. He jumps in again, landing a powerful punch, breaking the creature's face once and for all, thinking that he didn't know a creature like that could move within the sacred barrier. That's why the worshippers must be using higher class magic than he imagined. But as he pauses to look, he realizes Truman has disappeared. Tiny and his wolf follow the blood trail, and somehow, despite his wounds, Truman managed to walk quite a bit. Now he's in the city's sewers, where he faces a door shrouded in magic. Truman approaches but ends up sitting on the ground, realizing that creature was a monster and doubting if he or Tiny could have defeated it. He sits there, questioning if this was really what he wanted. He sacrificed his subordinates for an absurd dream. Even the sacred relic had brought him comfort, so perhaps this really is the end. At that moment, Tiny arrives, thanking Truman for still being awake. Truman is shocked to see him there. Is he reacting this way because he's alive or because Tiny found the secret passage he hidden with magic? No one would think he'd create such a place beneath the capital. He just laughs, saying this truly is the end, but not quite, as there's still an interrogation to come. Tiny asks what they plan to do, and the only thing he knows is to remember Sock. And as soon as he said that, Truman ended up going down. Tiny thinks that if it weren't for those choices, Truman might have had a different end. Just then, the wolf alerts him that there's a strong mana coming from behind that door. When Tiny kicks it open, he finds the mage of the waves who has also fallen. As he turns to the side, he sees a kraken hatchling. Apparently, it's also dead. But at that moment, he starts to see things. The memories start entering his mind through the remaining magic of the mage of the waves, who was trying to protect Karin even after his death. Then from above, he senses a dark energy approaching, and this much energy must mean it's a glutton-level creature. He has to hurry and check the two spells. He begins channeling his mana into the first spell, which stops working. But from within, a light echoes into the sky. The king sees this from the castle, astonished, as this was the symbol of Gale in the sky, revealing news of the kraken, leaving the king terrified because his dream is now set to come true. Just then, the king's son arrives, saying they have a problem. A massive tsunami is heading toward the city, so they need to sound the maximum alert. While the king thinks that if it really is the kraken, not even the power of the relic will be able to stop it, he wonders if this might truly be end of Karun. But just then, Tiny arrives, asking if he's already given up. The chubby one tries to say that Tiny has no permission, but the man he's carrying is the mage of the waves, who fought until the end to protect Karun. And since he's dead, the last pillar that protected Karun has been destroyed. But they still have hope because he left something, the shield that will save Karun. The king's son asks, is that serious? While the king himself says that even if the mage had a plan, this would be the end of Karun. He explains that this sacred relic, while able to contain ordinary monsters, could not stop a creature of high-ranking demonic power like the kraken. The son insists, saying that the kraken is just a myth, and questions if the king really believes that tsunami is happening because of it. Tiny in the background intervenes. No, your majesty, the sacred relic will work. To understand this, we must remember the promise of the mythological era. He explains that according to the sage, the sacred relics are a treasure of humanity, passed down from generation to generation. Since ancient times, the kraken, a divine creation of the gods, would be under the relic's effect, unable to break through the sacred barrier. The king thoughtfully agrees that makes sense. Since the kraken is different from other monsters, it might actually work. Then he orders all the people to gather inside the palace immediately and asks to call all the mages who might help contain the tsunami. The son questions, "Father, can so many people fit in here?" But the king insists that, if necessary, they should pack the palace, and if there's no more room, they should take the people to the ships. Thus, the servants run to do whatever they can. The imperial family arranges the necessary resources to evacuate everyone, leaving no one behind. At that moment, an alarmed knight arrives with bad news. All the ships at the port have been destroyed. Down at the port, there are two mages who are likely responsible for the destruction of the ships. They're blocking all exits from Karun. One of the mages asks the other about the invisibility magic circle and mentions that a knight approached the barrier, after which they lost contact with the rest of their companions. One of the mages, visibly annoyed, realizes that the imperial family is beginning to suspect something and orders all possible reinforcements sent to buy time. He smiles, saying that facing a challenger within the sacred barrier might be difficult even for him, but that, as a knight of the barrier, he would have an advantage. In another scene, a gathering of hooded figures discusses the final plan. They intend that, amid the chaos, all the residents will flee without a chance to escape the massive tsunami. The Imperial mages had used up all their power trying to contain the disaster. Meanwhile, they plan to use the disaster to destroy the Imperial family's bloodline and cut off the power of the sacred relic, bringing destruction to Cloon. Much time has passed, their leader says, and finally, we are here to spread the name of Malum across the world. 2 days later, Tin, noticing that people looked exhausted, spoke with the king, who also appeared worn out. Tin suggested he take a rest, but at that moment, he felt a sharp pain in his head and fell to the ground. A familiar energy filled the atmosphere. "Look, Mom, the water's rising," said a child, pointing. The seawater was rising, revealing a monstrous limb emerging toward the city of Cloon. The Kraken, ruler of the depths, the one with the power to decide Cloon's fate, had finally appeared. People fled in panic as the Kraken destroyed everything around. Knights and mages murmured in disbelief that the myth of the Kraken was indeed true. At this moment, Tin approached for the large sack on his back and called for the king. This was the great legacy of the Mage of the Waves. Determined, Tin called for the lunar wolf and began leaping through the skies, promising to take care of the problem. The king then remembered the words of the Mage of the Waves, who in his final moments had apologized, wishing this humble gift could be a testament to his devotion to the country, hoping it would save Cloon. Now we see Tin soaring through the sky with the Kraken hatchling on his back. He thought, we need to use this to stop the massive beast heading our way. Tin rushed forward with the lunar wolf, realizing he was still too far and wondered if there was a way to approach the monster. He then remembered the lunar wolf's leap capable of crossing the sky and felt a surge of energy. It was time to use the third stage of the spirit tamer, the power bond. Tin and his wolf advanced, leaping through the air, feeling an incredible sensation as they neared the monster. As they got closer, the Kraken let out an ear-splitting roar, forcing Tin and the lunar wolf to cover their ears. Even so, they continued dodging the creature's colossal limbs. Tin wondered if the Kraken thought he had defeated its offspring. He kept speeding up faster and faster, recalling the words of the Mage of the Waves. The Kraken, though less intelligent than the legend suggests, should be able to recognize who had attacked its young. Tin then pulled the hatchling from his back and hurled it toward the Kraken's head, hoping it would work. For a moment, it seemed the monster had calmed down, but it quickly exuded an aura of rage and struck with its massive limb, hitting Tin and the lunar wolf. It lost their balance and began to fall, but amid the descent, a familiar voice told Tin to relax. Someone caught him in their arms, dodging the Kraken's limbs. Tin realized it was Master James in disguise who had come at the Emperor's command. After landing safely, Tin asked James about his mission, but James reassured him. The Emperor had sent him as backup, although he was in disguise. James was a young knight of Challenger rank, mastering 2 elements, wind and ice. With a silver aura, he demonstrated his strength and unique skill. James noted that the beast seemed to have calmed down suddenly and asked if Tin thought there was any reason for this. Tin then realized that the Kraken's last attack wasn't aimed at them, but rather at the cultists on the ground. The Mage of the Waves strategy was working. However, the Kraken soon let out a furious roar again. Tin was confused since there were no more cultists nearby, and he quickly asked James what had happened with the magic circle. James explained that it was a synchronized magic circle containing demonic energy. He and Surge had destroyed most of them. Tin then understood the cultist's true goal, the sacred relic. Focusing all his mana, he activated his hawk eyes and along with the lunar wolf began searching for the relic's location. He then saw 2 hooded figures heading toward the castle where the relic was kept. Tin and the lunar wolf immediately leaped, determined to protect the relic so the promise of the mythological era would remain intact. Meanwhile, the guards protecting the relic were on high alert. One of them commented on the noise coming from outside, but another assured him that the perimeter around the castle was secure and that if they protected this area, it would be enough. 2 hooded figures entered the castle and the guards immediately assumed defensive positions. The hooded figures commented that the effects of the concealment magic had been released due to the sacred relic's power. The relic began exuding an intense energy as if preparing to repel intruders. With that, they used magic against the guardian knights, launching those in front into the air. James, standing beside Tin, asked how much longer it would take to reach the relic. Tin replied that they were close, but at that moment, more cultists appeared, blocking the way. James went ahead, assuring he would handle this group. In a swift movement, he passed through the cultists, who startled were thrown aside by the impact. Tin watched in admiration as the speed and power of James, the Northern Wind Knight, were truly impressive. He kept running, wondering if the cultists would actually be able to touch the relic. Tin believed they shouldn't even be able to approach the barrier, but he had a suspicion. Maybe they weren't part of the cult, as he had seen a similar situation before, which made everything even more unsettling. Judging by the chaos they caused, his power could be just the the beginning of the worst-case scenario. At that moment, James told Tin to look up, and there was Lord Lion, descending and asking what had happened to everyone. At the same instant, a tail from the kraken swung in a direction. Tin saw a blue glow ahead and realized it was the cultists who had taken the sacred relic and its core. This was why the kraken attacked that location. The promise of the mythological era had been broken. James confirmed that this was certainly the worst possible scenario, as besides the kraken, 7 circled dark mages were now in front of them. The cultist leader laughed, saying that Tin and the others had returned faster than he expected, and that the combination of Morse descendants and 2 challenger-ranked knights was intriguing. He then began to exude his power, threatening to defeat everyone there at once. At that instant, a black bolt was launched at Tin, but James leaped to defend him with his sword, while Lion joined the defense. However, the attack was so powerful that they struggled to hold it back. Tin realized they wouldn't last long and would need to get the sacred relic no matter what. When he looked again, the relic had already disappeared as one of the cultists had grabbed it and fled. Without hesitation, Tin and his lunar wolf leaped in pursuit. The cultist leader, watching from a distance, said he wouldn't just stand by watching and prepared another attack. But at the same moment, James vanished and reappeared beside the dark mage, blocking the attack with his sword. The other cultists were impressed as James was directly challenging a 7th circle dark mage. Suddenly, James used his style, Valiant Sword, Song of the Frozen Blades, to cut through the dark mage's spell. He remembered an instruction from his master. For the sake of humanity, you must protect this boy. After the slash, he returned to the ground, facing the dark mage and taunting, "Your opponent is me, don't forget it." The dark mage laughed, saying they were wasting their lives by fighting him. Meanwhile, Tin raced through the sky with the lunar wolf, trying to catch up to the cultists with the relic. On the ground, the dark mage began to radiate his power, questioning if they were truly strong. He then launched new black bolts toward the 2 knights. James deflected them with his sword and then used a ground strike against the mage, but the villain laughed, calling the attempt futile and countering with a spell that nullified James' attack. While the dark mage laughed, a powerful energy emerged behind him. James, with his sword imbued with cyclones, struck the dark mage, sending him flying. One of the knights watching the battle commented that he hadn't expected Tin to have such a powerful ally. The bald dark mage stood up again, realizing that James was using ice and wind, characteristic elements of the Knight of Valencia, and laughed upon discovering James' identity. The dark mage raised his hand and announced, "To thank you for coming, you will die by my hands." At that instant, a massive attack appeared in the sky, and as he lowered his hand, all that energy descended toward the ground. James realized he wouldn't be able to block the attack head-on and leaped to the side, dodging the surrounding explosion. Before the dark mage could attack again, he felt an energy behind him. One of the kraken's tentacles struck his head, throwing him far away. Meanwhile, Tin continued his pursuit of the cultist, shouting, "Damn you, I'll catch you." He then saw the cultist leap into the sea. Tin looked down and realized he had jumped into the ocean, thinking if he jumped into the sea, Runcell must be down there. In the sea, the cultist taunted Tin, asking if he really wanted to fight in the ocean. Tin then prepared to jump, trusting in the lunar wolf and his nimble footing. Creating small whirlwinds, he challenged the cultist to a fight, promising to make that ocean the villain's grave. The cultist launched water tornadoes toward Tin, who broke them apart with the force of his hammer. Surprised, the cultist stared at Tin in astonishment. Now he truly found himself in trouble. He observed Tin from above, wondering how he had learned to do something like that. But there was no more time to think, as now it was his turn. Tin charged forward as the adversary prepared his 2 swords. Tin dodged the attacks, leaping through the sky from all sides until he reached the center of the water, where one of the strikes caused him to sink. Sensing the danger of continuing the fight there, the opponent transformed into a massive whale and dove underwater, taking the relic's core in his mouth to protect it. However, he hadn't anticipated Tin, who pursued him and quickly emerged with his hammer, striking and flinging him far away. Tin then took hold of the relic. Even so, Mr. Big Whale wasn't about to give up so easily. However, Tin wasn't willing to give him another chance. In an instant, he appeared above the whale's head, slamming down hard with his famed Thunder Strike. After defeating him, Tin remembered that he needed to stop the kraken, who was already destroying the city. He knew he wouldn't be able to return the relic to its place in time, and Karam was on the verge of ruin. So before the worst could happen, he decided to face the kraken. Tin saw the immense energy surrounding the kraken, which almost made his head explode from the pressure. He lifted the seal and begged the creature, "Beast of the ancestral era, please stop attacking the city. So many innocent lives are being destroyed because of this." The kraken responded coldly that it didn't matter, as its mission was to exterminate all evil in the world. Without the relic, he was not breaking the contract by eliminating some humans. Tin shouted that he couldn't do this and pleaded for him to stop. The kraken then gave him a searing look, asking if Tin really wanted to endure the pain of losing a child as he himself had. With immense rage, the kraken unleashed a devastating energy, and Tin felt both the fury and sorrow of the monster. Determined, Tin promised that he would find the true culprit behind the death of the offspring and pleaded with the kraken to believe him and halt the attack. The giant creature declared that with Tin's abilities, this would be impossible, but Tin shouted that he would make it happen no matter what. The kraken then gave a sign of approval, stating that he would lend Tin his power to ensure the mission's success. Back in the other battle, Knight Genis stood up, asking if he was alright. He commented that when the kraken's tentacle almost hit him, he thought his end was near. The other knight smiled, saying he had good news. They then looked ahead and saw that the cultist leader, the bald vagabond was trying to get up, muttering that those insects wouldn't give up. Enraged, he activated his maximum power, deciding to finish them off once and for all. The cultist spread his demonic energy across the area, declaring that he would burn them alive. But at the moment when he seemed unbeatable, the Kraken's tentacle came down again, smashing him into the ground. He was stunned, realizing that the Kraken had attacked him for the third time and that it couldn't be a coincidence. The monster was specifically targeting him. The knights realized that the Kraken was focusing its energy solely on the cultist. The dark mage himself didn't understand why he was suffering damage from his own demonic energy, until suddenly he exploded in a burst of light in the sky. This residual energy now in the air was harmless to the heroes, as the Kraken knew exactly who the true enemy was. Before exploding, the cultist attempted one last attack, and a monstrous tree with gigantic seeds appeared in the sky. The plan advanced toward the two knights, but passed them directly, showing that its true target was the dark mage's body. The monstrous tree quickly devoured him, while the knights watched, utterly confused. The creature turned, casting a menacing look at them. Sir Lion prepared to strike, and with a powerful blow, cut through the roots that threatened them. They fell to the ground, with Lion saying that they couldn't allow that thing to advance toward the castle, as it could seal everyone's fate. They ran to the castle, and upon opening the doors, were shocked at what they saw. All the knights inside the castle were in a state of confusion, unsure of what was happening, while at the top, a figure watched the scene. In the knights' minds, there was no other desire but to fight to their last breath. While the other stated that it was an order from the great man, he pounded his hand on the wood in frustration because his grand work had been ruined by those people. Nonetheless, he believed they could at least achieve one of the objectives they had in mind. The bald man then opened the door and ordered that they do whatever was necessary against the innocent soldiers so that no one would stand in his way. Everyone grew tense as Lord Lion stated that this was the place where the emperor was, and for that reason, he would summon all this power to protect the royal family in danger. The knights, like zombies, advanced to attack, and the captain still tried to ask Lion to go easy on his men. But immediately, Lion struck with such force that one knight was hurled against the wall, left badly injured. James, surprised, asked, "Lion, weren't you going to take it easy?" Lion explained that he used the blunt side of the sword so the knight would survive. Determined, Lion pressed on bravely, carving a path toward the emperor. James thought to himself, so that's what he calls going easy. Inside of the hall, the dark mage held one of the knights and flung him into the air. Even under attack, the knight shouted for his majesty to flee. However, the bald one, all smug, laughed, saying he should at least introduce himself to the precious royal family. The king, unwavering, confronted him, saying, "So was you behind all of this?" The villain, with disdain, confirmed, adding that as a reward for discovering his secret, he would end Kum's royal bloodline that very day. At that moment, a voice echoed, cutting through the air. "Before that, the one who will fall is you." It was Lord Genus who lunged at the villain. The bald one, smirking with disdain, said that attacks wouldn't work against him, but didn't know this Lion was right behind him. Then Lion struck a blow to the adversary's back, while telling the emperor that they would end this quickly. The bald one, still smiling, found the situation amusing, and without hesitation, lunged once more, saying that this would only add 2 more bodies to his list. He seemed invincible. He had been trampled, devoured by the monster plant, and now slashed across the back, yet continued to rise with a dark energy, proclaiming that he was the death of all. Lion was amazed at such strength. He looked back, realizing that even if he managed to dodge, the emperor and prince would not. So he raised the Valentia sword before him and declared that he would protect the royal family, no matter the cost. The two then faced the attack head-on. Lion recalled the past, when the emperor appointed him leader of the Imperial Knights Corps. Now on the ground, Lion regretted letting his guard down. He thought that if he were stronger, he could have won. But at that moment, the emperor appeared behind him, saying not to give up, for even he, who had made mistakes, had never given up. Lion tried to argue that the emperor shouldn't strain himself to recover him. On the other side of the room, James shouted not to forget about him, as it was thanks to him they were still there. He was indignant at the thought of being used as a shield, considering that he was there to help. With a smile, Liam promised to repay James for his help later, but first they needed to deal with that villain. Above them, the bald one began concentrating more energy in his hands, and James said they only had one chance. He would try to break the magic while Lion advanced. Determined, he announced Valentia fencing, Genus-style, second ability. He began launching several sword slashes and charged to face the dark mage's powerful attack. The background music brought a sense of madness, while the mage, cornered, thought it was impossible. His magic was breaking. At that moment, he noticed something else. Behind him, Lion advanced with his Cum Empire swordsmanship and unleashed the final skill, the Stone Thunder, throwing the villain against the wall. The prince looked over, asking if it was finally over, while the emperor collapsed to the ground. Genus, watching from afar, murmured a curse, realizing that all they had done was expel the mage from that body, but obviously the mage had escaped. The bald Zarado tried to flee, leaping through the air, relying on his magic, like he made a mistake. Tin was flying right there, ready to intercept him. In his memory, Tin recalled the power of the relic, which formed a cube around the mage, capable of containing part of his magic. The villain, irritated, raised one of his hands, the only one remaining, and declared that it meant nothing to him. Tin just laughed as the lunar wolf leaped before him. The mage was terrified to see Tin advancing toward him, wielding the Iron God's armor. At that moment, Tin jumped off the lunar wolf and with his iron body descended with full force to crush the mage's head. The enemy's magic was shattered and Tin went straight on the offensive. The lunar wolf mounted Tin again and launched itself at the villain, landing a blow right to his stomach, making him spit blood. Tin thought he was weaker than the last time, but soon noticed a strange magic being conjured by the mage. The villain spoke mercilessly. "This time, I'm going to make you burn in the most painful way possible." In anger, he unleashed his first spell against Tin, who realized his defenses wouldn't hold up. He drew the relic and began to concentrate his power, ready to use the anomaly that the relic had taught him. Even amidst the attack, he shouted, focusing on the relic's power. Above him, the villain laughed, thinking he had won since his spell had struck Tin. But to his surprise, the relic was still intact, compressing the barrier around Tin and the lunar wolf. The villain mocked, "You're just a specialist." Tin, however, saw an opening and advanced with his hammer, striking the villain directly in the ribs. He jumped away, observing whether the attack had worked. However, the bald one grabbed Tin's arm with a look of hatred, but Tin was smiling. That was because the Kraken was coming to help. The villain tried to flee into the air, but Tin grabbed his leg and said, "Where do you think you're going, you scoundrel?" Right after, the Kraken landed another blow, smashing the villain into the ground. It seemed they had finally won. Tin was falling, exhausted and without mana to summon the lunar wolf, but luckily, the Kraken caught him with one of its tentacles. From above, the Kraken thanked Tin for helping him ease his resentment, and Tin smiled, feeling relieved that in the end, everything had worked out. The Kingdom of Come announced the incident, informing that the realm had been in danger due to the invasion of the worshippers. The young hero, Tin, was recognized for crushing the demon worshippers and returning the Kraken to the ocean. In gratitude, the king awarded him the title of Knight of the Radiant. 3 months later, Genis noticed that Tin seemed like a completely different person. Tin was stronger, almost unrecognizable, and Genis, surprised, commented that the juice really worked. Tin had grown so much in just 3 months. In truth, this was the result of his secret technique, fully focused on training. Even so, it was impressive how powerful he had become. As they walked, Genis remarked that the training grounds were quiet, but soon remembered that the coronation was approaching a grand occasion. So they both made their way to the ceremony, noting how the place had been completely restored after everything they had been through. Tiny even questioned whether he was sure he was ready to take a walk, since he had been injured quite a lot during the last battle. Though he had suffered from the rebound's after effects, he said he was fully healed and didn't need to lie down any longer. He recalled somewhat resentfully how Nightland had used him as a shield. Genis took the opportunity to ask one more thing. Tiny had drawn power from a sacred object using the body of a specialist class, and by doing so ended up fighting someone of a much higher class. For this reason, he might have pushed his body to the limit. Tiny confessed that it felt as though his will and his movements were somewhat out of sync. Genis remarked that this was a side effect and suggested that he should rest. However, Tiny laughed, insisting that he was fully recovered, which left Genis impressed, thinking it would have been a serious injury. In truth, Tiny managed to get something back. He learned to use the power of the soul during the healing process as he filled the void with his own soul in the absence of mana. By coincidence, he acquired this power that reacts to mana but follows entirely different principles. This minimized the side effect of the fight and above all, without spending mana. He was excited to discover such power, feeling that he had done well not to give up in that battle. This new power made the legend of the Aura Master who controls his own soul a reality. Relieved, Genis commented that it was great that he was well in hand in the letter, wanting to know his decision on the next destination. The Emperor wished to send them immediately to 11, but Genis wanted to visit the imperial capital and participate in the Valentia celebration. He asked Tiny what he would do. At that moment, news arrived of the second imminent disaster, the imperial family wedding. Tiny thought that 11 was just an excuse from the Sword Emperor to get them away, since he knew that Genis might not survive the wedding. The Emperor preferred to keep him far. However, Tiny reflected that going to 11 wasn't a bad idea since the third disaster would arise there, and it would also be where he would meet Esna. But before making any decision, Tiny felt grateful to Chloe, his savior and part of his family, who helped him so much. He knew that in the past, not even Genis could prevent disaster at the wedding, so he doubted that the event could go smoothly without them present. So he accepted the proposal and said they should head to the city. During the conversation, they remarked that the city's reconstruction was going well. Following the suggestion of the Radiant Knight, warnings were issued about the sacred object and the worshippers. It was a good time to wish safety and prosperity to Karam. Then the coronation ceremony for Prince Henry began. He knelt before his father, who declared how trustworthy he was. Lion appeared in the background, relieving the Emperor and apologizing to Gas for what had happened last time. Gas dismissed him with a "Get out of here, you miserable wretch," and asked Tiny if everything was going well. At that moment, Tiny heard a strange voice questioning why the Northern Wind Lion was called the seventh deity, something he had never heard before, not even in his past life. Lion commented that people talked a lot about it, while Tiny wondered if there were other talented individuals besides him and Genis in that world. At the ceremony, the king finally passed the crown to his son, who expressed gratitude, saying he felt honored despite the weight of responsibility. He took the opportunity to thank the Radiant Knight, the Great Tiny. Tiny, for his part, thought he had already been rewarded by gaining the right to use a sacred object, and with humility, he bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I have already been rewarded." For the royal family, however, this was still not enough. They then decided to bring a special special item. The knights appeared carrying the artifact, while the new king explained that although Tiny's body had grown rapidly and an ordinary suit of armor was no longer as useful, this gift would be even more valuable. It was the mana necklace, an artifact used by the legendary traveler king of Karam. Tiny was surprised and asked if they were truly giving it to him. The new king explained that actually he would have liked to give him the transcendent armor, but it was considered a national treasure. Still, the mana necklace was extremely powerful, with 6 circle magic embedded within it. Tiny was impressed as he knew this kind of gift was an extraordinary gesture, given that a 7th circle armor would grant him superhuman strength. These treasures are so valuable that even the continent's 10 knights have rarely had the chance to use them, except for the Master of Arms, who is a special case. The former emperor reassured Tiny, telling him that even if he used up all the mana in the necklace, it would recover in a day. Tiny then bowed and accepted the honor as the king placed the necklace around his neck, asking him to always remember them and that Karam would always remember and cheer for him. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, shouting, "Go Radiant Knight." Later in the city, Genis commented on the local people's generosity, while Tiny suggested that Genis should keep the necklace. Genis was astonished, saying it was an over-the-top gift, but Tiny insisted he hold onto the necklace until Tiny was truly ready to use it. Genis was pleased, realizing that Tiny wanted him to stay strong to accompany him to the place where he had died in his past life. Tiny intended to do everything the opposite way of what the Sword Emperor wanted. During the journey, Little White Hair asked if they would need to take a boat at the coast, but Tiny replied no and summoned his lunar wolf to save time and money. As they mounted the wolf, Genis was terrified, preferring to swim rather than continue the trick like that. Tiny reminded him that the Northern Wolf Master didn't mind riding the wolf, but it was true agony for others. Soon, Genis was almost sick with fear as the wolf sped through the skies until Tiny nudged him aside, avoiding a small disaster. After some time, they arrived in a small town. The townspeople looked at the two of them strangely as they lay on the ground nearly breathless. Genis complained, feeling like he almost died, and suggested that next time it might be better to rent a horse. That's when Tiny asked what was wrong and Genis realized his wallet was missing. Upon searching, they found that both his wallet and Tiny's had fallen into the water during the flight. Genis apologized, blaming himself for what happened, but Tiny replied calmly that they could always earn more money. The young man didn't understand, but Tiny explained that in the city, there were always money bags around for situations like that. Soon, the two of them disappeared into the city's alleys where screams could be heard. Later that night, they were outside the city. Tin was riding his wolf, commenting that the crazies they took money from had well-filled pockets, and now they would have provisions for a while. Genis joked, saying that if Tin continued with this behavior, his title of Radiant Knight could be tarnished. Tin responded without hesitation, criticizing bureaucracy and emphasizing that the important thing was to keep moving forward. As they rode, Tin thought that Genis was a bit too straight-laced yet also an incredible person, with talent that would make him 3 times faster than an average knight. He felt more and more certain that bringing Genis along with him was the right decision. At that moment, Tiny said, "Got you," and along with his wolf, leaped into the air, laughing at the situation. On the other side, he turned to Genis and asked, "Mr. Genis, I want to know something before the ceremony. Do you know anything about the second prince?" Genis replied, "About the second prince? His reputation is good. I've heard he is close to the heir apparent." This intrigued Tiny, as rumors in his past life claimed that the second prince had staged a coup and both had died together. He wondered what was happening with the imperial family. In the next scene, a castle atop a hill appeared, with something resembling a dragon above it. Inside, a child was in his mother's arms, who was saying that the hair prince was almost awake, telling him, "Sleep well, my son." She then asked the man behind her if the plan had not yet worked. This person was the second queen, Kartia. The man in the crystal ball replied that he couldn't provide details, but assured her there was no need to worry about the results. They were the same masked figures who had appeared earlier in the story. Queen Kartia commented on the failure in Karam, saying it had been a disaster. The man tried to justify himself, but she looked at him threateningly, reminding him that they had planned this for years and had spent 3 months preparing every detail before executing it. Now, hearing that the plan had failed made her doubt whether she should still trust them. The masked man smiled, responding that although she couldn't fully trust them, the agreement had already been made, and breaking it now would not be possible. He insinuated that she wanted to eliminate all rival lineages in Aslan. Kartia was surprised and asked if he was sure they could achieve the desired results. The masked man confirmed, while the little prince woke up and called for his mother. She mentioned that he would have a lesson, but he said, "Mother, I can't go. I'm only half real. I don't have golden eyes." She then comforted him, telling him not to say things that would sadden her, and that she hoped he would continue to grow well as he had been. Excited, the boy replied, "Mother, when I grow up and get as big as my brothers, I will carry you on my back and run through the palace." The queen smiled, saying, "Wow, my son, how confident you are. I believe in you." Meanwhile, the men by the crystal ball were talking. One of them remarked that the queen had finally understood something but called her very foolish. Another asked if there was no way to avoid this. Even with preparation, the first elder was gravely injured and recovered, recovering, and they had lost other resources as well. One of the masked figures was furious, blaming Morse for all the problems. One asked what Morse was doing at that moment, and another replied that he seemed to be heading to Asura. Another masked figure asked if that was where the grand project would take place. They concluded that it must be a coincidence, as he was apparently connected to Valencia. The central masked figure ordered everyone to be silent, and they obeyed, frightened, while he commanded them to continue monitoring Morse's movements but not to act just yet. The priority would be to focus on the grand project, which would be carried out using the blue fox. In another scene, someone delivered reports to the prince, who thanked the messenger for coming. This was the second prince of the family, Lot Van Aslan. He commented that it was time to work with a local intelligence group, something he used to do himself. The prince joked that it seemed a bit out of his profile to do such a thing, but he would certainly start talking about rules and ordering the people beneath him. His brother complained, to which Lot replied, okay, I'll stop. He then asked about the second queen and Tinel, as he had received recent news from them. The second prince commented that it seemed their mother had called the leader of the knights again. He was still the leader of the royal knights troop, and Lot noted that this couldn't continue, reinforcing the need to strengthen the authority of the knights to avoid further interference. He thought this might be due to the royal knights' disdain for politics, but then he remarked, "There's one more thing. Our mother still treats Tinel like a child, and he is already 14 years old." The prince stated he knew the reason Tinel acted like a child, which made the second prince curious, asking, "What do you mean?" The prince recalled an episode where once a child Tinel's age hit him with such a strong punch that he spun through the air several times. The second prince was shocked by this story and asked, "Hyung, how did you let such an arrogant little brat escape?" But he admitted it was his own fault and that the boy had his reasons. He then commented that the second prince had likely already heard rumors about him, the radiant knight who saved Karam. The second prince reflected, "Are you talking about the one who stopped the Kraken and defeated the worshippers? But isn't he only 14 years old?" Based on rumors, many thought he was a half-elf and already 20 years old. The prince responded that he didn't know about that, but when he met him, he was just a small, fragile child. He added that he would like to meet him again someday. The narrative now shifts to Eclipse's second mansion in the territory of Valencia, where the Sword Saint resided. Upon seeing Tiny, he exclaimed, "What have you been eating, boy? How did you grow so much?" Irritated, Tiny asked if he wasn't being a bit too mean. The saint laughed, but Tiny interrupted him, saying, "Is that all you have to say after so long without seeing me, you old man?" The saint lowered his head, praising Tiny for his progress. Surprised, Tiny wondered what was wrong with the old man, but soon the conversation turned serious. The saint mentioned that the most important thing now was the second disaster that was about to take place at the Imperial Palace, the Crown Prince's wedding. Rumors suggested that without the help of someone from within, no one would be able to interfere with the Imperial barrier, indicating that the second disaster might be connected to a traitor within the royal family. They then observed the Great Magic Barrier, an ancient relic connected to the outer walls of Arian, which filters out malevolent energy. But this barrier wasn't merely a defense. It had a magical effect that restricted everything outside of the royal family members, the royal knights, and the royal mages. Thus, without internal help, the second disaster could never happen. The Sword Saint commented that the only person they could trust now was the Elder Prince. If that were the case, then the culprit could also have been deceived by a worshipper. He explained that, in fact, His Majesty had already been chosen as the heir to the throne, so he was free from any accusations of wanting to eliminate the royal family. Besides, he was an ally of Valencia. Thus, if there were evidence, it could help identify the real culprit. Tiny began to reflect on who the culprit might be, since in his previous life, there were rumors that the second prince was the traitor. But the saint argued that it was probably not the second prince, as he was a person of principles with no ambition for the throne. Tiny recalled that Genis had also said something similar and asked if the saint knew of any other suspicious people within the palace. Bored by the lack of answers, the saint scoffed and asked, "So, what was the result of the second disaster, anyway?" Tiny replied that all direct members of the royal family had been exterminated, including the emperor's youngest son, an iron-blood mage. The saint concluded that the culprit had likely been deceived by the worshippers, being used as a pawn in a larger game without even realizing it. But the problem was that this would only be possible if the person were a bit dim-witted, not to realize they were being deceived. Then he made a comparison with Tin, which left him a bit irritated. He looked at him, annoyed, asking, "Did I say something wrong, you irresponsible brat?" Because he had definitely told him to go to Elven. He said, "Ah, sir, I couldn't go because I was too worried that if he messed up, half the empire would be turned upside down." The Sword Saint said it was better to stay on the safe side, but at that moment, someone shouted, "Your Excellency, we're in trouble." He asked if they had guests and said they didn't mean to make such a fuss. The man apologized and he said, "All right then, tell me what happened." Actually, the weapon master had asked His Excellency for training. It was then that he mentioned the only superhuman currently in the Kingdom Alliance. The weapon master Green Van Sheldon, the man who announced his strength to the world in the battle against the Kingdom and the Alliance for fighting countless times with the Sword Saint and keeping the Alliance united. Green Van Sheldon is the man who still fights against the Sword God, even after the end of the war. Their ranking had seemed clear since Green became an aura user 3 years ago. But then, the Sword God also became an aura user 2 years ago, and it was definitely at that time that the world was shaken. During training of the two superhumans, the Sword Saint crumpled a paper, saying that time had passed, but that guy still didn't know his place. He thought this was the time to see who was truly strong stronger. Tin asked why he didn't accept the challenge, but the old man wasn't interested in the slightest. He then suggested an idea. They could accept the challenge on one condition, as this could be useful for their plan. A week later at the Colosseum outside the capital, people looked up and commented, "The one with black hair is the Radiant Knight." Meanwhile, Janus commented on the number of people present and Tin confirmed, "It's a battle of superhumans." Janus even mentioned that the wedding was approaching, but the guys up top remarked that it was strange for the Emperor to have allowed this training. One of them mentioned that he had heard that a wound caused by aura doesn't even heal, and that could lead to a national loss. Another asked if the rumor was true, the rumor that the Emperor did not like the marriage. At that moment, Janus arrived, worried, and asked the master about his opinion on the Emperor's permission for the training. The Sword Saint replied, "Don't worry, he didn't give us this permission. I was actually planning to request it myself." Tin even thought about where the old man's excessive loyalty was coming from. Then someone announced, "The Crown Prince is here." Everyone was surprised as no one had expected that. He entered through the gates and people commented, so the rumor about having problems with Valencia was wrong. Tin thought that the Emperor surely didn't like Valencia and the Crown Prince must be aware of that. But judging by his reaction to come here, they could trust him. The Crown Prince greeted, "It's been a while, Duke," and while paying attention to something else, he hardly recognized Knight Tin. He asked if Tin was also there to watch the training, but actually Cadenho said that his fiancé wanted to see the puppy. Tin summoned the lunar wolf, thinking that with its mana sensitivity, it could somehow stay within the barriers. He asked, "Are you talking about this puppy?" And the prince replied, "Oh, don't worry, he's all healed up," petting it because they were all in the same boat. The old man said that he had already informed the Crown Prince that he should put his guards on alert against demon worshippers, just in case. "Be well prepared," he said, "because if something strange happens inside the palace, especially near Clo, you must be on guard." After that, the audience commented that the weather was getting cold, and the other old man arrived. The Sword Saint remarked that he was still the same old Grid. A barrier was placed around them as Tin and Janus sat down to watch the duel. Grid said, "Ah, it seems you finally overcome that Asgar." But Asgar replied, saying that he was the only one causing a ruckus at a festival of a foreign nation, so his words had no value. Grid became furious at the accusation and retorted, "That's why you're so annoying." And thus the argument between the old men began to heat up. The rules were clear, and they could face each other in combat. As the Lord of Valencia had requested, the loser would have to follow the winner's request. Grid drew his sword, asking how it would end. He taunted, "Are you going to use his sword against me? That will be a pointless effort." But he had learned something after becoming an aura user and was ready to teach the old man a few lessons. At that moment, the Sword Saint attacked with his powerful sword, crossing blows. Grid crouched to defend while the old man asked, "You call that fencing, you crazy?" and threw him aside. He said he would show the true handling of the sword. Grid advanced furiously, and the old man watched him, surprised. At the same time, he drew his sword and dodged to the side. He thought he could evade the destructive force of the aura with basic tricks used by beginners. And then the old man came down hard on the shield, throwing Grid into the air. He was up there and said, "Ah, you showed a good move just now, but I'll show you mine," and came down with his sword ablaze. But the old man from above said that was useless and aimed a bow at the Sword Saint's face. Then he fired an arrow, knocking him to the ground. Grid took the hit but held firm, while the old man said, "That's not Asgard because the skill he's using now shoots several arrows at once towards the Duke." In the midst of the chaos, Grid remarked that it was a good attempt, but ice arrows were useless against him. However, when the arrows rained down on him, he realized something different happened as they began to explode. Grid said he had let his guard down because his vision wasn't so simple. Then he took his sword, thrust it into the ground, and began to channel an immense red aura. Grid was coming toward him asking, "What is that?" Then he stopped on the ground while Tin looked on with a smile. The audience didn't understand what had just happened, but the Sword Saint said, "Didn't you say you would teach me a lesson in swordplay? Is this what you call fencing?" The old Grid laughed, saying, "All right, I can't defeat you with just one sword. But now it's time for the old men to start the second round, as they're going to fight until one of them can't get back up." He took off flying, releasing his auras into the air. The old man said, "What's the point of talking all that nonsense about being noble if you're the only one acting like a berserker here?" The aura explosions spread across the arena. The mages were struggling to maintain the barrier to prevent this from reaching the spectators, as this fight was intense, considering these two were superhumans in this world. Janus said it was an intense battle, and he was slowly understanding what was happening. Tin asked who he thought would win. "Definitely your highness, but it's a slim chance. The time they both spent as aura users is different." At that moment, Grid pulled something else from his back because now they were going to finish it with his spear. Tin thought that normally the Sword Saint would lose. Janus asked what had happened, but he said this time would be different. The man charged at him with his spear, throwing those ice arrows, and the center of the sword was calm. He used energy blocking and was surprised by it. Then he pointed his spear at the sky and asked, "What do you think of this?" And then came a thunderous slicing attack toward Grid. The crowd was in despair because the shield was about to fall, and they wondered if there would be any casualties. Tin and Janus were there asking, "Your Highness, did something happen?" Even the guy presenting the tournament was saying, "And the winner is the Sword Saint Asgar." And the crowd shouted, "The Lord of Valencia has won." That's right, guys. Grid was there, almost falling over, asking what that ability was because a person like him would never have thought of a trick like that. But the Saint said, "Are you done barking about an ability, you crazy man, because your attack definitely reached him in every way." But the Sword Saint launched a much more powerful attack, which ended his and sent Grid flying. With that, he ended up winning the battle. Grid himself confirmed that he would be dead if he hadn't stopped his sword at that moment. Then he asked, "What did you do? Did you use magic?" But in reality, it was the control force field. Grid still didn't understand what that was, but he shouted, "I, Asgar of Valencia, request to proceed as the winner." The old man thought he couldn't even see his brother, and that would definitely cause damage to the allied countries. He had reached the top years before him, but he never thought he would lose this battle. But that thing, a promise is a promise. The Duke said, "Grid von Sheldon will stay in the Empire until the prince's wedding ceremony is over. That is my request as the winner." The audience wondered if he was showing generosity as an enemy. Even Grid didn't understand, wanting to know what he was planning. But the Duke just turned and said, "Come find me if you're curious, understood." And in this way, the news of Valencia's victory spread quickly. The sword master was stronger than the weapon master. The Lord of Valencia was now the Emperor of the Sword. The next day, Tin said, "You just won the title you had in your past life." Just then, someone announced that Lord Grid was there to see him. He said, "I came here as you asked." "But why did you ask to see me, you crazy man?" The old man said he would skip all the usual noble talk, but the guy was there complaining, "Nobles must maintain their integrity, even in private meetings with inferior humans. In this place, do you think you should show your integrity like that?" Tin frowned, saying that a person with power must remain elegant and strict with themselves. He said that this trauma had made him develop this habit. Then the guy went wild, asking, "What is this?" Tin continued, saying he had heard that when he was younger, he knocked over his own cousin for not being able to control his strength. The guy was already irritated, asking, "You, who are you?" But he already had the answer and said it was nonsense, as he didn't even know this person. However, the Sword Saint said he was telling the truth. "Grid, you asked what kind of trick I used yesterday. Actually, this person taught that same trick," said the Sword Saint. Grid, even more irritated, asked what all this was about. But the Sword Saint replied that if he could still call him that, they could talk. "So calm down and listen, Grid, because there's something important you need to know." He didn't answer anything and thought, "Is this what they call a friend? Huh?" And then huffing, he said, "Fine." The Saint said he never thought he would see his old name at this age, but the other old man complained that his name was too long and he didn't want to call him by his full name in private situations. And then he said, "Hey kid, what do I need to know? And if you say something nonsensical again, you won't leave here unscathed." As he said this, Tin burst out laughing, saying it sounded more like the old Grid than ever. He got mad while Tin continued, "Grid von Sheldon must be 56 years old this year, and normally he would meet for the first time at 15 years old, when his bright blue hair would already be half gray." After the little story, the old man said, "That all makes sense, yes. He would do those things. But are you telling the future will be a gamble? Don't worry, this time the 10 Knights will prevent that." The old man commented that this story of the 10 Knights still seemed a bit unusual since there were now only 7 or 8. Tin said he didn't know how to get close to them now, as the Reaper was probably training somewhere, and the Mage Knight was in the Wise Man's Tower. He said those names were quite common, and thought they already had everything at that time. And since the Duke had asked him to stay, it would be because of the disaster they were talking about. Tin confirmed, "That's right." Meanwhile, the Duke commented that he got these ideas from brain power, which made Grid angry, wanting to beat up the Duke. Grid still wanted to know about that ability of Ain's, which left him so stunned that he even fell to the ground. He asked, "Did you teach him that?" "The ability he used against me at the end of my past life." Grid was angry, wanting to know how his past life ended. In reality, they both ended up dying in the end, but Grid still said something important. "Your sword skill is superior to my level Saint. That was how he earned the title of Emperor of the Sword in his past life." The old man got furious, saying, "That's not real. Stop that." But Tin said he would teach him a very good skill he had in his past life. Grid, surprised, said, "Oh, can it be used like that? That will be amazing." After this conversation, Grid asked why Tin was giving this information to them, since they would be future allies but weren't yet. He could have used all this for himself. Tin replied, "What would be the point of that? The world could end at any moment. Life and glory mean nothing to me, and I know this for sure. I am genuinely a warrior who will keep his promise with his own life." The old man laughed, saying that it was true, that Tin was a very noble person. The Sword Saint continued the conversation, asking Grid not to do anything wrong while he was there. He replied, "Oh, don't be stupid. Of course I won't mess things up." Tin then asked if that was true, because whenever he and Reem said that Grid always ended up doing something wrong. As Grid walked outside, Tin and the old man watched him from above. Tin commented that he believed things would work out, and indeed, in the end they did. To build a bridge between the Alliance and the Empire, they would need Grid. He was the Duke of the Kingdom of Seldom, the center of all magical towers and alliances in the kingdom. Tin said he believed this because he knew the old man always kept his promises, but he asked when the Duke would talk to Lord Genus, feeling a bit anxious about the answer. The Duke said he would speak after they finished with that, as Genus would get even more nervous if he asked him to be calm now. Tin agreed, knowing that the Duke knew him better than he did, so they should start preparing. The old man said, "All right, the prince and I are using everything we have to understand what is happening." Tin mentioned the prince, criticizing the royalty of Aslan, saying they were fools who sold their own country for having ruined everything. But But the old man told him to be careful with what he said and not to underestimate the intelligence organization of the royal family. They must already have some proof, but I'm still quite worried. And what if the disaster has nothing to do with the demon worshippers? Tin asked, intrigued. The old man said that if it were caused by a political war within the royalty, they couldn't do anything about it, as a servant cannot interfere in royal disputes. Tin then questioned, so you're saying they should just watch from the sidelines even when the capital explodes? The old man said that was just a guess. He reflected on the defense of the imperial palace, but Tin insisted that the answer was already there. If you suspect someone from the imperial family, it's possible that the demon worshippers are already involved in all of this because you know I'm not part of Valencia, right? The Duke asked what Tin meant by that, and he actually wanted to know who among the Imperials was under suspicion. He asserted that he would take care of this personally. Tin, surprised, exclaimed, "You crazy man," and banged on the table, but then sat down and commented, "Stop this nonsense, kid." Tin, confused, asked why the Duke was so serious, but then realized that his mana had grown along with his physique. "I'm almost at the level of a blader, aren't I?" The Duke confirmed, and Tin replied, "Really? So what?" But the Duke was already determined. If that was the case, he would need to train Tin again. Remembering the tortuous adventures under the Duke's tutelage, Tin protested, "Train me? Oh, come on, you don't need to." Just then, the Duke was already running after him, saying, "Come back here, kid." A month later, several tornadoes began to appear in the sky while Tin below prepared himself. He planted the axe in the ground and launched the storm, controlling the direction of the tornadoes with his own mana. Tin thought this was the right moment because all bladers were known for using swords. The crucial ability of a level 4 mana user was precisely the mastery of mana, creating physical strength in places where the body could not reach. During that last month, he had been tortured by the Duke in training, running and working hard to get stronger. He remembered everything he had gone through and thought, "Let's go." At that moment, Janus arrived at the scene, recalling what the old man had said. Tin will soon reach the level of a blader. Then check and go to the Dragon's Eye. Janus, impressed by Tin's potential, thought that perhaps Asgard was expecting too much from him. But upon opening the door, he was astonished by what he saw, a huge tornado, immense, being controlled by Tin himself. He thought, it's almost there, just one thing missing. Tin pushed with the axe, recalling his past life, as he knew he needed to become an ender as soon as possible. Suddenly, a massive explosion occurred. Tin held his axe as lightning raced around him. He had used the Knight of Strength, the second signature move, the Storm Breaker, destroying everything in front of him. Excited, he jumped and exclaimed, "I did it, but my back hurts," and soon lay on the ground, murmuring that he needed a hearty meal. Suddenly, Tin heard applause. It was Janus who said, "I didn't imagine you would finally reach the level of a blader, Tin." At that moment, Tin's stomach growled again, and Janus suggested they go have dinner together. Tin, even hungrier after expending so much energy, agreed, and Janus said he had something important to tell him. Curious, Tin followed Janus, who led him to a nearby restaurant. Along the way, Tin asked why he needed to dye his hair. Janus replied that the request came directly from the Sword Emperor, since Tin's mission had been defined and the change in appearance would help minimize the attention he would attract. The Radiant Knight was very popular, and even nearby, people were talking about him. Janus explained that Tin's fake name would now be Turin, and that he would be a trainee knight from Valencia serving Janus. Tin, uncomfortable with the idea of serving Janus, protested, "You don't have to go that far, do you?" But Janus responded that if he refused, the Lord had ordered it be said that he would make Tin sulk during training. Tin walked away grumbling, commenting that the old man had no sense of humor. Janus warned him to be careful, and Tin responded somewhat irritated, but Janus insisted that the matter was serious. He explained that Tin needed to maintain balance between his body and spirit to reach a higher level. Tin then recalled a situation from the past when someone shouted, "Tin, did you get that man again?" Tin replied, somewhat mockingly, but he knew there were reasons. Even so, he understood that if he better controlled his temper, he would be much stronger. Janus continued, observing that the color of Tin's mana seemed to have changed when he reached the blader level. It was different from his past life. According to Valencia's perspective, a person's mana with strong faith and will reflects the color of their spirit, and it's likely they would become aura users. Janus advised Tin to keep his faith strong and learn to control his temper, since even temperament reflected the color of the spirit. Intrigued, Tin wondered why the color was different from his past life. Then he called upon the lunar wolf, reflecting that if the spirit could affect mana, perhaps he could do something different. On one side, he had power in his hands. On the other, a new type of power. He thought, one is heavier, the other lighter. Janus watched, asking, "Mr. Tiny?" But Tin was focused, combining the two powers and forming a kind of fireball. At that moment, Janus was impressed to see Tin condensing and compressing the power to its limit. With a look of effort, he launched the spell upwards, shouting, "Explode." And at that instant, a massive explosion erupted in the sky. Everyone around looked on in surprise, asking what had happened. The explosion was so powerful that it knocked down trees and pushed people away. Tin watched, stunned, murmuring, "My God, what have I done?" Janus, on the other hand, was excited. "That was incredible. Now you have a new type of power." Meanwhile, some people in the background murmured in fear. "Did he do that? Don't go near him." Janus noticed and commented, "You've attracted a lot of attention, kid. Be more careful next time." Tin agreed, and the two headed to the noble restaurant, a sophisticated and luxurious place. Upon seeing Seeing it, Tin exclaimed, wait, this looks way too expensive. I eat a lot. Why don't we go to the Tavern of Mana? Janus smiled and replied, the captain of the Blue Wing has plenty of money on the tabs, so relax. Tin smiled back, imagining that today they would enjoy themselves to the fullest. When they arrived, Janus was impressed by the amount of food, a true mountain. Tin attacked the chicken thighs like a mix of Luffy and Goku, devouring without pause. Everyone around watched in shock as the waiters took turns bringing more food to him. Janus, amazed, thought, my goodness, I learned something today. A human can put away a lot of food. As Tin ate, he felt his mana increasing, and the element of gravity was becoming stronger as well. Before, he could control up to 8 times the weight, but now he could increase it to 16 times. No one can stop me now, except for the superhumans of this world, he thought. Janus remarked, almost pleading, Tiny, are you full already? Please. Tin replied, wait. Just one more little piece. I still have room for dessert. After everything, the waiter approached. That was 150 portions. That's 11 gold, sir. Disheartened, Janus handed over the money, while Tin, with a full belly, thanked him for dinner. He joked, laughing, Janus, do you get satisfied with just one plate? You need to eat more. At that moment, Janus opened a piece of paper with an image on the back. One of the waiters closed the door and Tin, intrigued, asked, Mr. Janus, can I ask you a question? What kind of restaurant is this? Janus smiled and replied that they would get straight to the point. He snapped his fingers and an aura of mana appeared around them, blocking sound. Tin was impressed by Janus's precise control over mana and the elements. Janus explained that in addition to being a restaurant, the place also served as a base for the Royal Intelligence Organization, the Eye of the Dragon in the capital. Tin, surprised, murmured, is this an intelligence organization? Janus confirmed and explained that the Eye of the Dragon supported the prince during the succession, being the only trusted organization from Valencia within the palace. He pulled out a scroll and said that the Lord had requested to bring him here at least once, as he thought Tin underestimated the influence of royal connections. Tin was impressed and Janus continued, and there's one more reason to bring you here. There are about 10 days left until the wedding, as he knew only royal knights and nobles with rights from Valencia would be present. However, Janus suggested that Tin disguise himself as a servant to infiltrate. Tin thought the idea was great but commented that this could have been done much earlier. Janus, with a smile, said, don't underestimate Valencia. They'd already secured a place for you with a name and disguise. You can use that in an emergency. Curious, Tin asked what the paper Janus handed him was. In fact, it was the location where the artifact was stored. Tin, confident, replied, don't worry, I can handle this. Janus thanked him, asking him to study the map carefully. As they walked, Tin commented that something felt strange. A waiter approached and asked if the menu had been helpful. Tin thanked him, saying it had been. Then he bumped into someone and suddenly used the magic of the lunar wolf, saying, wait a minute, is that the prince? They sat down and the surprised prince commented that he didn't expect to find Tin there. Tin replied that it was the Duke of Valencia who guided him, explaining that they were both doing their best to find the demon worshippers. The prince said, it's always better to be safe. Since you saved Karam, I feel even more secure. Then Tin asked, so, can you tell me what's happening in the royal family? Is all of this to eliminate potential threats? Tin reflected on whether he had been too direct with the question, as the Duke might have reprimanded him for such boldness. The prince replied that this would be helpful, but that he had already gathered most of the information through the Eye of the Dragon. He then asked Tin what exactly he wanted to know. Tin, a bit hesitant, asked, do you think there's someone in the royal family who wants to destroy the country? The prince pondered, evaluating Tin's intentions, and responded that something like that could involve 3 people. Tin, excited, asked, who are they? First, the prince revealed that one of the people was the mother of his beloved brothers, the second empress. Tin was surprised, as he had always heard rumors around the palace but never believed they could be true. The prince continued, explaining that a decade ago, when the second empress rejected a proposal, his father ended up wiping out her entire family. It's just a rumor, he commented, but if it's true, that answers your question. Tin, even more curious, asked, and who's next? The prince explained that it was the royal knights. According to him, Aislinn discriminated against the knights who were treated worse than the mages, increasing the chances that they would want to destroy the empire. Finally, the prince mentioned his own father, the emperor. Tin was stunned to hear this last revelation. The prince explained that for some reason, the emperor was dissatisfied with the Duke of Valencia, especially after the recent duel that brought the Duke's name back into the spotlight. The emperor is furious, said the prince, and we need to be careful, as he possesses a secret force of great power. Tin thanked the prince for sharing all this information. The prince stood up, saying he had a meeting with his father and fiancé, and that he needed to leave immediately. Later that night in the castle, the Duke asked the prince if he had really said all that, for if it were true, the situation was more complicated than he had imagined. The Duke placed a hand on his head, incredulous, saying that if this were real, it would complicate things even further. At that moment, the lunar wolf, who was close to Clo, began sending alert signals to Tin, who soon spotted the Ashen Palace. Inside, Clo was training in etiquette. A lady praised her, very elegant, as expected. Let's wrap up the etiquette course for today. Clo sighed as the woman left, thinking that all that etiquette training had no practical utility. She sat down next to the lunar wolf, commenting that she could only see Vivian in the room, and that perhaps it would have been better to go to a sanctuary instead of being there because of the wedding. She looked at the wolf and said, Lunar, I'm lucky to have you here with me. At that moment, the arrival of the crown prince was announced. He approached, saying, Lady Clo, Clo, great work today. She thanked him, noting that he had been visiting her frequently lately. About that, the prince smiled and said, all my fatigue goes away when I see your face. Clo blushed, thinking about how he could say such sweet things, even being the prince of the empire. The prince asked if she remembered her meeting with his majesty later. She confirmed, but he warned her that the emperor might speak rudely to her, so he asked her to bear that for his sake. Clo reflected that she had heard rumors about the emperor's anger towards the Duke of Valencia, but she hadn't imagined that the resentment was so strong. While she was thinking, the prince reassured her. With you by my side, the empire in Valencia will be one. He admitted that he had pushed for the marriage, which might have further irritated the emperor. He said, I hope you understand, my dear. Clo recalled her father's words about the difficult relationship with the emperor, realizing that she needed to inform her family about the situation as soon as possible. At that moment, everyone in the hall paid their respects as the emperor entered. The prince and Clo bowed as he passed and sat on his throne. The prince greeted his majesty, who, with a stern expression, ordered them to raise their heads. They stood up, and the prince asked how his father was. The emperor replied that, as the prince was taking care of most of the empire's business, he himself could not be in a better situation. The prince bowed, asserting that he was merely helping as was convenient, and that the empire would always belong to his father. He added, the authority I wield was given only by the emperor. The emperor looked at him with suspicion and asked, so, are you willing to return that authority to me? The prince, sweating cold, replied that if the emperor wished, he would do so. The emperor, impatient, responded, there's no need, for all the nobles would be against that. He dismissed the prince with a gesture, ordering the knight to leave and not return. But the prince intervened, saying that the action followed imperial laws. The emperor, with a sarcastic tone, said, ah, so you believe that procedures are above the emperor himself. The company the prince had brought with him today made the emperor even angrier. He had heard the rumor about the Sword Emperor, a reference to the daughter of the one known as another emperor, and that infuriated him. The prince, agitated, said, that's just a nickname given by the commoners. It's not something you should take seriously. At that moment, Clo intervened, saying, Imperial Sword. She, daughter of Asgard of Van Valentia, saluted his majesty while speaking of the Imperial Sword. The emperor looked at her suspiciously, but Clo explained that her father had recently defeated the Sword of Union and achieved great glory, but that, she continued, would be nothing if it weren't for the honor of the empire. The emperor began to laugh almost maniacally. He clapped his hands and said, right, the prince chose someone just like him. Then his gaze turned cold and he said that he would need to give her and her father a warning. At that moment, the prince protested, shouting, father. The lunar wolf alert began to growl, and that was when Tin received an alert signal, standing up worried for Clo. He wondered if his majesty was threatening her. The emperor continued, saying that the lineage of Aslan had always ruled humanity since ancient times, and that common humans and procedures could not override the power of the imperial lineage. Clo then said, your majesty. But the prince stepped forward, asking the emperor to calm down. The emperor turned his back and ordered, get out of here. The prince placed a hand on his chest and said, then we're leaving. Come on, princess. The two exited through the front door, while the emperor murmured, son, you've grown up too fast. A shadow appeared and asked, your majesty, was there a special reason for you to say that to the princess? The emperor, thoughtful, replied that he was excited and that perhaps he was getting old. A shadow asked if he was troubled by the Valencia lineage, recalling that about 40 years ago, a 10-year-old boy, a descendant of the duke's family, had greeted the emperor. That boy had started learning fencing and the emperor personally taught him. However, the boy defeated him in combat, which made the emperor give up on becoming a knight at that moment. The emperor decided that the Aslan lineage was destined for magic from the very beginning. Even so, he lacked talent for magic, which made this story even more humiliating. He explained that his hostility towards Valencia was not due to personal resentment, but because he believed that even in times of peace, a mere noble family should not surpass the imperial family. This, according to him, threatened the fundamental rules of the empire. He continues, saying that the prince did not fully understand. He is intelligent, the emperor commented, but there is nothing he can do because of that damned law. The existence of this law prevented the empire with all its power from conquering the continent. The royal family was bound by rules that hindered the total centralization of power, and to govern the continent, he would need to concentrate all power in his hands. The shadow agreed, and the emperor laughed, asserting that the justification for this would come from this stupid queen. The shadow warned him that despite all their efforts, they would not be able to defeat the Duke of Valencia without help. Therefore, the emperor needed the cooperation of the shadows. He asked if the secret weapon was ready, but the shadow replied that progress was underway. Impatient, the emperor interrupted. I've heard he is talented. The shadow confirmed, saying the young man was the greatest genius born since the last group of shadows, and at the current pace he could, in about 10 years, be the first emperor to control an aura user and an assassin. The emperor lamented that it would still take so long, but the shadow reassured him that working in partnership with the Royal Magic Tower, the time would be sufficient. The emperor smiled, satisfied, and asked, where has the prince gone? He instructed the shadow to provide limited information to the prince so that he would not suspect the existence of a plan against the Duke of Valencia. Finally, the emperor stated that at the right moment, the prince would receive crucial news. He planned for the Duke of Valencia to succumb during the rebellion of the demon worshippers against the royal family, which would give the emperor enough justification to gather the dispersed power that was in the wrong hands and that threatened the empire. Thus, Plus, they would use the plan of everyone around the palace to create the perfect situation. The shadow began to murmur in a strange language, announcing that his subordinate had obtained some useful information. The emperor smiled and said, "Yes, your majesty. I think we can pressure Valencia in advance." It was night and we were in Valencia. The sword emperor reflected, "The emperor not only hates me, but has even threatened Cloon now." He placed a hand on his head, deep in thought. Tiny, in his usual playful tone, suggested, "What if we just get rid of this emperor once and for all?" The sword emperor looked at him with a severe expression, to which Tiny quickly replied, sweating cold, "Ah, that could never happen, right? Just kidding." Confused, Tiny asked, "Why did this happen? Why does he still hold a grudge about something so long ago?" In his thoughts, he reflected on how hard he had worked to serve the emperor, yet despite that, the emperor remained the same as ever. Tiny wondered what kind of useless thoughts he was having. The old man commented, "You little brat, you don't understand how serious this situation is." Tiny then asked if the problem was greater than the Demon King's army, to which the old man replied, "Probably not." Tiny retorted, "Then why does he think about it so much? In the end, everything resolves the same way. If the Demon King attacks, like it or not, we will be forced to unite." In a tone of experience, he said, "The Duke is right. There is only one thing we must do, which is to preserve the power of humanity." The Duke smiled and remarked, "Every once in a while, I even envy that little brain of yours." Tiny got irritated, asking, "What did you say, you old man?" However, he now felt his mind clearer thanks to Tiny's advice and thanked him. At that moment, Janus rushed into the room and announced, "We have a problem, Your Highness. We received an urgent report from the Dragon's Eye. There is a rebellion in a small town, which is directly under the royal family's territory." The Duke stood up, surprised. "A rebellion? You said rebellion?" Janus confirmed and explained that according to the reports, the Emperor had ordered Valencia to suppress the uprising. The Duke read the letter sent directly from the royal family, explaining that Valencia needed to prove its worth as a future ally of the imperial family. The deadline for this would be the wedding. Tiny questioned how they had the audacity to incite a rebellion in a small town. Based on what Janus heard, it was speculated that the responsible parties were demon worshippers. Tiny found it absurd that something like this could happen at such a critical time. He pondered that perhaps the worshippers were trying to disperse the royal family's military force, planning to attack during the wedding. Janus asked what he thought about that, but Tiny stated that for now, they should focus on controlling the rebellion. According to the reports, the affected cities were Seringal, Liam, and Karina. In the cases of Seringal and Liam, Tiny believed that the Imperial Army and the Magic Tower were taking care of the situation. The Ice Flame Mage had also been sent to Karina, which was situated between Valencia and the Imperial Palace, and they could send some men to help. The Duke pondered, if they want to end the rebellion before the wedding, they will need high-class knights. Janus confirmed this, explaining that for the high-class knights, including himself, who were at the Imperial Palace, it would be possible to complete the mission, but they wouldn't be able to return before the wedding. The Duke suspected that the Emperor intended to wear down Valencia's military power. Tiny then smiled and suggested that he could resolve everything in a week if he went alone. The Duke was alarmed by the idea, and Janus asked if he intended to use the Lunar Wolf. Tiny replied, 3 days to go, 3 to return, 1 day to deal with them. It's completely possible. Janus argued that it was dangerous because, even though it was a small town, there should be at least 100 enemy knights, and they did not know which worshippers were present. Taking such a dangerous risk was not worth it. Tiny, however, insisted, this is also a challenge, and if there's a chance, we must seize it because that's how I have lived my life. Please do something for me. See if we can borrow a sacred object from the Imperial family. At that moment, someone questioned. They want to borrow a sacred item. How do they plan to obtain such a valuable object? The person explained that they had already used their core and Karam before. Tiny thought that this would be incredible and asked them to inform the Emperor. The scene then shifted to the Emperor sitting on his throne. A shadow appeared and announced, a sacred object has disappeared, my lord. The Emperor looked coldly, suspecting that the prince was involved as the object had vanished right after a knight from Valencia named Porin visited the palace. It was speculated that this knight was heading to Karina, and if he used the sacred object, the worshippers would be defeated by light before they even approached. Those who were blinded by black magic would awaken, and this was the reason why Tiny wanted the object so much. The Emperor was astonished, commenting, so Valencia will not lose any men. He became furious upon realizing that his plan was not going as expected, as he wanted to affect Valencia in some way. Irritated, he ordered, do not let that boy return alive. A shadow beside him continued explaining, to ensure that we will send the secret weapon we are developing. Meanwhile, in another scene, a servant was running in fear upon seeing Tiny and his lunar wolf passing at high speed. Along the way, someone hidden in the forest observed Tiny and his giant wolf, which was not an ordinary mount. The person thought, he is fast, and I can't even keep up, but maybe he will return the same way. I will wait for him here. Tiny, always fearless, traversed rocky terrain with his lunar wolf. However, there was a problem. He was exhausted and hungry, having eaten only a wild bear over the past 3 days, and his wolf hadn't been fed well either. Tiny still asked the lunar wolf, don't you sense anything from the 4th stage around here? He reflected that his soul had already experienced the level of a superhuman, but reaching the same power he had in another life might not be enough to change the course of things now. He realized that he had grown as an elementalist and that, with a higher quality soul, he could become a master of aura. Although the 4th stage of an elemental was complex for him now, he knew he would reach it one day. Continuing with his lunar wolf, Tiny was determined to stop the rebellion, and after after resolving the situation, would return to Valencia. The scene showed Karina in front of the inner palace, where some people were talking amongst themselves. A man reflected, "My family has been bowing to the Lord of Karina for generations. Until when will they treat us like toys?" He felt resentful, but another person placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You are right, but you need to calm down now. You are the new Lord, and you must prepare for what is to come." Curious, he asked, "What are you talking about? And what about the sacred object and a knight?" The mysterious person confirmed, "Yes, he left the Imperial Palace 4 days ago. He should arrive soon, so I wish you good luck." The new Lord was confused and even more worried, while the hooded figure said, "As long as they have the sacred object, they won't be able to do anything against you." Then the hooded figure bid farewell, wishing him luck and stating, "It's all for the new world." As he moved away, he proceeded with his knights, reflecting, "Yes, it's for the new world." Soon after, a group of hooded figures was discussing among themselves, intrigued by the abilities of the arriving knight. They doubted he could do anything and decided to gather information while they awaited his arrival. Suddenly, an explosion was heard in the city, and the hooded figures alarmed. "Is he already here?" While they tried to remain calm, sounds and screams echoed throughout the city. Tiny was smashing down on all the enemies with his hammer, creating chaos and causing people to scream in desperation. One of the hooded figures ordered, "Activate the trap." However, others hesitated, exclaiming, "But it's too late." The leader then shouted for everyone to get ready, but Tiny was approaching, furious, shouting, "Join me. I'm going to strike and end this once and for all." Tiny raised his weapon and with a cry of love and light, unleashed the power of the sacred artifact, which reflected an intense energy onto the enemies around him. The worshippers on top of the buildings began to melt, screaming in pain and agony. One of the enemies recognized the power, exclaiming, "So this is the strength of a sacred object." They tried to activate the trap, but many were writhing in pain. As some shouted, "For the new world." One of them called for strength from their master, while Tiny advanced with his hammer, determined to finish them off. Tiny swung his hammer with force, hitting the enemy and exploding everything around. He used mana to shield himself from the explosion and reflected on what was happening. He suspected that the enemy had used a clone sacrificed to survive the attack. Looking around, he noticed that the worshippers were weakened due to the sacred object. He knew that normally they wouldn't use a sacrifice for a simple attack, but upon seeing the spheres glowing around, he understood the danger. The spheres had destructive magical potential, and he knew that artifacts of the demonic worshippers exploded when they began to glow intensely. Seeing the glowing spheres, Tiny worried, exclaimed, "Damn it." He realized that this could be the last time he would see the Imperial Palace, but he was determined to use his strongest ability. Tiny focused, forming an energy sphere between his hands and launched it at the spheres. A powerful explosion occurred, throwing him far away. As he recovered, Tiny thought he needed to find a way to weaken that destructive power. Tiny and his lunar wolf were thrown away by the mana explosion, and the entire castle began to crumble toward the city. Lying on the ground, Tiny reflected, "This power is absurd. It left me as weakened as before, but how did I not notice this with my mana detection ability?" He then murmured, "Imperial Palace, they are really focused only on the artifact. I need to warn them." Determined, Tiny kicked the door and shouted, "Bring me the communication device now." A frightened man pleaded, "I was just following orders, please spare my life." But Tiny, impatient, was about to charge at him, determined to get the communication device. Soon after, he ran with his lunar wolf, complaining, "Even in a small place, they don't have a decent communication device." Upon entering the forest, Tiny apologized to the lunar wolf. "I know you just recovered, but I still need your strength a little longer. If we go straight, maybe we can make it in time." However, at that moment, he felt a strange sensation, as if his body were being cut. Lunar wolf dodge, he ordered, and narrowly avoided a blade that almost struck his head. Stopping to catch his breath, he thought, "That was close. I would have died if I hadn't expanded my senses in time." Suddenly, an arrow grazed his cheek, followed by another that emerged from the ground, almost hitting his neck. Tiny, confused, murmured, "Reaper, what are you doing here?" But then he remembered, this isn't the Reaper I know from my past life." Before he could finish reasoning, the woman appeared behind him, sword in hand. Tiny pulled out his hammer and shouted, "I won't let you escape, you little pest." However, before he could attack her, she disappeared again, using the illusion step. Tiny knew he was at a disadvantage. They had run non-stop since Karina, and now he had little mana to face her. At that moment, several arrows flew toward him, and he could only protect himself using his iron barrier as a shield. Exhausted, Tiny thought, "My body can't take it anymore, and the poison from her shadows is weakening me. I might die here, but I can't eliminate her now, because in the future, she will become one of the 10 knights." Intrigued, he asked, "Why did you, the shadow of the Imperial family, come after me?" She hesitated for a moment, and Tiny realized that her inexperience made her respond. He thought to himself, "The Reaper I know would never have reacted this way. She's still inexperienced." To throw her off, Tiny added, "I know the magical circuit technique you use is from the Law of Shadows." Surprised, she asked how he knew this, as she was the only one to master such a technique. Tiny thought to himself, "Of course I know this. She herself told me in the future." Flustered, the woman prepared one of her arrows and shouted, "This is absurd." Tiny, determined to survive, leaned on the lunar wolf and began to move, while she thought, "These are the steps of illusion." So it was true. Tiny turned to her and said, "I told you I come from the same place as you." She then hesitated and asked, "You are Tiny, the Shining Knight, Tiny Morse?" Surprised, Tiny replied, "Why this reaction?" She then thought the rumors were false, but could it be possible that he was a descendant of her family? Tiny confirmed, "Yes, of course I am." Upon hearing this, she took off her hood, revealing revealing her face and explained, "I thought that wasn't true. I am the last descendant of the Morse family, or so I thought." Tiny was shocked. "What did you say?" She continued walking ahead, explaining that she had been ordered to serve the imperial family and that everything she did was for her family. She sighed. "So I cannot kill someone who comes from my own lineage?" Tiny, confused, asked how she knew he was in service to the imperial family. He realized he had been careless and tried to argue. "Well, only the imperial family and Valencia knew I was going to Karina. If someone wants to eliminate me, it's obvious that it's the imperial family." She nodded in understanding and replied, "I see." Tiny, relieved, asked why she was there and what motivated her to ambush him. She explained that she was following orders from the emperor to prevent him from reaching Karina, and if possible, to eliminate him. Tiny, indignant, concluded, "So it was the emperor. He wants to target Valencia, not me." Tiny thought about the demon worshippers who almost destroyed Karam and were now fighting for power, questioning whether it was truly worth protecting that imperial family. Tiny stepped back and asked Sirius what she would do about the mission given by the royal family. She said she could take care of it, but he truly felt bad in several ways about what he had just done. Shortly after, the scene shifted to a meeting of the hooded figures. They were incredulous. The Morse boy had survived the bombs and was now heading to the city, where he would arrive in 3 days. One of the hooded figures commented, "So he will inform the city about the bombs." Another asked who would believe him, and they agreed it would be difficult, even for those who saw it with their own eyes. However, one of them warned that the Morse boy was very unpredictable, and therefore they should accelerate their plans. They pondered how this could affect their plans, as the royal family rarely gathered in full except for weddings. All members of the royal family, except the emperor, would gather in one place for the wedding etiquette rehearsal, and that was what they intended to take advantage of. One hooded figure asked what they should do about the emperor, and the leader replied coldly, "Tell the blue fox to take care of him." The scene shifted to the second queen, who was calmly drinking her tea. She questioned the sudden change in plans and seemed suspicious, but one of her advisors said she didn't need to worry about anything as they were completely prepared, and that the designated people would handle the nuisance that was the emperor, all for their benefit. The queen smiled and commented that the emperor only held that position because he was the eldest, not because he had real power. "He is not someone the leader of the royal family's cavalry should fear," she said. The advisor smiled back, affirming, "Of course, the emperor is not a problem in himself, but the mage is loyal to him, especially the blue-blooded mage certainly are." The queen then added, "We cannot forget about the assassins of the royal family." The advisor even suggested that this was just a rumor, but she slammed her hand on the table, exclaiming that no, she had seen for herself what those bastards did to her family. Emotional, the queen recalled what happened to her brothers, sisters, father, and mother. "I know better than anyone what they are capable of doing." The advisor knelt and said that the few days they had left would decide their future, and that if all went well, her son would become the next emperor. She smiled, but also reminded him, "If we fail, it will be the end for all of us." The advisor kissed her hand and reaffirmed that he knew what was at stake. In the next scene, we were in the emperor's chamber, who asked, "Ah, so they changed the plans." The shadow beside him confirmed, saying that the second queen altered the date of the barrier stone in the inner palace. They intended to act the day before the wedding during the rehearsal. The emperor commented that he would not be present at the rehearsal, but suspected they would attempt an ambush. However, they still had not discovered how many enemies would be at that location. To him, it made no difference. There is nothing that the scum manipulated by demons can do. The emperor, however, expressed his concern about Asgard, as he believed that the humble ones there would not be able to face him. The shadow confirmed that he was right and volunteered to take care of the problem. The emperor asks if he would be able to handle that. For a brief moment, the other questions his safety, but he, with a tone of manipulation, affirms that everything is fine. The shadow comments that due to his majesty's authority, they could not deal with the Duke of Valencia at that moment. Thus, the emperor orders they keep surveillance and reports on the situation. He then says that if he believes this will not affect his safety, he can leave to take care of Asgard. He drinks the wine and continues, saying that if this is still not enough, he can take Ludwig with him to ensure success. The other questions him again, which irritates the emperor. Enraged, she glares at him and warns that if he has nothing else to say, he can leave. However, the person continues, informing that there is a report on the Karina rebellion, which has been suppressed. Furious, the emperor grips the cup in his hands and questions Karina. He reflects, remembering that the boy from Valencia had borrowed the sacred object. Enraged, he stands up from the table and mutters that the boy survived and handled the situation in Karina. In response, he explains that they had a plan that would certainly prevent him from returning and asks him not to worry. The cup shatters on the floor and the emperor glares at him, outraged, asking if he truly believes that he is in this state because of a child. He continues, saying that the damn people of Valencia managed to win without losing a single man. Calling him an idiot, useless, and cursed, the emperor insults him while the other remains silent. After hearing these words, the person apologizes. The emperor then names him responsible for dealing with those damn people of Valencia, to which he responds, "Yes, your majesty." At this moment, the second prince asks if she was has already moved, and the mage confirms that she has. He adds, saying that Gruel is probably planning to act a day before the wedding, not on the day itself. The prince reflects for a moment and asks if his father will not be present at the wedding. In response, the mage says that the collaborators will take care of it and sarcastically smiles, asking if these collaborators are the useless demon worshippers. Leaning on the table, the prince questions if these demon worshippers could harm his father without the help of internal allies, calling the mage by name. The mage, looking at the prince, says that as long as the blue-blooded mage Ludwig is there, it won't be easy. The prince agrees and comments that his uncle will be present, along with his father. He observes that his father has never placed knights by his side since he started despising them because of Valencia, as the fire his father started resulted in a huge blaze, enough for the queen to betray the royal family with a cavalry leader. And to thwart the plan his father is preparing. Then he calls for Ixalan, who responds, "Yes, your highness." The prince proceeds, saying that it's not a bad idea to cut out the corrupt part of the royal family using this situation. Ixalan questions why do it now, especially at this moment. The prince explains that it's to avoid dirtying his own hands. Surprised, Ixalan questions him, and the prince responds that it's to maintain the plan. He continues to question, suggesting that instead he could tell the Valencia family. Turning, the prince orders him to go to the Chain Palace, where the ceremony will take place the day before, but he says that he will inform the plan to his future father-in-law himself. In the next scene, the bride, lying on the floor, comments that it was better when she had bridal etiquette classes without any breaks. The woman sitting on the bench responds that she keeps complaining even though there's much to be done. The princess agrees, saying that now even the lunar wolf is no longer there, and she completes the thought, mentioning that there are no cute children, like Tiny. The girl smiles, saying that it's a new feeling, seeing someone who still looks like a child to her getting married. The bride smiles, looks at her, and comments that before she gets old, she should confess her feelings to Genus. Upon hearing that, the girl gets shy and asks what the bride is saying, retorting that she only respects Genus as a leader. Smiling, the bride approaches with a sarcastic tone and asks if that's really true. Stammering, the girl responds that yes, and adds that he's a genius, having reached an impressive rank at the age of 30, besides being handsome. The bride looks at her again and asks if she wants her to talk to the gentleman Genus. Shouting, the girl says it's not like that, and that she envies the bride's freedom to date whoever she wants. She then asks if the bride doesn't mind having to marry the crown prince. Lying in her bed, the princess responds that it's not like that and explains that she had many privileges because of her family, and now she needs to do her part. The princess immediately gets up from the bed upon hearing the crown prince's voice, and Vivian quickly helps her fix her hair. The prince enters, smiles, and surprised, notices that the knight Vivian is also present. The two ask the reason for his visit. Observing them, he says it's something important and that he needs to speak with the princess. She looks at him startled. In the next chapter, the prince appears riding a white wolf, saying he has arrived. The knights rush to him, calling him Tiny. He glares at them and calls them young masters, asking why they are here. They respond that their father left them there so they could talk to him. The prince comments that the day has changed and they should head toward the wedding as soon as they arrive. The bells toll and the priest makes an announcement to be in the rehearsals for the crown prince's ceremony. He asks everyone to remain silent for now and to be careful not to make any mistakes during the royal ceremony. Everyone around observes attentively to his instructions. A hooded man appears with a small sphere in his hand and instructs that when the plan begins, it should be infused with mana and thrown. He claims that this will summon the destroyer. The knight then asks how he will know when the plan will begin and if there will be any signal. The hooded man replies that he doesn't need to know exactly when to start and that he will find out soon. Irritated, the knight asks, when the hell will that be? But the man leaves without saying anything. The knight looks around and notices that the Duke of Valencia is being cautious. He wonders if the Duke knows something and decides that he needs to get him away from there. He then calls Estruel and asks him to come over for a moment. Estruel approaches, noting that the Duke seems to be acting suspiciously and believes he knows something. The Duke watches their conversation closely and suspects they are planning something. He reflects on what they might be scheming and comments that, no matter how cautious the prince may be, he hasn't sensed any evil energy or strange mana from the demon worshippers. He continues observing everything as the crown prince had asked, but still wonders if there could be a coup during the rehearsal. In a discreet conversation, the prince confirms that the second queen and the cavalry leader had allied with the demon worshippers to stage a coup during the rehearsal. The Duke suggests postponing the rehearsal, but the prince refuses, stating that acting recklessly could put everyone at risk. He explains that he called the Duke and the Valencia knights to protect his family. The Duke then asks if the emperor knows about the plan, and the prince replies that he believes so. The Duke observes that this is strange and that the situation involves more than just demon worshippers. The prince watches him carefully silently. The Duke continues, saying that he doesn't understand why they would start a coup with only Gruel and the royal knights. Even if the demon worshippers are involved, they wouldn't dare enter the palace with a protective barrier. He concludes that they would probably find another way to advance. He wonders why they're worrying so much about it now. Even if the plan fails, he would still have his father-in-law by his side. At this moment, the prince's younger brother calls out to him. hinting that maybe he doesn't want to get married. The prince, calling his brother Tenel, reflects that he wouldn't inherit the golden eye of the royal Asian family, but that he is the most innocent child present that night. He predicts that in the future, Tenel will also harbor resentment towards him. Returning to the topic with his younger brother, the prince smiles and comments that he is happy and excited for the wedding. Tenel looks at him and says that he doesn't seem very excited. The prince responds that as one grows older, there are many things to worry about, and Tenel shouldn't worry about him. Tenel smiles, congratulates his brother on the wedding, and adds that maybe he won't have the chance to say that the next day. The prince smiles and thanks his brother. Turning, the prince asks why he is there and states that the knights shouldn't be present at the rehearsal. The knights explain that they came because of what the prince had mentioned. Enraged, the prince insists that he doesn't want them there. Observing them, he asks Lunar Wolf and wonders if Tiny has already arrived. The knights inform him that only immediate family members and palace workers are allowed inside. Holding the wolf in his hands, the prince comments that the knight Tiny then couldn't enter and is waiting outside with the other Valencia knights. The prince orders them to leave, but before finishing his sentence, he observes the wolf in his hands and makes a note it was an artifact without mana. He then realizes their plan. The knights call out to him and say they have information that people might cause some disturbance during the rehearsal, which is why the order was given to not allow anyone in except for the imperial family and workers. The prince asks, surprised, what? They continue explaining that though inconvenient, it was a measure to ensure his majesty's safety and asks for understanding. Agitated, the prince shouts at the knights, asking how they dare treat the bride's father like a criminal. The knights respond that they are merely following orders. His majesty then asks whose orders they are following and pointing to his sword, says that whether it will be drawn depends on their answer. At that moment, the duke enters the hall and asks if they are fighting. The crown prince asks if that is Duke Asgard and if the royal knight and the Duke of Valencia are really arguing. The prince interrupts, asking what's going on. They apologize to his majesty, saying there was a brief misunderstanding, but before finishing the sentence, the prince retorts, "Do you dare ignore my command? I asked you to tell me whose orders it is," pointing the sword at the knight. Once again, the prince is interrupted. He tries to calm him down, saying that he's being excessively zealous and calls him by name. Agitated, the prince confronts the knight, asking if he intends to expel his father-in-law from the wedding and orders him to return to his place. The knight apologizes and explains that the royal knights are only following the emperor's orders. Turning to the knight, the prince confirms that the order came from the emperor. The duke, still agitated, declares that if he doesn't cooperate, he will be considered a traitor. The knight reaffirms that if he doesn't obey, he will be imprisoned for treason. The wolf then walks away, thanking the movement because it allowed him to enter the palace. He comments that he's worried about the old man, but needs to take care of the explosives first. Having seen them before, it will be easy to identify them. Once he finds them, he'll take care of it. He runs out of the main hall. The knight asks the prince if he is following the emperor's orders and if he really expects him to believe that. The prince takes a deep breath and with an authoritative tone announces that if that is his father's will, they have no choice. A knight calls him, but he interrupts, adding that the ceremony is about to begin and asking to be left alone. Another knight notices the explosives and realizes that they could kill most of the nobles. They call the prince, alerting him that they are using the emperor's name. The prince replies that he already knows, but there is no proper justification now, and even if he tried to confirm with his father, it would be too late. The knight questions what will happen to the nobles already present, mentioning that they are using unknown artifacts and that the people there are in danger. Another knight comments that they need to be prepared to sacrifice a few. However, the prince, with his own plan in mind, asks him to calm down. The bells of the church toll. The priest asks for everyone's attention, informing them that there has been a problem outside, but it has been resolved, and the ceremony will proceed as planned. The princess arrives, descending the stairs, and he announces her entrance. Clo von Valencia. Murmurs about her triumphant beauty arise, with some commenting that the prince is truly very lucky. The prince compliments her, saying she looks beautiful and calls her my lady. He extends his hand and she smiles, thanking the prince. They walk through the halls, smiling. The priest announces that the stars of the night have arrived and that the ceremony will begin. Everyone watches attentively. A boy asks for permission and brings the candles to them. They ask the boy to continue with the ceremony. In a hidden corner, the wolf reappears, tired. He thinks it would be easy to find the explosives, but realizes that everything in the place looks like little balls. A woman appears, cursing. The wolf continues to reflect on what to do as all the objects are painted, and he cannot identify which one is the right one. He wonders if he should simply destroy them all. One of the nobles asks the others if they also smell something strange. They agree and wonder what it could be, stating they have never smelled anything like this before. The wolf alerts them that it's the smell of burning candles, though it's a little different. He then tilts his snout, intrigued by which smell they're talking about. Realizing it's the smell of the explosives, he remembers that this specific scent is exhaled just before the little balls explode. He runs towards them, trying to get rid of them before they explode in the wedding hall. During the rehearsal, the priest instructs that the next day the prince should arrive first. The prince is startled by something passing under his legs and asks when it touched his foot. The wolf, realizing that it would be difficult to act discreetly, smiles maliciously and decides that he has no other choice. Growing in size, he reveals himself in a terrifying form to make people flee. He begins attacking objects objects around him and runs, spreading chaos. The audience panics, shouting for everyone to run. A knight, terrified, observes the scene and asks what that thing was. He wonders if that was the signal they had mentioned, but soon concludes that the wolf didn't seem hostile to the nobles, so it might just be an interference. Observing carefully, the knight realizes that the bomb is in the cake. The wolf jumps and says it's not too late, need only to spit the explosive out. Someone jumps down from above to stop the wolf, saying that he can't do that. But the wolf spits the explosive from his mouth, and the bomb explodes completely. The Majesty asks if the chapel ceiling has exploded, and the Emperor replies that yes. The king comments that the demon worshippers brought some new artifacts, but apparently there was no real damage. He also says that the collateral damage and the death of some relatives don't matter, mentioning that the prince and the princess were also there. The Emperor looks at him, but the king continues, stating that if they die, it will only help to reclaim authority over the nobles. He finishes by saying that with this justification, he will conquer the entire continent again, and that this would be the ideal reason to start the war. The king lets out a dark, macabre laugh, and the Emperor, in a distinct tone, calls him Your Majesty. In the midst of the chaos in the palace, a knight strikes a member of the royalty with a sword in the back. He smirks sarcastically, recognizing it as the signal, and comments that it was hard not to notice. He observes the explosives in his hands and begins the long-awaited plan. As he stands up, the prince looks for the princess, calling her name. The knight is surprised to see the prince there and wonders how he survived. The princess, by her father's body, screams for help. The prince hears her call and runs to help her. One of the knights orders that no one leave the area. The prince, outraged, complains, mentioning that he expected to take some risks, but he then remembers a conversation he had with his father-in-law. Surprisingly, the prince is stabbed in the back. A knight watches the scene and murmurs that he didn't expect the situation to reach this point. Ixalan calls one of his knights, who promptly responds that he is at the prince's disposal. The prince then says that the next day the emperor will be killed by the demon worshippers, and if that doesn't happen, the knight must ensure the plan is completed, because he almost died without carrying it out. A hooded man attacks another soldier, enraging the prince, who calls him a bastard. The prince strikes him with his own sword. The man, stammering, calls him by his title, but is killed. After the attack, the prince wonders if the princess is okay and says that, first, he needs to calm down. He surveys the surroundings and reflects that he had prepared an infallible plan for the princess. He knows his father-in-law could arrive at any moment, but before that, he needs to focus on surviving so that the deaths of his allies won't have been in vain. Soon he comes face to face with a red monster resembling a demon. The prince, frightened, sees that it's not just one, but several demons advancing to attack him. Meanwhile, the bride's father comments that he was not informed about the explosion and asks his servant to enter as closed knight. Observing the bride's father, the prince reflects that he was also unaware of the plan. Around him, everything begins to collapse. He looks at his hand and notices that he feels lethargic after the explosion. He suspects his mana is being restricted, but thanks to the artifact given by Tiny, he can resist a little longer. The princess and the knight Vivian find Genus in the hallway and call to him. Genus greets them and expresses relief at seeing that the princess is fine. He hands his sword to her, saying there's not much time and she should use it. The princess thanks him and tells Genus that she needs to go to the prince, asking him to hurry and follow them. He agrees. Seeing the prince fighting the demons, everyone is surprised. The prince calls upon the goddess for help, asking for power. He faces the demons, and the princess joins him, wielding her sword and attacking the enemies. The prince looks at her, surprised and grateful. Vivian shouts for the princess to be careful, while the demons continue their assault. Genus also joins the fight, radiating his blue power. The prince's staff falls to the ground, and Genus positions himself in front of them, urging the princess and the prince to flee and leave the fight to him. Genus plans to slice the enemy's neck, but misses due to the restriction of his mana, so he decides to buy time instead. He begins attacking the monsters with his power. The prince watches the scene and comments that Genus is the Knight of the Storm. The monsters continue to attack, and one of the demons kneels, transforming into something different. The knight observes the transformation and wonders, perplexed, what the hell that could be. He collapses to the ground, and the princess, seeing him, desperately calls out to him. However, the demons continue their assault. Vivian steps in front, jumping onto one of the monster's necks and slicing it with her sword. She tells the princess to look up, where the prince is protecting her head from another monster. At that moment, the prince recalls a conversation with the princess and Vivian in his room. He informs her that on the day of the rehearsal, there will be a coup. The princess asks if they should cancel the rehearsal, but the prince replies that no, as he has already discussed the matter with her father. He explains that they have a plan that will change the empire's fate, but he doesn't want to put her in danger. The prince then gives her a bracelet and asks her to accept it. The princess asks what it is, and he explains that it is an artifact called Defensio, belonging to the imperial prince. He promises that no matter what happens that day, she will be protected. Back in the present scene, blue power radiates around them as they face the monster. In the next chapter, one of the knights notices that he fainted due to the impact he suffered and concludes that he has done enough. Now the old man can take care of the rest. The old man appears, asking them to get out of his way. He asks the guards who were watching the door if they really expect him to wait after seeing that explosion. The guards respond that the security of the imperial palace is the responsibility of the cavalry, and those inside will take care of the situation, asking him not to worry. The old man becomes irritated, calling them brats. He draws his sword, mentioning Clo, and says that he hopes everything goes as planned. A young man observes the scene and questions what he is doing, asking why the old man is drawing his sword and if this is really the same Rasgard he knew. He observes that Rasgard looks completely different. Approaching Rasgard, the young man asks if Tiny is okay. Ignoring the old man, he moves forward, but continues saying that they will need to wait for the. At this moment, the guards stop him, reaffirming that the Imperial cavalry will handle the situation. The old man becomes furious and saying to hell with it, sees Tiny attacking the guards. Surprised, the old man asks Tiny what he is doing and reminds him that if they attack, it will be considered treason. But Tiny responds that he doesn't care and that his actions are justified. Sheathing his sword, the old man observes the situation and sarcastically comments, "What can I do from here, treason?" As the guards run, shouting to kill Tiny, the old man murmurs that Tiny has caused a big problem, and now he owes him a debt. Then the old man draws his sword and begins to attack as well. Thanks to Tiny, he managed to free his sword, and together, they begin eliminating the guards around them. Tiny looks around and sees several bodies fallen, including the old man with his bloodied sword. The old man then shouts for the knights to save the princess and the prince. The knights run out, and Tiny tells the old man that they can't waste any more time here. They need to get inside. He notices a blue whirlwind around the palace and asks what that is, wondering if it's something Janus did. The old man stares at him and questions what Tiny plans to do. Tiny then, with his sword, creates a ladder and begins to climb, using his power, while everyone watches in admiration. He surpasses the Imperial barrier, and the old man calls him stupid, saying that he is not strong enough to face the barrier. With a sarcastic smile, Tiny replies, "Let's see if I really am not," finishing with, "Wait for the right moment," and he then radiates his power throughout the palace using the gravitational property reversal spell. He says he just needs one more moment and then throws a spear. As Tiny continues attacking, the prince and princess watch him enter. He jokes about what kind of barrier it is, but is interrupted by the old man, who steps on his head and warns him that he is also there. Tiny descends the walls, attacking the demons, and both begin fighting together. The princess screams for her father to dodge. He lowers his neck and notices a demon behind him, attacking immediately. Looking around, he sees that all the demons have fallen to the ground. The princess calls for her father, but he calls for the prince, scolding him and saying that whatever the plan is, he cannot put his daughter's life at risk. The prince, stammering, calls him father-in-law and tries to explain that this is not what he thinks. The old man smiles and says that the prince can pay off his debt by taking care of his daughter in the future. The prince, relieved, calls him father-in-law, and his daughter, embarrassed, also calls him that. The old man then looks at Tiny and says he thinks everything is coming to an end. Suddenly, a masked figure appears, dressed in black, and looks at them, saying, "You." The prince, upon seeing the figure, tells his father-in-law that they should retreat. The old man comments that the emperor's shadows, about which he had heard rumors, seem to be using this event as an opportunity, and that they are not the only ones with plans. Meanwhile, the king watches the scene through his magical orb, and says that he will finally see the last moments of the bastard of Valencia. He comments to his brother Ludwig that it was a good idea to send the shadows, as he suggested. Ludwig thanks the king and adds that once everyone is dead, he will eliminate the other nobles one by one and make the empire his sole possession. He also states that he hopes those young people who went to the palace to take control will die there as well. Finally, the emperor comments that the mage of the cold fire will not die so easily. He agrees and adds that the emperor must die so that he can have full control over the imperial magic tower. They observe and notice the presence of children, commenting that they will need to take care of them before dealing with the bastard of Valencia. The fox asks if the king really wants the emperor dead, and he confirms. The fox then explains that it will be impossible unless they deal with the emperor's staff. The king, curious, questions whether the staff is just a decorative ornament. The fox responds that it's pathetic to think so. He comments that although the emperor doesn't know how to do magic properly and hasn't learned fencing properly because of the Duke of Valencia, he is well protected by several artifacts. The king, positioning himself in front of the table, admits that against someone like him, all these artifacts are just trash, except for the staff, which is a special artifact capable of nullifying the mana of any mage in the tower, including his own. He then asks if there is any way to bypass this defense. At this moment, the king's knights appear and warn him about demons in his chamber. He asks, incredulously, if even in his own room, and calls them useless. Visibly agitated, the king questions what they are doing, unable to protect his palace. His brother comments that the presence of magic in his room could be the cause, explaining that they could easily deal with low-class mages, but they would need the king's artifact to be effective. He asks the king if he could provide an artifact. The king considers the possibility of the staff and, irritated, orders him to deal with the demons immediately, calling him an idiot and useless. The brother gives him a malicious look and mutters that the king is more knave than he thought. Meanwhile, the princess, the prince, and her father observe the scene, waiting for an attack. The shadow demons approach, and the old man is surprised, asking how they are still alive. Without hesitation, Vivian begins to attack, even though the old man tries to stop her, warning that it's dangerous. Still, she continues. The shadow ninjas don't retreat and counterattack. Tiny comments that common attacks are ineffective against them, but his mana is being suppressed. The prince speculates that the queen must be involved and that she altered the flow of the imperial barrier, which probably disturbed the demons. He realizes that these beings are not demon worshippers, but rather special guard units of his father, who seem focused on a single target. He deduces that they are coming from the center of the palace, where his father's office is located. The old man calls Tiny and asks him to go save the emperor. Tiny starts to protest, but the old man interrupts him, saying that what they need is a reason, and this is the only way to justify eliminating the Imperial Knights. Tiny looks at the old man and promises to return soon, asking him not to die. As Tiny leaves, he reflects that if his friend goes now, Ixalan will arrive first. One of the guards realizes that the plan is working and questions whether the demon worshippers are after the emperor as well. He calls to his companions, and hearing someone ask for permission and saying they are lost, he turns to see who it is. The emperor comments that there are still flaws in his magic, and that the staff is not sufficiently distant. He questions whether he is being impatient, as, because of that foolish queen, he used too much mana to alter the flow of the barrier. In a satisfied tone, he says that he doesn't care, as the young man who took the staff works for him anyway. The king, listening, sarcastically asks if he is a demon worshipper. The emperor is offended, asking if he really looks like one of those trash. He continues, saying that the king is just a pig whose only skill is shouting, while he, as the true heir of Isran, is merely taking his rightful place. The emperor accuses the king of being born rich only to occupy the throne, and says that despite being incompetent, it would have been more peaceful for the king if he had died earlier. He asserts that now the king will die in pain, a victim of his dependence on artifacts. With a malicious look, he finishes by saying that the emperor will perish due to the attacks from the demon worshippers, and he will then be the next emperor. Thus, finally, things will return to their rightful place. Suddenly, Tiny appears, destroying everything around him, and accuses the king's brother of being responsible for the accident in the imperial palace hall. The emperor looks at him and, intrigued, asks who he is, admitting that he has never seen him before. Tiny responds to the mage with sarcasm, saying that it's none of his business. The mage then casts fire in his direction, calling him an arrogant brat. He asks who he thinks he is and comments that Tiny entered the place too confidently. He says that Tiny is not what he expected. Enraged, the mage leaps and, looking up, sees something breaking above him. He falls to the ground, gets up, and calls the mage, at the very least, a sixth circle mage. He questions how the mage is still able to use magic without chanting any spell. Tiny observes and dodges the magic from the king's brother. The mage comments that Tiny's speed is impressive, that he can feel his mana flow, and concludes that Tiny is using excessive mana, which is leaking from the imperial barrier. Tiny then realizes that it is possible to predict the mage's attacks. He says he can do it, and then uses his gravity manipulation power. He applies the reversal of development and transformation of gravity, saying, "Here it goes." The king's brother calls him a cursed rat, but Tiny can feel a mage's energy. The king's brother releases his power and says, "Forward, down, up." Tiny responds that first it would be down and then up. The mage believes he has killed him and mocks him, saying that Tiny should have chosen the right opponent. He turns, grumbling that he is in the middle of something important for the empire. Tiny, hidden, observes the mage and realizes that if he had been a second late pulling his body downward with gravity, he would have been crushed. Fortunately, the mage lowered his guard. Tiny sees this as his chance and then attacks, jumping over him with his axe. The mage leans back, looking up, and realizes that Tiny is still not dead. He then releases a lightning bolt, destroying everything around him, and calls Tiny a persistent, filthy bastard. The mage looks at the king and contemplates that he can no longer waste time. He says that he needs to finish this as quickly as possible and orders Tiny to die soon. Tiny, crouched on the ground, asks if the mage thinks he could survive this attack. He observes the power radiating when someone interrupts them, apologizing for being late. He says that the path to the Arson Palace is complicated. To his surprise, Tiny sees that it is the Master of Arms and asks what the Alliance sword is doing there. Tiny asks why it took him so long, and the Master apologizes again, saying it wasn't very courteous of him. He adds that, in any case, he doesn't expect the opponent to be the blue-blooded mage. Tiny asks if the Master doesn't know who he is, and the Master confirms that it is the first time he has seen him. The Master then says something ironic, stating that if this is their first meeting, he wouldn't mind if the mage were killed. Startled, the mage says that this is interference in internal matters and reveals his name. He threatens that if he retreats now, he will be willing to overlook the situation. The Master responds sarcastically, saying, calling this internal matters, after tying up the Emperor like this, who brags to someone from an opposing faction about having an internal conflict. He asks hostilely, and the mage stammers, answering, "This here?" The Master then says that it's better this way anyway. They attack the mage, and the Master says that he would be perfect for the role of the Emperor's assassin. The chief attacks, seeing that the mage casts flames against him, and complains that there is a limit to how much someone can underestimate him. He looks at Grid and tells him to look back, continuing to attack and asking if the wizard calls this magic. He gently replies that it is just a distraction. The master watches the wizard's magic, which attempts a trap. Tiny interrupts, trying to stop the wizard with his spear. The wizard backs away, curses, and throws magic at Tiny. He falls to the ground, but the wizard smiles as the knight gets up and takes his position to attack again. The wizard tells Tiny to leave and throws him away with his power, saying that he must die. Tiny attacks him again, and the wizard calls him annoying. They continue to fight. The mage says that was the knight's last move, calling him predictable. Tiny smiles and says no, he will attack with the knight, asking if the mage really fell for that. The mage is confused, and then the place explodes. The king starts coughing, worried, and asks where his brother went, if he had died. The knights respond that yes, he died, unless his legs moved on their own. The king, angry, calls his brother a traitor and a bastard even after his death. He looks at the body and asks how someone like him dares to try to take the throne. He says that there are already too many sons of bitches around him, like his brother, and questions if his brother thought he wouldn't be able to do something about it. Tiny and the knight continue to watch the king, who keeps cursing. The king then concludes that, in the end, his brother deserved that. Looking at Grid Van Sheldon and the knight, who he didn't know, the king says that it was great work and that he will reward them greatly. The knight smiles and says that he doesn't need a reward, that he just came to do a favor for his friend, a Duke of Valencia, to save him. He is surprised to hear who the friend is. Questioning, the king asks who he thinks he is and who he thinks he is to want to save him. He continues to say that he is the emperor and the ruler of this country and keeps complaining. The knight and Tiny are left observing, not understanding. The king then asks if Tiny is one of them, and Tiny replies, "What?" The king continues, saying that Valencia, that son of a bitch, is behind this, and that he must be working for those demon worshippers, trying to take his throne. He questions if Tiny and the knight think they can make a fool of him. The knight asks the king if he is alright. Agitated, the king asks him to remove his hands immediately, saying that he is destined to be the ruler and doesn't need any help. The knight asks him to wait a little longer, and then says, "That alliance will be mine too." He continues, "I, Grid Van Sheldon, as the heir of the main lineage of the alliance and a descendant of the ancient fairies, cannot just ignore what I just heard. You can consider this a declaration of war." Tiny says that everything is fine and that the old man will take care of the rest of the things. He says that he is just a guest from a foreign land now, and anyway, congratulates Tiny on the work, calling him knight. Tiny is surprised to notice that the knight had used honorific titles with him. Leaving, the knight says that it is not his concern what will happen next. Tiny responds that somehow he feels like he has been recognized. Leading forward, the king says that the prince's escort and his son should be here. The young man thanks Tiny and says that from now on, he will take the lead. Tiny thanks him, and before leaving, the young man calls him knight and asks his name. Tiny responds, saying that his name is Tiny from the Valencia family. The king gets furious upon hearing the name Valencia and orders him to leave. Tiny says that he has a bad feeling about the situation, as he does not know what the king plans to do. The lunar wolf appears, leaving together with the boy. Then the guard looks at the body of the deceased mage and asks how this happened. The king calls him and says that he has something to tell him. The guard approaches, and continuing his gaze, the king names him as the leader of the Imperial Cavalry, giving him his first mission. Do not let that Valencia knight leave there alive. Kill him. The guard says that being the leader of the Imperial Cavalry is too much for him and points out that the king barely knows his name. The king agrees and asks what his name is. The guard tells the others to grab him, and they seize the king, asking what they are doing. The guard asks them to release him and questions if they are demon worshippers. The guard, looking at the king, announces his name, Vincent Van Isran, the Dethroned. He asks the king to pay attention. They surround the king and rebuke him, saying that he caused chaos in the country because of personal feelings. In a ridiculous delusion, he had planned a war and put the country in danger. The king continues begging to be released, asking if they have any idea what they are doing. They then say that, as punishment for his sin, he will take the borrowed name of Bradley Van Isran, the new emperor, to give the death sentence to Vincent Van Isran, the sinner. The king asks to be freed and says he will speak with the prince personally. His head is simply chopped off. In the next chapter, the prince and the guard appear. He asks if the problem has been resolved. The guard answers, calling him Your Majesty. The prince then asks if he made the right decision. The guard says yes and adds that the dethroned emperor was preparing a desperate war. The prince comments on the previous days, saying that thanks to his knights Ginus and his father-in-law, they were able to keep close safe. However, he observed the strength of his father's shadow troops. After he died, what happened to make peace with him? The guard continues, saying that when he arrived, the Valencia family's knights, the Duke of Valencia and the Master of Arms who arrived later, wiped them all out. The prince interrupts and asks if the entire shadow troop was destroyed. The guard says thankfully yes. The next leader, second in command of the shadow troops, went on another mission, so they are still alive. They follow an absolute rule that they must obey only the official emperor, so they said they would act after his coronation. With more questions, the prince now asks about Karsha and Gruel. He continues, saying that they were dealt with right after the rebellion was suppressed. The prince looks at him shocked and asks if he found Tinel, who who had disappeared. He replies that yes, right after the rebellion, Gruel kidnapped Tino and kept him captive. The prince questions why this happened. Well, regarding that, they said that Prince Tino was Gruel and Queen Karsha's child. The goal of these people was to start a coup and make Prince Tino the next emperor. The prince puts his hands over his head and says that betrayal wasn't enough, and now a coup. He asks what they should do and that he will have to handle things as emperor. Announcing then, he says that they will have to execute Karsha and Gruel. The guard asks if he is alright with that, as the second prince, Lot, would be totally against the execution of his biological mother, Karsha. The prince responds that they cannot leave even a seed of discord and that Lot will understand. He then asks, what should we do with Prince Tenno? The prince begins to say that he was the result of adultery and that despite that, he is still his brother and he will live with them. The guard agrees and asks the prince to gather the others for a meeting. Looking out a nearby window, the prince says that he would like to reward the main figure in this event, and that this reward would be very different from any ordinary reward. Tiny enters to speak with the prince and asks for something more as a reward. The prince asks what it would be and says that maybe Tiny doesn't realize what a transcendental weapon is. Tiny claims to know and even says that he has had one in his past life. He finishes by saying that the weapon has strange characteristics, and since it is rare, he thinks that the Nocturne, which he will soon acquire, would be enough for him. However, that is not what he wants. He has a request to make. The prince asks him to continue. Tiny asks for the descendant of the Morse family, beneath the imperial family, to be freed. Interrupting, the guard catches the attention of His Majesty and whispers that she is the next leader of the Shadow Troops, the one he had mentioned earlier. The king listens attentively and says, all right. His Majesty says he cannot guarantee that request, at least not at the moment, because there is something he needs to do first. However, he promises to guarantee the freedom of the Morse family within 6 months. Tiny thanks the prince. Before leaving, the prince tells him that if he only gave that as a reward, he could not be considered emperor. If he left things as they are, he would not be worthy of the crown. Then he asks Tiny to choose any transcendental weapon from the imperial palace. However, he warns that it would not be something Tiny could have just because he allowed it. The mage enters and says that it is a pleasure to meet him, asking if he is the Radiant Knight. Tiny answers that yes and asks if he is the mage of cold fire. The mage replies that it is more than a pleasure to meet someone from a pillar of the magic tower and that he can call him Tiny. Smiling, the mage says that Tiny is more polite than he imagined. Then the mage says that he will guide him to the stock as per the emperor's orders and asks Tiny to follow him. Observing the environment, Tiny says that this is far from just a mere treasure warehouse. Among the many stocks and guards, he says this is, and continues saying that the place was truly vast. He mentions that he had never been there in his past life, so he was a bit excited. He says that this place is incredible. The mage responds that he warned him and that it is still early to be surprised. And it's not just that, but surely this place has something to do with the power of the soul. Perhaps it is the power Tiny needs to become a master of the aura. The mage continues showing the place and the object, saying that there is a transcendental weapon here. However, since Tiny hasn't reached the superhuman level, the weapons he has gathered require other conditions. Tiny looks thoughtfully and the mage asks him not to take too long, saying that he can touch the weapons and examine them up close. Tiny then approaches the boots. The mage says that they are only for those who had reached the blader level before the proper age. He explains that 3 wind magic circles are always applied, and there is an effect that allows 7 magic circles to be used once a week. In short, this makes the person faster. The mage gives a summary and explains the ability. Tiny had reached the blader level, but was already past the age, so he couldn't use that item. He says he is only 14 years old, and the mage is surprised to hear his age, asking if he really wants to take that item. Tiny answers that he likes the item, but he would like to look at the others as well. He asks what that bracelet is. The mage explains that the bracelet can only be worn by a girl with advanced third circle magic, who is still a minor. Looking at the bracelet, Tiny asks who the pervert was that put such a condition. The mage explains the characteristics of the item, and Tiny, at the end of the explanation, apologizes for calling him a pervert. He asks the mage why he took that item, as he definitely didn't seem like a girl. Finally, the mage talks about the last item, saying he took it by chance. He says the condition of this item is quite enigmatic. Tiny asks what the riddle is. Hearing what he wanted, the mage smiles and says, this item has the power of the soul, the person who controls the soul. Tiny says that is exactly what he wanted and that he will take it. The mage asks him to wait and questions if he knows what the item's effect is. Tiny holds the object, and as soon as he touches it, it rises. The mage is surprised, simply watching, and asks how he managed to do that. The armor had changed shape. Tiny smiles and asks the mage what the armor's ability is. The mage explains that it works proportionally to the elementalist's level. The user's body, spirit, and soul strength increase. Tiny asks what the name of the armor is. The mage answers that it is the Animus spiritual armor. Then, leaving the palace, the old man asks Tiny if he met with the crown prince. Tiny asks if he was waiting. The old man observes and says that Tiny got a new armor. Tiny confirms and says that the armor is a transcendental weapon. The old man smiles, saying that Tiny was lucky to get a transcendental weapon that suits him. Tiny agrees agrees and gets into the carriage. As they travel, Tiny comments that it was an unexpected fortune. The old man says that Grid told him what happened and asks if it was the blue-blooded mage who started the disaster. Tiny confirms and says that it was indeed the case. He comments that it was a good decision to involve Grid quickly. Tiny looks at the old man and says he would have died if not for him. The old man agrees, saying that it was indeed good. Tiny then asks if Grid only said that. The old man asks what Tiny means by that. Tiny looks at him and says that he will have to tell about the dead emperor on his own. He asks the old man to stop and says that he shouldn't know so much, being a vassal of the emperor, especially when it comes to challenging a superior. The less he knows, the better. Tiny listens in silence, but after a while he speaks about those bastards who used the powers of the shadows. They were assassins sent by the damned emperor. He asks if the old man knew about this. The old man replies that the crown prince informed him. Tiny comments that this wouldn't be good for them, as the emperor who was after them is dead, and they know the weaknesses of the new emperor. He contemplates that this wasn't something a mere vassal of the empire should do. Tiny asks if the old man will do whatever the emperor commands. The old man gets agitated and starts speaking, saying that the emperor tried to start a war. He asks if Grid didn't tell the old man this. The old man is shocked, asking if Tiny would still follow him, and if this was the reason he couldn't draw his sword, even if his own daughter was in danger. He adds that the man Tiny met in his past life would have acted differently. Reprimanding him, the old man responds harshly, saying that even if an innocent man were in danger, he would have acted for the greater good. That's what someone who wants to save the world would do. Tiny responds that it is not him who says this, but that it was the old man himself who said it in his past life. They were able to reach the king of gluttonous monsters after sacrificing 3 of the best knights, using them as bait. The old man retorts, saying that the plan was his and that everyone followed him. Tiny continues, saying that at that moment, to reach the goal, the old man was someone who could measure what was most important, and that was exactly why everyone, including him, trusted him. With his head lowered, the old man continues, asking if he had really sacrificed innocents. Tiny responds that as far as he knows, no. Confused, the old man says that Tiny had said that if that had happened, he would have to accept death as a form of forgiveness, even if afterward the goal was achieved, and that after having believed in him, he thought he would be much more prepared, but he believes his mind is still not ready, so he decides to change. If necessary, he will stay quiet and grumble, saying that this is all he could say at the moment. Tiny responds that this is more than enough. The princess encounters a mysterious figure and asks who he is. Surprisingly, it is Chloe's brother, as it had been a while since they last saw each other. He reminds her that she saw him at her ceremony. She screams and says she was too busy to pay attention and look properly. Chloe then starts crying, lamenting, saying that Tiny was just a small, cute child. Vivian asks why she had run so much and is surprised to see Tiny, but upon seeing such a cute child, she wonders how he could have changed so much. She looks down and sees the lunar wolf, which seems quite small. Tiny smiles, asking if he has changed a lot. Distracted, she gets bitten by the lunar wolf while holding it. The old man asks what's wrong and what's going on with her. He says he isn't sure. In the next scene, a knight is having a conversation and says that the person was right. He had acted boldly and that the alliance would be in his hands. He says that he himself would have killed the responsible one. The old man, kneeling at his feet, argues that he knew they would do something, but that had he been aware of the situation earlier, he would have tried to resolve it differently. Had you been aware? Asked the knight, completing his sentence by saying that the old man would have only wasted time dealing with a sick and elderly emperor. The old man is confused. Then the knight explains that the disasters Tiny had told him about, he said he would help prevent. The current emperor announced that the previous one was killed by demon worshippers and that the empire was risking spreading chaos throughout the country to recognize the threat of demon worshippers. The knight reflects and observes that this wouldn't have been possible if the previous emperor had been alive, and that this was the best outcome he could have obtained in any scenario. He finishes by saying that he and the emperor shared many similar traits, as neither could differentiate what should truly be done from what were merely personal feelings. Entering the palace, the knight turns to the old man, who was wearing a hood to avoid being recognized, and asks if he was looking for him. The old man replies that he was, and that he was probably the right person for the job. The knight subtly mentions that surveying lands wasn't something new to him, but it would be his first time doing so while wearing this kind of attire. He finishes by saying he is curious about the honest reactions of the people, and asks the old man to speak with them as well. Knight Garen asks who the mysterious person is. The old man, with a mysterious tone, mentions that it has been some time and smiles, saying it is Tiny. Garen is surprised and asks if, after being away for a while, Tiny has already gone through such a change. Tiny replies that yes, he recently had to grow his body, rapidly increasing his size with the mana technique. The young boy announces that he already knew this and says that he wasn't ordinary, especially after fighting Drexler. His face looks more mature, and he looks great. Interrupting the conversation, the old man calls Tiny to leave, and the young boy predicts that he is fine. Rumors begin to spread throughout the city. The gossip talks about the emperor who was killed by Ludwig, and they say he allied himself with demon worshippers. People wonder if those worshippers have such power and what will happen to the emperor empire from now on. Walking through the village, observing the rumors, they notice that after the announcement of the current emperor, more and more people are becoming fearful. This happens because being attacked in the city that prides itself on being the strongest, and the emperor dying at the hands of demon worshippers, leads to the belief that no one is safe from them, anywhere. They realize that Knight Garen only knows what has been publicly announced, but somehow, with the Syrian Ecliptica at the center, the state of alert about the demon worshippers is being spread. The current emperor plans to announce the bomb as well. Thus, other forces of the empire will soon receive the news. The old man argues that if the identity of the true culprit is known, it will be harder for them to act. Since the empire is still strong and firm, perhaps they could mediate the other four forces they have. What they've achieved this time is extremely important. The Duke smiles and says that Tiny did very well. Tiny looks at him, making a face, and the old man says he should control his facial expressions. Tiny then says that it is an honor to receive compliments from him. Everyone looks at Tiny, asking if he wasn't the Radiant Knight who killed the traitor, and they heard rumors that he saved a country in Karun. They also ask if the man beside him is the Duke of Valencia. They continue observing the rumors. The Duke tells Tiny that he has become quite famous, so he must be from the Morse family too. They laugh and he says that's true, but at this pace it would be hard to talk to them, and they suggest going to another place. Considering it might be madness as people would think he's also a Morse, the Duke asks what the problem is, since that family is a semi-noble one that has already disappeared, so it wouldn't matter much, right? Tiny smiles and says that it matters a lot. The Duke then wonders when Tiny became so famous. Tiny replies that it must have been when the new emperor took the throne, as he announced to the entire country that Tiny did most of the work to save Karun and the Asian family. The Duke asks why, and Tiny replies that he doesn't know. The Duke says it's better that way. He asks how, and the Duke explains that Tiny must go to Elfheim soon, and it would be better for him to be famous to face those stubborn elves. Tiny's friend asks if there's any reason to send him to Elfheim. The Duke hesitates but says it's because of the demon worshippers who are after the sacred object, and Tiny needs to go to convince them to protect it. Finding a solution, he says that they wouldn't need to involve Knight Tiny since he has a friend in Elfheim. The Duke and Tiny look at him surprised. The Duke asks him if he really has an elf friend there. He explains that when he went to the lands of Rodman to kill a monster, he met someone who was going to Elfheim and they became friends. Tiny asks how, and he replies that it just happened. With a doubtful look, Tiny says he wouldn't say they were friends the first time they met. The boy says that's exactly what happened. Tiny is surprised and says, "What?" The boy continues to explain that they had a long conversation before that, but in short, that's how they became friends. Tiny says he really doesn't understand. The boy smiles and says that people quickly become friends when they speak from the heart. He says he's outraged that even the Duke doesn't believe him. Extending his hand, he shows the symbol left by that elf friend. They look at it and say it looks real. The Duke asks Garen to accompany Tiny. Garen smiles and says he understands. He says he doesn't know if he will help with anything, but he sent Jay ahead. So when Tiny arrives, he should look for Jay first. They agree. Two hooded men start talking, asking if the Blue Fox and Ludwig had really died. The other person answers that yes, and that's how the Emperor died, and that the Crown Prince had taken the throne. He calls Ludwig an idiot, saying that after arrogantly claiming he would handle things because of that Dan Morse, he wonders how Ludwig could have known their plans, and they ask if there could be a Dragon Eye spy among them. Gutter answers no, because if that were the case, the Emperor wouldn't have died. Then he asks, "Hero, does that mean he's blessed by the goddess?" The other explains that the administrators of the imperfect world started the worldwide demon war and created another hero. He then says there are no explanations. The other asks if he remembers the story told by Malum. He says yes, it was clear. The administrator could only see the predetermined fate of the imperfect world, and by interfering too much, the world changed and deviated from its fate, breaking the dimensional boundaries. The true owners will be arriving sooner than they should have. For the world that lost its cycle will be destroyed sooner than it should have. The other agrees and says that the being called the goddess once altered the world's fate, which repeats in destruction and creation, creating a hero and bringing demons to the world. Those damn fools who believe in the goddess think they will win, when in reality, a supposed trace showing they won had been left when they created the demon station and the great labyrinth. However, if a new hero has been chosen now, the end of the world is much closer and their dream of becoming reality will come sooner. But there is still a possibility of a spy, and they consider testing the idea. He asks test how. Well, they had originally planned to act at Elfheim after the Empire, but the letter they had in mind, Elaine, had died. So they will change their plans to an alliance with the orcs, where they will have another card prepared. If he goes to Elfheim, he should be the hero. But if he goes to the orc city, that would mean there is still a spy. But if he goes to Elfheim, his friend should take care of it on his own. He agrees and says it's for the new world. If he really is the hero, he won't take responsibility by saying he's part of the Oracle, but he will kill him. However, if he goes to Batten, they would need to investigate properly, and he asks, where would those damn fools go now? Tiny and his friends say they are almost there, and those were the orc planes. They increase the speed of their horses and ask to go faster. Soon the demon appears, saying that it wasn't enough against him and says, goodbye, Tiny. Tiny falls and says he traveled back in time again. He sees the lunar wolf biting his leg and watches it. The wolf begins to howl, It's a full moon night and the sky is full of stars. Tiny smiles and asks it to have fun. He then says that it's been a long time since he started this adventure with Tiny and that many things have happened since then. After losing all of his allies to the Demon King of Gluttony, who destroyed the world, Tiny was able to travel back to his past with the help of the leaders of the 10 greatest knights. But he arrived a bit too late. His sister, Arbina, had died. Soon after avenging Wolf for his sister's death, Tiny made a contract with him, sealed in Wolf's body. After dealing with Lord Files, the Baron of Files, and the demon worshippers, Tiny left that place. But by coincidence, he met Asgard's daughter, Chloe. He needed her help to find Asgard, and fortunately, they managed to go with her. While they were together, they were ambushed by an elf who worked for the Baron, and in the end, they were able to defeat her after an intense battle. But after that incident, Elaine died. They then attracted the attention of the elders of the demon worshippers, and after finally finding Asgard, Tiny told him about the tragedy that had occurred in his past life and the 7 disasters. Thus, he was trained to be prepared for the disasters, and that's when he gained a weapon at the forge. After finishing his preparations, Tiny went to Karun to prevent the first disaster, but they discovered that things had already started going wrong. After dealing with all those demon worshippers hiding on a ship heading to the city, he was recognized by the king of Karun and was able to prevent the disaster at the palace. After some time, the king introduced the navigator Litman to Tiny, but in reality, he was a beastman, a killer whale. That neglected beastman had been responsible for locking away the missing mage and also for kidnapping the ancestral monster's offspring, Kraken. He planned to use that offspring to lure Kraken and destroy Karun. Well, Tiny dealt with the demon worshippers who tried to steal the sacred object, resolved that misunderstanding with Kraken, and consequently prevented the disaster in Karun. After that, Tiny gained the nickname Shining Knight and grew a lot, but the next disaster was already waiting for him. At that time, Asgard's rival, who would also be his future ally, the weapon master Greed, challenged Asgard to a duel. After Greed lost the battle, he stayed until the wedding was over, as promised, and also received information about the future disasters. But meanwhile, a great conspiracy was being plotted in the Imperial Palace, the Imperial Annihilation. The Queen walked hand in hand with the demon worshippers. The king ordered the secret society Imperial Shadow Troop to kill Asgard, and the demon worshippers tried to divide the Empire into pieces using explosions. While Tiny, who was preparing for the approaching disasters, was ambushed by the members of the Imperial Shadow Troop, Luna Morse, but after pretending to be from the same family as her, he managed to get out of that situation. On the day the disaster occurred, Tiny tried to stop the bombs, but they eventually exploded. Under Asgard's orders, Tiny left to save the king. He then discovered that the Emperor's brother, Ludwig, had cooperated with the demon worshippers, but Tiny wasn't strong enough to fight him alone. So at that moment, Greed appeared like a comet, and they faced him together. Eventually, the king, who had tried to start a war, was executed by the Crown Prince. The rebellion ended with the Empress being imprisoned. After the Crown Prince took the throne, Tiny obtained his transcendent armor, Animus, after stopping the second disaster. Now Tiny is on his way to Elfheim, where the third disaster is about to happen. Tiny then calls out to the Lunar Wolf, warning him that the morning has arrived. Tiny replies that it's fine because he needed his help to enter Elfheim. He thanks him and says that what they need most in this place is caution. Upon spotting the orcs, the friend says that if it were an industry, it could simply pay a toll. But these orcs don't let the free people pass through their territory, so they need to accept a challenge. Tiny smiles and says they will accept the challenge like brave warriors. The friend looks at him and says that from here to the place, they will encounter 3 tribes if they go straight, and if they win the battles, they can get there faster. The Duke and another guy are talking. He says not to question how he simply knows things and acts accordingly. The Duke looks at him and says he will tell them the reason someday and asks him to just support the boy in the meantime. The friend smiles and says that even if he didn't ask, he should keep the secret like a true friend. So the boys ride their horses as fast as possible. The elves begin to attack. The wolf doubles in size, jumping in front of the boys to protect them, and asks Tiny to try swinging the sword harder. Tiny says that the huge sword she holds is actually light and asks if, in his past life, it was also that way. The friend wonders if it's because of the transcendent armor. Despite his size, Tiny's strength and resistance were incomparable. He had advanced recklessly dozens and dozens of times. However, the orc got tired before he did. Tiny continues to call the orc out to fight, mocking her. She says that's enough and calls him an arrogant human. The wolf and the boar face off. He then tells the wolf to advance. The friend asks him not to kill the orc. He says of course he knew that and leaves the woman beside him lying on the ground. Well, even though he had been training a lot, the gap between them was still too large, and that fear wasn't his power but rather the lunar wolf's. He smiles and says the elementalist is almost reaching the next level and that he was really right in choosing Animus. The orc is placed on the boar and taken away. Tiny's friend says that this was a very dangerous thing to do. He apologizes, saying he got excited, and asks if they would now pass through the second tribe. He says that honestly he had never never seen orcs so powerless. Tiny says that he hasn't either, and that it was easier than he expected. He adds that it was a disgrace. Moving forward, the friend asks if they should go straight to the second tribe. Tiny asks to stop in Jammingwood, as it was on the way there. It was the city of the Red Boar they had just defeated. It would take about 2 hours to get there if they headed west from here. The friend asks how he knew that. Tiny laughs and sarcastically replies that he just heard it somewhere, and asks if the friend wants to know. He also mentions that Tiny keeps many secrets. Upon arriving in Jammingwood, they notice that this must be the entrance. The orc dismounts and asks them to stop, saying they didn't seem worthy of passing. The friend says that they had already passed the warrior challenge. They stare at each other, and then the orc asks them to proceed. They thank him and pass through the entrance of the tribe. Making an observation, Tiny says that they didn't seem as friendly as he had expected. The friend adds that it was obvious. They had already had several wars in the past. Well, even though in his past life Tiny, when there was an internal war in the Empire, the orcs came in huge groups to steal things. But the orcs also had a war in their tribe and self-destructed. Elfheim was also a problem, but there were many things he didn't know about the internal war of the orcs, but they were coming, because battles and wars were no longer new to the orcs. The war inside their tribe was something rare, as no species would choose to self-destruct. He calls his friend to see if there is any sign, at least for one day. At that moment, a foot stomped on the ground and someone shouted, "Stop humans." A large orc approached, saying they did not look like merchants. Garen showed the tooth in his hand, saying they had already passed through the warrior's challenge. The orc only looked without saying a word. With a sigh, he told them to enter. And so the two went on while the orcs watched them from afar. Tiny spoke with a lowered face that they did not seem as friendly as he expected. Garen said of course not, they had already fought multiple wars in the past. Tiny thought that even in his past life, when there was a civil war in the Empire, the orcs came in massive groups to steal things. But the orcs also had a war within their own tribe and ended up destroying themselves. Elven was also a problem. But there were many things he did not know about the orcs' internal war that was approaching. Battle and war were nothing new to the orcs, but war within their tribe was indeed something new. No species would choose to self-destruct out of nowhere, so he thought about analyzing the situation a bit. Then he said, "Knight Garen, why don't we spend the day here?" He replied, "If you want, that's fine." Then Tiny even asked if he wasn't going to ask why again. But he said he knew what kind of person he was, he wouldn't do something without reason. And then Tiny only sighed, saying thank you. After that, they were walking through the middle of the orc city. Tiny said it was bigger than he expected. Garen said, "But I thought you had been here before." But he said it was his first time here. He had only heard about the location from a friend. Tiny kept thinking that it was no wonder Jarek boasted about it. If Javenwood was all that, then the capital Badr must be even bigger. Jarek must also be in Badr at this moment. At that time, someone said that things had been very delicate these days. A hairy orc said a man had appeared wearing full body armor, and he asked what he wanted in Javenwood. Tiny stepped forward, asking if this would be a chief. But Garen said they had just passed through the warrior's challenge. The guy even came closer, asking if they did that with such a small body. Garen stepped forward, saying that Knight Tiny was small compared to the orcs, but he was one of the greatest geniuses of the Empire, so it was not a shameful battle for his warriors. But then the orc placed his hammer on his head and said, "Then you can come here and show me what you've got, little boy." At that moment, another orc was alarmed, calling out to the chief, because now was not the time for that. But Tiny was already grinning from ear to ear, saying, "Let's clash blades." And then the orc also smiled just like him, while everyone else behind them looked terrified. Tiny said that they also had a schedule to follow, so they couldn't take too long with this. At that moment, the hairy orc was pleased and said something in the orc language to them. And as soon as he finished, he told Tiny to follow because he himself would guide him there. He kept speaking something in the orc tongue that they didn't understand, and he told Tiny that many people had gathered, and he asked if he was fine with that. Tiny said it didn't matter to him, but he was concerned it might be a bit rude. The hairy one asked, rude about what? But what he wanted to know was if he could beat up this hairy one like a doll in front of his own people. Then the orc took off his shirt, saying that orcs take anything related to battle as honor, so he shouldn't worry. Tiny did the same, saying that then he wouldn't refuse. He was already cheerful, while the man stood there, mouth open, because he had a transcendental weapon. But he said that meant the rumors were true. Tiny replied, saying, "So you recognized me before coming to speak with me?" He said yes, but that he was a little disappointed. He couldn't believe the Shining Knight was just a swordsman. But Tiny smiled, catching what he tossed to him, saying that he didn't believe a class decided the outcome of a battle. The guy held the same bone hammer in his hands and said he liked that answer. So now he wouldn't have to prove his worth, and then the guy charged at Tiny like a madman. Our brave one struck back, happy to do so. The two clashed their weapons in the middle of battle, while Tiny felt the immense pressure of the blow. Both of them were thrown back. The guy was shocked, while Tiny managed to land on the ground. He thought he was clearly different. This chief was also stronger than he expected, but he was far more excited because it had been a long time since he felt like this. It was as if he had gone back to the past. Then the orc chief moved his feet and came at him with his hammer. He slammed down directly against Tiny, who was trying to defend himself. The weapons clashed, trembling from the impact, but the more it went on, the more Tiny kept smiling. He remembered his past life when he fought an orc the same way, because he wanted to discover once again how far his brute strength could take him. And then the two separated again. He thought that this was the orc's mana method, the tribal tattoo. The man asked why he wasn't using his transcendental armor, but Tiny smiled, saying this would be more than enough. Then he charged forward, his body covered in a red aura, telling Tiny not to disappoint him. But even with vampire-like teeth, Tiny said he could have high expectations, and so the two clashed hammers. Garen even raised his hand to his face because of the wind spreading, saying they were going too far. At that moment, the chief was contesting strength with Tiny. He roared and roared, putting force into his axe. But Tiny defended, thinking this was very exciting. He was exactly like Jarek. Then he thought of greater power, more strength, and then he understood. That was it. Then suddenly he began to crack the orc's weapon. He poured all of his strength into that moment until both axes broke in half. At that moment, a massive gust of wind spread while the orc stood there, still shocked by it. Even Garen's hair was blown down the street corner. While the orc was smiling, saying without a doubt he was confident, Tiny said the same to him. But then the man raised his hand and said, "Well, that's enough to confirm the rumors. Now I can be honest with you." And then he told Tiny to follow him because they should talk elsewhere. Tiny just went while the orc's arm the size of his head was slung across his neck. Later, a big plate of meat was on the table, and the orc told them to eat as much as they wanted. "We fought hard, so let's eat." When Garen said thank you to him, Tiny was already devouring all the food, saying it was very tasty. The orc chief said he was eating very well, while Garen wondered if he was a human or an orc eating. But the chief told them to listen while they ate. There was a reason he'd have brought them there, and he asked if they were close to the new emperor. Tiny thought he couldn't say they were personally close, but there was one time when he ended up slapping the new emperor in the face. The orc laughed, saying that seemed enough for him, because who would dare do that to the emperor if they weren't close to him? Then he said, "Shining Knight Tiny Morse, answer me honestly. Is the empire preparing for a war?" Garen asked the chief what he was talking about. Meanwhile, Tiny asked what made him think that. But there are fights happening in orc lands right now. Chief Nergu of the Black Rhinoceros species is preparing for war, defending the unity of the orcs. Tiny asked if war wasn't common for the orcs. The chief said yes, but not if there was a human at their side, forcing them to start a war. Then he asked if those people were from the Empire. Tiny remembered the Emperor's face saying, "Just wait a little longer, and this alliance will be mine." That's why he thought this could be the work of the last emperor. Tiny said he would put his honor on the table to say this, that the Empire would never do such a thing. Garen said, "Tiny, you can't say things like that with such certainty." The orc showed no expression until the next moment when he said, "Okay, I'll believe you." Garen asked, "Chief?" And while the orc said that the tongue could be cunning, the fists were honest. Then he began to stand, saying that the battle he had with him was a real man's duel, so he would give a little of his honor, saying he believed him. Tiny only thanked him, and the two bumped fists, saying for friendship in the orc tongue. The man even asked him, "You know our language?" "Ah, I have a friend there who knew it." Meanwhile, Garen was crying, saying, "I knew it. I knew that true brotherhood could surpass species barriers." Now the next day, someone arrived saying they had heard he was going to Elvam. That orc woman from the beginning, the one he had defeated, said she would guide him to the edge of the great forest. Garen even asked, "Aren't you the orc who lost to Tiny a few days ago?" But she just told him to shut up because he didn't need to say that. She was Narn, the lead scout of the Red Boar tribe, and she would join him until the great forest. Garen said they hadn't yet finished the warrior challenges, but she said it didn't matter because the tribe was close to the orcs there. Tiny was surprised, asking if that was really possible. But she said that Chief Batar was the best warrior and leader. He taught that killing without necessity should be avoided. She also followed him and learned the common language, and their tribe was able to prosper. While she said these things, Tiny thought it was a bit strange. He had seen refugees from Jamin Wood in his past life, but he had never heard the name Batar. So could it be that Batar died before the day of the disaster? Then he asked Narn if there was perhaps some way to send a message to the Empire. Garen asked Tiny why he would want to do that, but Tiny said he had to warn Valentia about the changes in the orc tribes. This was very important, but Garen told him not to worry about it because he had already told a friend in Jamin Wood to send a message about the conversation they had with the chief. In truth, he was a little worried about saying such a thing, but in the end that wasn't exactly what Tiny wanted to say. Still, Garen continued, saying that the orcs couldn't use ancient magic to communicate through sorcery, but that friend would personally go to deliver the news. Tiny asked, "But since when do you have an orc friend?" But he said only recently. He confirmed that yes, from the stadium. The duration doesn't matter in friendship. That guy is trustworthy, and if you can't trust him, trust his will. And so the three returned to the road again. Now arriving at the next tribe, they were speaking in the orc language. Narn was up ahead, talking to them while Tiny and Garen only observed. At that moment, he raised his club and spoke to the travelers going to the great forest. He confirmed, saying they were friends of the Red Boar tribe, so they could pass. They only thanked him until from behind, someone called out to them. Looking back, it was an orc pounding his club on the ground, saying he had heard that a knight mounted on a wolf spirit had prevented disaster and was passing through the pastures. And he asked if perhaps that would be Tiny, the little human, though it was really pushing it to call Tiny little. Narn came forward angrily, saying she had just said they were friends of the Red Boar tribe, and asked why he was stopping them now. The other orcs said he wasn't trying to stop them, he just wanted to get help. He said they needed their wisdom, since he had lived long enough to become a spirit. Tiny asked if the brother meant his wolf. The man confirmed that yes. Then he wanted to know if it was a wolf that had grown weak with age, while he really was much smaller and quite thin for such a wolf. But at that moment, Tiny's face went pale and our Moonwolf ran off. Tiny looked, not understanding anything, while the Moonwolf was digging something in the ground. The orc grabbed it in his hand, astonished because this wasn't Karen grass. It was only a bitter herb to them, and he asked if that was how he ended up becoming a spirit. Tiny said no, and it would prolong his life. Then the orc said, "Thank you very much. I am grateful to you, little human." While Tiny got pissed off at being called little, he squeezed his hand, telling him his name. And as a candidate for chief of the Dreadwolf tribe, he made him a promise. By his honor, if he ever came to him, he would do everything he could to help in any matter. Tiny walked away happily, thinking about the honor and the Dreadwolf tribe because it reminded him of Jarek. So he wondered what that lunatic must be doing now. Well, they would find out soon, as 5 days later they were in the Great Forest. Garen was impressed because they had actually made it in 2 weeks. Tiny thanked for the help, while she wished them good luck. And so they finally said their goodbyes. Tiny looked focused because at last they were in the Great Forest. Garen asked if he had ever been here before. Tiny said no, while Garen just watched him speak. He said the Great Forest was a place where elves and ancient beasts lived. It was a place called the Shield of the Continent, which prevented pollution from the demonic region. Everything from the demonic region in the west up to the Great Forest was a trace left by the Great War against the ancient demon king. He had heard that there was a great labyrinth in the depths of the demonic region, but no one knew what was inside. Tiny only thought briefly that one day he should go to the labyrinth as well, because he had found Nocturne, his weapon in his past life, inside the Great Labyrinth. But if he went now, it was very likely he wouldn't survive. So he thought he had to go another time. At that moment, Garen called him, saying he wouldn't ask about his secret as a companion, but he wanted to help him as a friend. Then he asked what the mission was for. Tiny only thought and said that if they failed the mission, the elves' sacred artifact would disappear and the world tree would be set on fire. Garen was incredulous at that, because if the world tree disappeared, the Great Forest would be polluted by evil energy and the world would end. He put his hand on his face, saying that this mission wasn't just about keeping a secret, but something they should risk their lives for. Tiny said that if he wanted to turn back, he could. But at that moment, he vanished from his sight. He took a breath with his course because they couldn't waste time. They needed to go to Elvham as fast as they could, while Tiny was grinning behind him. At that moment, we are in another place within the forest, and someone was running, saying they didn't want to die. A man with a hat and thick eyebrows was running while a paw appeared among the trees. It was a giant monster, and the little man below, running, asked why the end had to appear right now. He ran while cursing that monster until he suddenly stopped and pulled something from his sleeve. Meanwhile, back to Tinny, Garen apologized because they couldn't go any faster than that. He answered that it was fine, he had used mana to run 6 hours straight. Now they were close to the Elf Scout area, so they would have to slow down anyway. Then he said they would rest here. Garen agreed, but without fire because the Great Forest could easily catch fire. Tiny said, of course, what kind of idiot would start a fire here? But at that exact moment, the fool set off an explosion and started a fire. They looked back and heard footsteps running. Tiny didn't understand, and meanwhile, that guy with the eyebrows was running, shouting, "Hey, you two, save me," while that red-eyed monster was chasing after him. But all that was happening, what impressed the two the most was that the man was a dwarf. Then Tiny sat on the Moonwolf, saying that dwarves weren't so rare in the Great Forest, but since he was being hunted by an ent, the situation was not good at all. And then the man came closer again, shouting, "Please help me." But cocky Tiny blocked the young dwarf's run. He tried to ask, "What are you doing?" "I didn't do anything wrong." Tiny answered that he couldn't be sure of that. At the same moment, someone said they had found a human elementalist, and asked what brought a human who wasn't a merchant or a hunter into the Great Forest. When Tiny began to speak, Garen stepped forward, saying he would handle it. He said, "I pray for a favorable wind at your feet, like a bird released from the nest." The woman answered, saying she hoped to see the end of the world and return to finally turn into dust and remain as wisdom. He bowed, saying he was happy to meet the daughter of the world tree. She was surprised because it was unexpected for a human to know the promoter's greeting. As she descended, he said it was all thanks to a friend who was an elf promoter. He showed her this, a symbol of friendship and Harul's hair color. Then he thought an elementalist knight of the wolf and a knight with a symbol of friendship. So she welcomed them to the Great Forest. While Tiny was shocked, she recognized a person by hair color. But the woman turned the other way, glaring, asking about the dwarf. As you can see, they're friends of an elf, and now it's your turn to take responsibility. He shouted, "Forgive me, madam," while kneeling on the ground, saying, "Forgive me, forgive me." Angrily, she said that he had wounded the spirits until even his allies were hurt. He kept saying, "I didn't know." I was only on watch but caused a mess. The dwarf tried to explain, saying that she was well aware of how many monsters appeared in the Great Forest, but that didn't mean he could use an artifact that caused explosions. He defended himself, saying that this was the only equipment he had to protect himself and he had made it himself. But Tiny said it was very suspicious a young dwarf bringing such an artifact into the Great Forest. But when the dwarf looked at him, he was shocked, asking if that was the stamp. Tiny asked what he was talking about, but he said his weapon, asking if it was the stamp, right? He had bought it from his father's shop, Rendu's. Tiny confirmed that he had indeed bought it from Rendu's shop and asked how he knew that. He then introduced himself as Rendu's son, Grandu. He said he was the one who had forged the hammer, and so he begged for help. Garen scratched his head and said, "Excuse us. This is a surprise for us too, but somehow we know him, so please forgive us." Angrily, she said she would let pass only because of the symbol of friendship, but he could no longer use that weapon until leaving the Great Forest. He agreed, saying he only needed to meet someone from Elvham. The angry woman said she would trust for now, while Garen thanked her. At that moment, someone came running, calling for Grandu. 3 people arrived, asking if he was all right. They spoke about an explosion that had surprised everyone and asked if he had gotten into trouble with the elves. He said everything was fine. Fortunately, he had met a traveler who was using a weapon he had forged. The man looked and was surprised, saying the names of the two, Knight Tiny and Knight Garen. They even asked if he knew them. Then Tiny was asking what, but he appeared, saying he was a little sad they didn't remember him. He showed his card and the two already asked, "Is that you, Jay?" After that, Tiny asked if he had created an industry right after what had happened back in Koran. He even asked if Tiny hadn't heard about it before. Then he even remembered what the Duke had said. He had sent Jay ahead so he could help. So Tiny needed to find him first. Tiny asked if they could enter Elvham since they were with the industry. He said they could not, but they could sell things. Elves also like things humans used. Tiny asked if they were here just to sell then, but actually they could see what was happening in their society, and there were also other ways to obtain information. Then Tiny asked if that dwarf belonged to the Black Wings. Jay said they had met them right when they entered the Great Forest. They had heard he was gathering materials to create a supreme weapon, so he couldn't ignore it when he mentioned Rendu's name. At that moment, the dwarf stood up, saying that his dream was to create a weapon greater than the transcendental weapon his people had made. Tiny asked what material from Elvham he needed. He answered that he needed a branch from the World Tree. Then he went wild, asking if he wanted the elves to give him a branch, when their life mission was to protect the World Tree. Grandu said he knew it made no sense, but he couldn't do anything if he gave up. He had to try with everything he could, even if others said it was impossible. Then Tiny said his courage was admirable. Then the dwarf was happy, saying he knew he would help him, while Tiny tried to say he hadn't said anything like that. Grandu said his father had been expelled from their hometown because of him, so he needed to prove that a beardless dwarf could also become a master blacksmith. Tiny apologized to him, and then he turned again, saying, "So will you help me?" Then he sighed, asking if he was just trying to forge a weapon. Right, but if he really wanted to create something, he would be the first on the list to buy it, so he told him to promise that. Grandu was happy, asking if he really promised, but Tiny said it might not succeed, so he shouldn't expect too much. Later, Jay even asked if he was really going to help Grandu, but he said he could only try. He looked up, thinking it was hard to ignore a fool running toward his goal, and that reminded him so much of himself in his past life. 3 days later, Garen said it had taken them a few days, but it was still early for them to plan. Garen turned, saying he imagined they were fine, while Tiny said everything would work out since on their way here they had taken care of all the monsters that had appeared. He paused, thinking that finding Jay had been useful. They had managed to get supplies, and he had sent a message through Jay about the fights in the Orc tribes. Thus, they stood before the gate that was opening. The two waited, and someone said they had been contacted by the scouting team. Then she said, "Welcome, friends of Hyrule." She was the guardian of the wall and said she would guide them through here. She began to walk, telling them to follow and obey her instructions. If they had any business beyond meeting Hyrule, she needed to know that too. And she did all this while holding a sword in her hand. Then Tiny looked suspiciously, wondering what this crazy woman wanted to do. But she added that first she would escort them to the waiting room. Then they walked, and Tiny and Garen were surprised by it, because this was a marvelous building. Tiny looked at it, saying it was no wonder elves grew frustrated living in human-made buildings. Garen asked, "So you have an elf friend too?" He tried to deny it, saying he did, while Garen teased him, asking if he had said it in the past tense. Meanwhile, the woman startled them both, saying the waiting room was over here. She brought 2 cups, saying this was called elf tea by outsiders, but she didn't know if they would like it. Garen simply smiled and thanked her for the kindness, while Tiny sat in his corner, deep in thought. The woman asked if something was bothering him. He retorted, saying she should know why. It had bothered him since the moment they passed through the castle gates, and he asked why she kept touching the hilt of her sword every time she looked at him. She drew her sword and came at him, saying, "The shining knight, the tiny knight who killed our sister Elaine." She also said she had been waiting for the moment when she could cut off his head. With the sword at his neck, Tiny did nothing. And while Garen called out, asking why she was doing that, in Tiny's head he recalled words from the past. That elf had said elves could be crueler than anyone. But that was also one reason elves were wise. They hated acting out of emotion, especially the elves of Elvham. There was always a reason behind their actions. Tiny pushed the sword away, saying she shouldn't have brought them there if she planned to kill him. And he also reminded her that a sword without true murderous intent was just a toy. The woman looked at him, asking what he had said. Meanwhile, Garen said that the incident had also been reported to the central temple, and he asked if she had no contact with the temple. She gripped her sword, trembling, and turned her back, saying she wouldn't treat him differently, just because the temple had vouched for him. She was paying attention because her people had a mission regarding evil energy, and she had heard that he could sense evil energy and discover worshippers, and that was why they needed to test that ability at the Council of Elders. So she hoped the rumor was true. Tiny only turned his head, saying, "Good news. I thought there might be a worshipper among the elders, because if my ability is a fraud, I'll bear the responsibility for it." The woman turned to him angrily, asking how long his confidence would last. But Tiny retorted, saying that either way, he wasn't seeing the Great Spirit, so it seemed that Astinanin wouldn't be joining the Council of Elders this time. The woman turned in surprise, asking if he had already seen Astina. Tiny said no. And then she said that was the elves' concern and not his. Garen then asked if he was planning to meet the guardian of the world tree alone. Tiny said yes, because he thought it was the best option to warn him about the worshippers. Then he asked because maybe his friend should know. Tiny asked if he meant the one called Harul. He said yes, because if the elf promoter returned to Elfhem, he would join the knights who held back monsters in the demonic region. The knights would receive orders from the guardian, so they might know where the guardian was. So he said he would go there and ask him. Now the scene shifted to another place, lit by torches. Someone asked where he was. The man said he was right. He had gone to Elfhem. Then the hooded one laughed, saying he was indeed the hero. He handed him a staff, saying this was an artifact that removed traces of evil energy and unleashed blasts of destructive power. He needed to go there with number 6 and number 7, find him and deal with him perfectly. After a while, Garen arrived, saying he wasn't there. Tiny asked who, but he said it was Harul, that friend he had mentioned, and that all the knights had left. Tiny asked if it was a monster attack, because there were times when monsters left the demonic area at random. He had heard that most of the scouting teams and knights were sent to those areas, and he said those attacks could last up to a month, so they would just wait there. At that moment, that woman returned again, saying, "Knight Tiny, follow me about your test." When he arrived in that room, an elder spoke about the man who prevented disasters, the man called the Hunter of Worshippers' Energy, and also the man who had killed one of their kind, Elaine. Now it was time to test his ability. Tiny looked down, saying he had heard elves were slow with their work, but all the elders were gathered there, so it was as if they had been waiting for him. One of them shouted, calling him arrogant. She said, "Great, this test isn't necessary. There can't be conspiracy in what humanity does." And she confirmed that Elaine could not have been a dark sorcerer. Another complained, saying she was too emotional. The elder was only trying to be rational. The two began to argue, and the elder ordered them to stop, because even among themselves they had different opinions, so they needed to test Tiny's ability. But judging by the way they argued in the common tongue instead of Elvish, they wanted to show that situation. The elder asked if he had accepted the test by coming here. Tiny only confirmed. Then the elder turned, ordering them to be brought in. At that moment, we saw some fangs, and 2 wolves were being brought in a cage. Tiny wondered why the elves had imprisoned those wolves. Meanwhile, the elder said that one of their wolves had been tainted by evil energy. It had killed many other wolves from the escort. Unfortunately, a young elf had also died in that incident. Then he asked if Tiny could tell which wolf had done it. Tiny pointed, saying it was that wolf with the downcast look. The elder asked what made him so certain, but he summoned the Moonwolf, saying it was thanks to the ability of his spirit, with whom he had a contract. Through it, he could sense the evil energy. And the reason the other wolf was so aggressive was because it could smell its companions on the corrupted wolf. The elder said that was more impressive, and yet thought he had recognized the evil energy right away. And after so much investigation, they had barely found anything. But Tiny told him there was something strange. The evil energy this wolf had seemed to have been taught to be hidden. And of course, the one who could have done that was the elf named Elaine. Then that woman who had been complaining started to complain even more. The others told her to calm down, while the elder explained that those wolves were patrol wolves used by the scouting teams. The woman kept shouting, saying that this was the sort of thing only humans did. But the elder shouted at her to be silent. His ability had been proven, so there was no need for further suspicion. She tried to argue back, but the elder glared at her, saying he had already said there would be no more suspicion, and then she had to accept it. The elder called Tiny and asked why this wolf was hiding its evil energy, because in reality it had already been corrupted enough to become a monster, yet it wasn't showing any sign of it. One of them mentioned the tragic incident a few days ago. Didn't that coincide with it trying to hide its energy? The elder said it was because of that incident that they discovered a monster that didn't release evil energy, and so they had sent scouts and knights to investigate the cause in the demonic region. Then the elder asked Tiny how many people knew he was here, and since even the orcs knew he was coming, then probably many. One of them turns, saying that maybe they had known Knight Tiny was coming and caused chaos to escape. The elder asked how they usually dealt with animals that had been corrupted. She said they killed them right away. But Tiny asked about this wolf. The other replied that it had been been the Guardian's idea, and they had spared it to test his ability. The man continued, saying maybe the worshippers hadn't expected them to spare the wolf and show it to Mike Tiny. So what they really wanted was to avoid Tiny and keep as much of the elven military power as far from Elvham as possible. Then one of them shouted that perhaps they were after the World Tree. They needed to gather their military strength immediately. One shouted that they still had an army, and then the elves began bickering, until the elder roared, "Enough children." He turned to Tiny, saying he would only ask one thing. With his ability, was there anyone here with evil energy? Tiny looked carefully at everyone and said he didn't think so. And then the old man even sighed, saying that was very good. He looked at Tiny, asking what he thought the enemy's goal was. Then he answered that their goal was the sacred object, justice, and a world tree. At once, one of the elves clenched his fist and shouted that they should prepare. Tiny thought that none of the elders had mentioned the sacred object. Well, he understood that the world tree was more important to them, since it was such a strong part of their mythology. Then he asked the Moonwolf if he was sure they had no evil energy. He even thought of the Russell case, so he couldn't be completely relieved. The people kept shouting until the elder ordered them to stop again, because there was no need for them to discuss their plan for the world tree here. And regarding Mike Tiny, all suspicion about him had been cleared, and they would repay him for his education. He called for Urena and ordered her to personally attend to the guest, while Tiny stood there below, understanding nothing of what he was saying. Later, the woman was accompanying him, but he thought it was very uncomfortable. Without turning, she asked if Elaine had truly been a dark mage. All this while grinding her teeth and pulling energy into her hand. She asked if that child Elaine was really a fifth circle dark mage. Tiny looked at her without speaking, and a second later he confirmed it. She'd been a fifth circle dark mage. She asked if he wasn't curious. And he asked, curious about what? But she was talking about why such a noble elf like her couldn't resist the temptations of the demons. Tiny answered that honestly, he didn't want to know. But she turned, asking if he hadn't come close to dying when he fought those demons. And that was why he should find out the reason he was gaining more enemies. He only told her to continue. Then Urena said that humans had enslaved other races since ancient times, and they had nearly gone extinct because of it. That was why they had helped the founder of Aslan, who hated slavery, and they had established a new order under the Empire of Aslan. But outside of that, the slave market had moved to the underworld, and the situation hadn't changed much. Then she confirmed that yes, Elaine had been captured by humans while still young. She returned to the land of the elves after long 20 years. Urena said she had heard he came from a fallen noble family, so he must have seen slaves as well. He remembered that he really had seen that, but he clenched his fists, saying that just because someone's past is full of sorrow does not mean their sins can be forgiven. She tried to shout, saying he didn't understand how desperate that child had been, while he asked if she knew how many people she had sacrificed. It had been dozens of mages and mana users and hundreds of ordinary people. They could have been innocent humans or even her fellow elves, because not every person with a miserable life falls as far as she did. She chose to become a dark mage, but he said that she knew everything he had done until now, and asked if she couldn't trust him. Urena said that accidents happen wherever you go, so it wouldn't be strange to suspect who was the cause of all of them. Tiny said she was talking nonsense like that, but she replied that it wasn't strange that the worshippers were still acting, considering he had stopped them twice. Tiny stopped thinking because she was right. He had already interfered with two of their plans twice, so there was no chance they would try something again while he was here. He said she was right and came along smiling, saying, "Thank you for telling me," because what he had said at the meeting might have been wrong. Remember about the world tree and the sacred object. They needed to find Estina. Would it be too late if they waited for the monster wave to end? She asked why he was asking her of all people. But he said it was because elves had noble minds. He trusted that she would not make a decision while clinging to the past. She became a little uneasy, remembering Elaine. In the past, she had saved her, saying she killed everyone who had left her in that state. But she had been in the corner saying that she should have killed everyone. The woman didn't understand while she repeated it, smiling like a lunatic. Then she looked at Elaine, not understanding what was happening. She wanted to believe that child could have overcome the past. Then she turned, saying, "Fine, someone must pay for the sins of that child." However, she also didn't know anything. The Guardian could be anywhere on the border of the Great Forest. Then she asked if he really needed to find the Guardian. Tiny wanted to know if there was a way. She said, well, he could release his spirit. And then Tiny asked, and after that, but that was all. She also recommended he do it in a very high place. Meanwhile, she left thinking that perhaps he really was the hero the world had been waiting for. Hey everyone, did you enjoy the story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.